What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and per your request, we are remastering Spider-Verse. At least 70% of you guys said you wanted me to remaster Spider-Verse. More like 75%, because Spider-Man No Way Home was a giant multiversal story, so I guess it makes sense. And so in order to make things easier for you guys, I'm going to put the reading order down in the description so you guys can basically keep up as you guys buy the comics and read them and so on and so forth. But this picks up with Superior Spider-Man. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what that is, Superior Spider-Man was the story arc where Dr. Octopus took over the body of Peter Parker. And so he basically became the new Spider-Man. It was an amazing story. The entirety of the Spider-Verse event actually happens between two issues with Superior Spider-Man. So you don't really see the event play out per se in the Superior Spider-Man comic as it was initially written. Instead, what you get are Superior Spider-Man tie-in stories to the events of Spider-Verse. And so the way this had happened is that there was basically this giant explosion that took place that was a result of a temporal meltdown at Horizon Labs. Now, those of you guys, you may be familiar with it. If you guys saw the Morbius trailer, you saw Horizon, one of the buildings in the background. It was literally the only building with red lighting on it, right? Red wording. So of course, we seem to know that Mobius takes place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or at least that seems to be the case. Horizon Labs is really a think tank when it comes to the Marvel Comics universe, right? Just where a bunch of smart people hang out and just think of cool stuff. And so with that explosion taking place, Superior Spider-Man was thrown into the time stream. Now, this happening was actually pretty cool because if you look at this scene where he's thrown into the time stream, in the very top left-hand corner, that's the Earth X Captain America. That's actually the universe that the Eternals film is based off of. Next to him is what looks like the Incredible Hulk, because it is. He's actually called Maestro, and it's basically a future version of the Incredible Hulk, where the world had succumbed to like nuclear war, and he basically led this city called Dystopia. Over on Geek Culture Explained, I still stand by the fact, and I've been making the argument over there, that what Bruce Banner saw in Avengers Age of Ultron was actually himself becoming the Maestro. But you just see these kind of alternate realities, right? Old Man Logan, different things along those lines, but he's just kind of thrown into the time stream until ultimately he arrives in the 2099 universe. Now, the 2099 universe of Marvel Comics is actually a really cool universe. It was created by Peter David, and it's been around since the 90s. In fact, it was one of the more popular lines of comics Marvel had in the 90s. Like most of those alternate realities, like the Ultimate Universe, stuff like that, it started with Spider-Man, and then over time just became less interesting. You got stuff like the 2099 Incredible Hulk and like 2099 Punisher and Doctor Doom and different things along those lines, but it's basically the future, right? Now, instead of having like New York, what you have is Nueva York, just kind of like this future, super technologically advanced place. But by and large, the whole area is ran by Alchemax. And this is important because once Superior Spider-Man gets into this place, because he's somewhat familiar with 2099, that of course he's able to make his way through there to a degree. And he's basically set upon by what's referred to as the public eye. Now, the public eye in the 2099 universe, they're basically private police that are actually hired and work for Alchemax, the company that seemingly runs everything, or at least basically all of New York. But when this happens, of course, he's able to get past these guys quite readily, and then he's met by Gabriel O'Hara. Now, Gabriel O'Hara is the brother of Miguel O'Hara, also known as Spider-Man 2099. At the moment, he's not here, he's missing, he's actually out doing his own thing, and we'll follow up with him relatively soon. But the idea of Dr. Octopus, or really Superior Spider-Man, being in this place, of course, he's greeted by Gabriel, and then he's like, I don't need you anymore, right? Like, all I want to do is find my way back home, back to my native universe, and we're gonna call it a day. Now, here's the funny thing about this. When it comes to Dr. Octopus, historically in the movies, his intelligence has been downplayed. Despite how smart you've seen him come off in the movies, he's not nearly as intelligent in the movies as he is in the comics. In the comics, he's light years ahead of everybody. He's like Tony Stark, right? He's a futurist. He's always thinking to the future, always looking to the horizon. And so he's basically given this kind of sentient AI computer system, which is partially self-aware, but still has to follow the programming that's assigned to it, and asks it the best way to achieve interdimensional travel or time travel. Now, as you would expect, time travel is highly regulated in any one particular universe, and a lot of this falls in line with the nature of organizations like the Time Variance Authority itself, as well as the organizational structures of that particular universe. And what I mean by that is the TVA, as most of you guys probably know from the Loki series, albeit that series was a little bit different from the comics, that it is by and large governed by the Timekeepers. And the goal of the Timekeepers is to basically ensure their existence, right? That they come into existence at the end of time, and they want to make sure that like nothing happens across the multiverse that prevents them from existing. And so they closely monitor individuals who travel back and forth through time, making sure they don't disrupt the time stream too much. So there's that kind of regulation that goes into it. At the same time, if you're a massive company like Alchemax and you have all this power, you don't want anybody going back in time and preventing your company from existing. existing. And so that's the kind of regulation you end up seeing. People who aren't meddling with time and like disrupting existing status quos, or possibly even sending the universe on a collision course to a far worse future than the one that currently exists. So there's all kinds of things you can screw up with time, and that's why it's monitored so closely. Fortunately for us, Superior Spider-Man doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him. And in fact, he actually ends up breaking into all these different facilities and stealing all these different things he needs in order to attain the ability to travel through time or to move from one dimension or one universe to the next. Now, with Dr. Octopus, he can get away with that, right? It's like giving Tony Stark the ability to achieve time travel. Just part and parcel of his intelligence is knowing there's some things you just can't do, right? You can't disrupt time too much. You've got to be very, very careful. Another part of this is that as he's been working with this AI, and this is a particularly important point going forward, he actually tells it to start modifying its physical appearance so it looks like Anna Maria Marconi. Now, the reason why that matters is Anna Maria Marconi was a diminutive woman who was also incredibly intelligent and actually challenged Otto Octavius in a lot of different ways. She believed he was Peter Parker. She didn't really know the truth. She found out later on, but she was one of the few people out there that kept pushing him to be better. And so because of the fact that she was not content with mediocrity, she would call him out when he was wrong. She would say like, you're better than what you currently are right now. It wasn't just, I like you as you are, and that's fine, right? She wanted to see him become better to live up to his full potential, that he actually developed a huge amount of respect for and then started falling in love with her. And so he basically misses her. And that all ties into the nature of Superior Spider-Man, right? Dr. Octopus basically reforming, becoming a hero instead of a villain, forming Parker Industries, which actually became like this worldwide multi-billion-dollar philanthropy-based organization. He created all these little pieces of technology that made Peter Parker's life better as Spider-Man. It was really, really cool in terms of how all that stuff worked. But once the actual system is set up and he's ready to travel, one of the things that he had done is created a snapback protocol so that if he ends up jumping into an alternate universe and like it's in the middle of a meteor crashing into it and everyone's dying, he can snap back. Because wouldn't it suck if he traveled to a new universe and a meteor was about to crash into it, he had like 10 seconds to live, and that was that, right? Like it would really blow balls. And so once he ends up passing through, because of the nature of traveling through the multiverse is not as simple as simply just jumping back to a period in time, trying to travel through space and time, the fact that the multiverse actually moves the way the Earth orbits around the sun, that is a very, very precise system. And so he ultimately ends up missing where it is that he's supposed to be. Instead, he shows up in an alternate reality where Spider-Man had joined the Fantastic Four, and this version of Spider-Man's been killed. Not only that, he snaps back and ends up in an alternate reality, the House of M universe. Most of you guys have heard of that, the universe where the Scarlet Witch had basically rewrote reality to give everybody everything they subconsciously desired. Spider-Man in that universe is killed. Then he snaps back and ends up in a Civil War universe where basically the Civil War never ended, and that version of Spider-Man is killed. That every single universe he goes to, the Spider-Men in these different universes have all been killed. They've been executed. But the more crazy thing about this is they've all been killed in the exact same way. The two same puncture marks, right? So seemingly someone or something is traveling around the multiverse and killing all these different versions of Spider-Man. And so what it does is it switches over to what's probably one of the cooler versions of Spider-Man. Once Superior Spider-Man jumps back to 2099 and then jumps into the time stream again, you actually ended up in an alternate reality where you get Spider-Man India, which is cool. And then you find the guy who's basically killing everybody. Now, this thing here, this guy, he's what's called an inheritor. And we'll learn more about the inheritors as time goes on. The important thing, and really what Dan Slott gives us here, is that this guy, Spider-Man India, seemingly has all the same powers that you would expect from a Spider-Man, right? Like the powers of Peter Parker. So like the proportional strength of a spider, the ability to climb on walls, shoot webbing, different things like that. A lot of that stuff just kind of universal from one universe to the next. But this guy, this Spider-Man India, is getting totally wrecked by this inheritor, right? I mean, literally, he's just fleeing for his life. Nothing's working. Absolutely nothing is working here. And so what you end up getting is this kind of cat and mouse game, this incredible maneuver that's made by this inheritor, where he actually ends up forcing a building to crumble, which draws the attention of Spider-Man, because as you guys know, Spider-Man would never let innocent people die. And then in turn, because he's distracted, it's basically game over. There's no way for this guy to win. And then enter Superior Spider-Man, who saves this dude's life, right? Just saves this guy's life by an instant. I mean, this dude was like moments away from being killed. And so once this guy is basically defeated, of course, he's, we really have Superior Spider-Man telling us this guy's being held at bay. He starts talking to Spider-Man India. And what he says is that as he's been traveling through the multiverse, presumably trying to find his way home, his mission to get back to the main Marvel universe shifted because every universe he came across, Spider-Man were being killed. And Dr. Octopus, being as intelligent as he is, deduced someone or something is hunting Spider-Man from across the multiverse, and so it's only a matter of time before they come for him. And so what he actually has been doing is assembling a team of different Spider-Men from across the multiverse, all of whom intend to face off against this guy, this person that's basically taking them all out. And so once Spider-Man India is brought back to the Marvel 2099 universe, you end up seeing like 5 other Spider-Men, including Spider-Man Noir. But one of them is also Assassin Spider-Man, who's one of the coolest versions of the character. Okay, so here's the origin of Assassin Spider-Man, right? We're gonna switch over to this. It's actually kind of a backup feature in Superior Spider-Man number 32. That what you end up finding out here is that somewhere along the line, the Green Goblin had actually murdered Gwen Stacy. And unlike the main Marvel universe, where the death of Gwen Stacy taught Peter Parker that he couldn't be reckless, in this alternate reality, the death of Gwen Stacy taught Spider-Man to take no prisoners. And so every single villain that he had, that he came across, he killed. He just executed them, right? Like Kraven the Hunter, he just killed them, as he should have been doing. And of course, one of the things that also goes on here is that because there are some threats out there that Spider-Man's going to have to contend with, and his skills aren't quite up to snuff, he actually ends up training with Wolverine. Now, this may seem kind of like weird to have him train with Wolverine, but it actually makes perfect sense. And the reason why is because Wolverine's trained a lot of people in Marvel Comics. Black Widow learned how to fight from Wolverine when she was in the Red Room. You had all kinds of people who have trained with this guy, right? And it's one of these things in Marvel Comics, it's a hodgepodge. Somewhere along the line, seemingly everybody's trained with everybody else. The only real exception to that, insofar as the one person that like everybody's trained with, is actually 2 people. And they're really more teachers than anything else. The first one is Taskmaster, right? Like Tony Masters. That guy, I mean, he's the guy you want to train with. He usually trains villains, but heroes have trained with him as well. But the other person, and probably the more significant trainer of heroes in Marvel Comics, is Shang-Chi. He's trained really almost everyone in some form or fashion. Even if there's someone like Wolverine that already had a formidable set of skills, all Shang-Chi did was hone them and make them better. So again, it's one of these things where Tony Masters and Shang-Chi are kind of like the 1-2 punch of people that you train with, but this guy, this version of Spider-Man training with Wolverine, made him far more ruthless and far more brutal because it's just the nature of Wolverine's training. And so of course, when this inheritor showed up in that universe and immediately started going after that version of Spider-Man, the Assassin Spider-Man, that Wolverine stepped in the way and Wolverine was totally incinerated, right? Of course, all that's really left is this adamantium skeleton. Now, this is one of those things where Marvel plays it fast and loose. If you read Days of Future Past, Marvel's like, yeah man, Wolverine's entire skeleton was incinerated and he died. But then you go and you read a story like Civil War where Nitro blows up in front of Wolverine and reduces him down to his skeleton and he regrows, right? So it's one of those things where it just kind of goes either way. Wolverine's ability to heal from an injury is more of a plot device than anything else, especially when it's an injury this extreme. But what it does is it allows Assassin Spider-Man to basically temporarily gain the upper hand on this inheritor, even if only for a moment. Now, during this process, he's actually met by Alex. Now, we're not given a whole lot of information about Alex. All we really know is that she's basically the girl that this version of Spider-Man ended up with, that like the main Marvel universe, that following the death of Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker, at least in this reality, ended up with Mary Jane Watson, but then along the way, he met Alex, he broke up with Mary Jane Watson and got with Alex instead. Most likely it seems to be because the mentality Alex had is more in line with the mentality of Assassin Spider-Man, but at the end of the day, you actually get this really, really cool moment where Assassin Spider-Man's fighting the inheritor and he realizes his staff basically relies on energy. And so his response is, then we'll just overload it, right? So he actually leads him to this location, which is just a giant power battery, more or less. And as the 2 of them are fighting, the staff is temporarily overloaded. But at the end of the day, the inheritor pulls it back out and the fight's on again. And it's one of these things where he's just kind of like, I'm entertained, right? Like your death will be quicker than most because, you know, you kind of gave me a good fight, right? I respect you, so I'm not going to kill you slowly. And so ultimately, this guy kind of just seems to be unstoppable. There's no real way for anyone to overcome him. But then what actually ends up happening is that while this fight's taking place, Superior Spider-Man shows up. He ends up ripping a tree out of the ground and throwing it at this dude and sending him flying. And so that's the explanation of how it is that as these 2 meet up, Superior Spider-Man had Assassin Spider-Man in his ranks because he saved yet another Spider-Man from being killed by one of the inheritors. Now, at this point, we switch over to what's called the Edge of Spider-Verse. So the way the Spider-Verse was told, it was told in a couple different forms. The first is that you followed Superior Spider-Man, then you go into Edge of Spider-Verse, which is basically these stories that give you like either origins on different versions of Spider-Man or stories stories involving existing Spider-Man from across the multiverse in terms of how it all ties together and how they ended up as part of the Spider-Verse event. And so in this instance, we actually end up picking up with Spider-Man Noir, who's actually been around since 2009. So he appeared about 5 years before this story was written. And one of the things to know, the way Peter Parker gained his powers in this particular story, because the Marvel Noir series was designed to be a lot more grounded than what you saw in terms of just the traditional Marvel Comics line. So like radioactive spiders biting people, and instead of them succumbing to radiation poisoning, they get powers. The way you actually saw here was basically a kind of spider idol, which really seemed to be imbued with magical energy. So, I mean, I guess, you know, kind of grounded. I don't know. But regardless, Peter Parker in this universe was bitten by one of those spiders, and then he woke up with Spider-Man powers, as you would expect. What you also have here is somebody called the Magical Mysterio, or like the Amazing Mysterio. What's really going on here, and kind of an important thing to understand, these aren't really significant moments. We're really covering this because of the way that it ends. But basically, Mysterio is a guy, the Magnificent Mysterio, he's a guy vying for power, right? Wilson Fisk Kingpin is running New York. He's the guy that wants to take his place as like the new crime boss, is really all it is. And that's one of the things that kind of happens, is you have this bit of a discussion where like Wilson Fisk walks in on Mysterio, talking about how he's going to basically steal the powers of Spider-Man, and then in turn, he's going to be the one to run New York, right? So when you're Wilson Fisk, that stuff doesn't really bother you because you know that people are just going to come gunning for you at some point along the line. And so one of the things that goes on here is you actually have Wilson Fisk trying to gain information on the identity of Spider-Man. And that's been an ongoing theme in the Spider-Man Noir series for quite some time. They actually end up visiting Felicia Hardy. Now, Felicia Hardy was at one point in a relationship with a villain called the Crime Master, but was in love with Spider-Man Noir. And when the Crime Master learned this, he ended up slashing her face. And that's why she wears a white mask, because her face is scarred all to hell. And so because of that, it's basically like her saying like, I don't know the identity of Spider-Man. I'm in love with him, but I don't know him personally. But while all this is happening, right, all these little plot threads and things like that are going on, Peter Parker in this universe is experiencing this kind of dull headache that just kind of seems to be sitting back there. There really doesn't seem to be any indication in terms of the fact that there's like an immediate threat. That's kind of how his spider sense manifests. It's sort of a dull pain, but it just kind of kicks in whenever any like massive event takes place. So very, very similar to the spider sense of Peter Parker from the main Marvel universe. But what his sense is basically telling him is there's a threat out there somewhere. And it's a kind of a bit of an annoyance here, because if there's a threat out there somewhere, like why doesn't the threat manifest itself, right? I mean, keep in mind, Peter Parker's spider sense doesn't tell him where the threat is coming from. It just says there is a threat there, kind of like a sixth sense. And he even refers to it as like an ESP to a degree. But during this whole thing, because of the fact that Mysterio is trying to get his hands on the blood of Spider-Man Noir for the purpose of finding a way to basically make himself someone that has powers akin to Spider-Man, that he actually ends up challenging Spider-Man Noir publicly in the newspapers by saying like, there is going to be a girl you're going to have to rescue, right? Can you live up to the challenge? That kind of a thing. Now, behind the scenes, the indication is he's actually going to kill her. Like Mysterio really will kill this girl if Spider-Man Noir doesn't show up. And because he's a quote unquote magician, the audience will believe it's a trick when it's actually real, right? And Spider-Man Noir will kind of have to live with that. So of course, he ends up showing up here. And when that happens, he's overcome pretty quickly by a kind of gaseous substance, which basically knocks him out temporarily. And then of course, he's hoisted up. And in response to that, the entire, casket basically that he's in is filled with water. Keep in mind, this is all real. It's designed to look like a trick to the audience because they're like, I mean, it's crazy. Mysterio couldn't kill Spider-Man in front of everybody, right? It's not like he can march him out on stage, put a gun to the back of his head and shoot him, right? Because then they would all be like, my God, you killed a man. But like, if you make it look like a trick, then it's like, wow, that was so impressive. We watched a man die, but we're too foolish to know what actually happened, right? That kind of a thing. Now, at this point, you get this kind of plot device where basically Spider-Man Noir shoots webbing on his face, which like traps a bit of oxygen. And then he's like, the oxygen saved me from drowning, right? And then it's that kind of a thing. Now, honestly, it would kill him because he's exhaling CO2, right? So basically he's breathing in a poisonous substance. The oxygen would run out, but it's comic book logic. Roll with it. Don't ask too many questions, guys. If you try to take comic books too seriously, you're going to make yourself go crazy. And so, of course, he ends up basically making his escape. He fights Mysterio, kind of beats him up a little bit, and the day's more or less saved, and he frees Felicia Hardy and all that kind of stuff, and that's it. And then the Inheritor pops up. And that's kind of how this happens, right? These guys teleport into universes, right? Teleport into these spaces. And so when this guy arrives, Superior Spider-Man shows up. It's one of these things where literally Superior Spider-Man teleports in, grabs Spider-Man Noir, and teleports out. And that's it. Because by this point in time, as this kind of conversation begins to progress and we start to get into the next part of our little story here, that what you have is basically the realization by Superior Spider-Man they can't beat this guy as a small number, hence the reason why the entire team was formed. And so what you get is a different reality where you basically have Cyborg Spider-Man. He's pretty cool, right? He looks pretty amazing. This inheritor shows up, and then you actually end up finding out that at some point along the line, Superior Spider-Man visited Cyborg Spider-Man and informed him of what was going on, that seemingly the inheritor would come after him somewhere along the line, and that ultimately when that happens, he actually ends up calling in all these different Spider-Man, right? So like Spider-Man India, Spider-Man Noir, the Superior Spider-Man, Spider-Girl, right? So like Ashley Barton from the Old Man Logan universe, she was amazing. Oh my God, I loved her character so much in Old Man Logan. Dude, you guys remember that? She was all like helpless and she needed to be saved. And then like once she was saved, she was like, I'm ruling everything now. She like turned out to be a villain. It was awesome. By the way, if you guys want to see like the origins or explanations on any of the characters that we cover here that you're not like familiar with, let me know. And like, I'll make, we'll kind of like pause the series for a second and make videos about some of these characters, because I feel like some of you guys are going to want to know like the origins of these guys and things along those lines. But ultimately they all end up teaming up against this inheritor, and they actually draw this really cool conclusion. Superior Spider-Man realized that while this guy is going around killing Spider-Man, that what he's doing is absorbing their energy. And so finding a way to reverse engineer that process, he could actually use that energy against him, right? They could basically siphon that energy off of him and basically make him weak. The nature of Ashley Barton, right? Like the daughter of Hawkeye, the nature of her is she's kind of like, okay, we got to kill this guy, right? Like we got to take this guy out. And it's one of the things where the other Spider-Man are like, really? Like you want to kill? Like, I mean, are you sure about that? And then like Assassin Spider-Man's like, yeah, man, he's been killing us, right? Like we just got to eliminate this guy, be done with it, call it a day. Why would we let this guy live? He's going to find some way to escape. What do you think's going to happen? He's going to be in prison and then realize his heart was 3 sizes too small and he's going to become a good guy and help us. Is that really what you think is going to happen? No, he's a villain. Kill him. And so there's this kind of big debate that goes on there, but Superior Spider-Man steps in and says, before we kill this guy at all, we need information, right? And so he asks him like, what's your mission? And the response to the inheritor is like, there is no mission, right? This is what my kind does. We kill spiders. It's our way. As for others like me, pray you never meet the rest of my family. And that's when it takes Superior Spider-Man by surprise, like, wait a minute. There's more than one of you? And his response is like, oh yeah, there's more than one of us. And so the question Superior Spider-Man asks here is, will my weapon function as well against these others? I warn you, I will know if you lie. And the response to this guy is, I mean, sure, like it'll function as well against the others as it does against me, which is completely and totally ineffective, and then just like breaks out, right? And it's just like, I was just wanting to hear what you guys were saying. I just wanted to hear what your plan was, understand what you guys were doing. And this massive fight breaks out. Now, all these Spider-Man are facing one inheritor. They're doing what they can, but at the end of the day, even for just one inheritor, they're all being painfully overpowered, right? I mean, like they're attacking as best they can, but they can't kill this guy, right? Like all they can do is kind of throw him around, pummel him a little bit. They set him on fire and it doesn't work. And then it's just like, okay, this could not possibly get any worse. And they're suddenly met by the arrival of 2 other inheritors. Now, of course, you learn this guy we've been following the whole time, his name is Karn, but basically he's kind of seen as like a shameful member of the family, not as powerful, it's just kind of shame that he carries. And we'll talk more about that later. But like these other 2 showing up, if there was ever a fight to be had here, it's long since gone. They overpower these guys with a quickness, right? These inheritors, they overpower these Spider-Men so fast. And like Superior Spider-Man's like, we have to go. We can't stay here. If we stay here, we're all gonna die. I'm sounding a retreat. And some of them don't want to, but it's like, no, like you guys remember that scene from Aliens when Hicks was like, Marines, we are leaving. It's that, right? I mean, it's a massacre. It's them just like trying to live. And so ultimately the inheritors end up fighting amongst themselves. And that's just what Superior Spider-Man and those guys need, is to basically have a distraction to make their escape. They open their portals and they bail. They immediately take off. And so following that, you have this kind of discussion that goes on where one, Superior Spider-Man ends up creating an arm for one of the Spider-Men to basically upgrade his cybernetic devices so he can, hack into the systems from Alchemax without being detected. And he's like, your job is to hunt for the names of the inheritors throughout the entire history that Alchemax has at their disposal. If they're moving moving through universes, it also means they're moving through time. So they could appear at any point in time across the entirety of the multiverse. If they're hunting Spider-Man, there's a good chance they've appeared in the past. Find their names. And that assignment actually ends up going out to the six-armed Spider-Man as well, right? To kind of hunt throughout the entirety of the time stream, space and time itself, and find some reference for these guys anywhere. The next thing is it actually ends up going to Spider-Man India, and well, he really calls him Turtleneck, but it's basically Spider-Man Noir, where he's like, you're going to find out where their home universe is. If they are hunting Spider-Man throughout the multiverse, then it means they're retreating somewhere. They're going somewhere. They live somewhere. Find their home. Whether it's an entire universe or some pocket dimension somewhere, find out where they live. And so what he actually ends up doing is pulling aside Ashley Barton and pulling aside Assassin Spider-Man. And this is one of the cool things, because these were the two who immediately said, we have to kill this inheritor guy. And so one of the things Superior Spider-Man picked up on is that the other Spider-Men who were here are all very closely modeled after Peter Parker, right? They're just alternate reality versions of Peter in the sense that they almost exactly mirror his mannerisms, but also his moral compass. They're not willing to kill. And so it's one of the things that kind of goes on, because he says, I wanted to speak to the two of you privately. I feel we share a certain perspective that eludes our allies. And that's when Assassin Spider-Man's like, don't dance around it. We're killers. And Superior Spider-Man says, yes. He's like, I wasn't really dancing around it. It's more than that. The others may have killed in dire circumstances. I don't really know. But it's clear to me that we three have seen things that they have not. Brutality, devastation, darkness. The others think they've seen the worst that life has to offer because they've lost a loved one or two. But we have seen the face of true evil, and we understand what is required to stop it. This is incredibly important because he goes on to say, these beings we fight belong to the same family. To end their threat, we may have to commit a genocide. And by way of that, we may find our allies standing in our way. i.e., if it comes down to it, I need to know you're willing to kill other Spider-Men in order to ensure we can end this threat. It's pretty extreme, right? It's just that severe of a conflict in the eyes of Superior Spider-Man. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Spider-Verse, and you guys really seem to enjoy the last video that we did, so we're gonna do more. This one in particular is very, very interesting. So here's one thing that I wanna preface before we get into this. There are a few things going on within the Marvel Universe and Multiverse at the same time this is happening, and that actually lead up to it. Specifically, the events of Infinity, so basically Thanos fighting the Inhumans and the Terrigen Bomb, as well as the Incursions. We'll explain that once we get to it, but the other thing is that following this, we're gonna jump into Edge of Spider-Verse. And Edge of Spider-Verse is where you get a lot of the origins you guys have been asking for, right? So like the origin of Spider-Gwen, different things like that. So we'll kind of bring all that stuff together. And then once Edge of Spider-Verse finishes, we'll get into the actual main Spider-Verse event, because this is all prelude stuff. This is all the stuff leading up to, quote unquote, the main Spider-Verse event. And so what this does is this actually focuses, at least in this video, we're gonna be focusing on Amazing Spider-Man Volume 3. Now the reason why that matters is because technically the events of Superior Spider-Man concluded. They're done. And when Superior Spider-Man ended, you went into Amazing Spider-Man 3, which was basically Peter Parker getting his body back. The reason why you still see Superior Spider-Man is because prior to the ending of his story, Spider-Verse took place. So he was thrown into the multiverse. He's currently outside of time. So it's like Dr. Octopus taking over the body of Peter Parker on a Monday, the entire Spider-Verse event happens on a Tuesday, and then on a Wednesday, Peter gets his body back. So it's just one of those weird things, right? It's just something to wrap your head around. I know it seems a little strange, but what this also does is it brings in a character named Cindy Moon. Now, Cindy Moon was a really, really cool concept that Marvel wasted. And it really kind of sucked. So if you guys recall our discussion about the idea of spider totems, again, that was Marvel basically moving away from the idea that Peter Parker was just a kid who was bitten by a radioactive spider, and instead him being bitten by that spider basically tied him into this kind of mystical connection that he had with all these other people who had been bitten by spiders and become spider people. Now, one of the things that Marvel did is they had an event called Original Sin. And all Original Sin did is it basically revealed all these things that we never knew about. It was a way for Marvel to kind of jumpstart stories they'd been looking to tell. And you learned some really, really cool stuff, right? Captain America being part of the Illuminati and then having his mind wiped and kicked out, different things along those lines. Cindy Moon was actually a girl who was bitten by the exact same spider that bit Peter Parker. And in fact, they happen within like minutes of each other. The spider bit Peter, it fell off, and then it bit Cindy on her ankle. The kicker to this is that if you recall our discussions about like Ezekiel Sims and all those guys, basically Ezekiel Sims realizing that like the inheritors were going around and killing people who were basically Spider-Man and Spider-Woman from across the multiverse, that when he encountered Cindy Moon and her powers started manifesting, he realized that the inheritors were after her. And so what he did is he locked her away in what was basically a bunker that had years worth of food. Now, she wasn't a prisoner. She could have left at any point in time. She had the access code to leave. But Ezekiel Sims basically said, if you do that, there's a good chance they'll find you and they will kill you if they do, right? There's no way you can fight them off on your own. So she was more of a prisoner by choice than anything else. Following the events of Original Sin and Peter Parker learning of Cindy Moon's existence, he basically rescued her. And then there was like a whole series of events where she was pissed off. But because of the fact that she's part of the Spider Totems and she has the name The Bride, essentially her and Peter Parker just can't stop banging. That's really what it means. Like, if they are in a vicinity of each other, like literally it happens here where like they're talking, he's showing her the internet and he's like, okay, when you were locked away, yeah, it was AOL and Netscape. For those of you guys who were that old to remember that kind of stuff, I do. I remember AOL. But he says like nowadays it's all Facebook and all that kind of stuff. They're literally within a foot of each other. The pheromones start kicking in and they want to start banging. And it happened for a while. When they first met, they couldn't stop banging. It was crazy. It was hilarious, but it was crazy. And so again, with Anna Maria Marconi being here, of course, again, she initially met Dr. Octopus believing he was Peter Parker. All that stuff took place during Superior Spider-Man. That she's like, okay, no, we're not having you guys doing this. This is not gonna happen. She literally starts spraying him with water in order to make him stop. And so Cindy Moon finally gives up and she ends up basically taking off to find her own place. Now, following that, what you actually end up getting is this great big huge kind of calamity where you basically have Minerva. The reason why this matters is like Minerva fighting the cops and things like that. It's not overall important to the Spider-Verse event, but it is cool. And the weird thing is that Minerva is one of those characters, Marvel just never really updated her. So to give you guys perspective, Minerva was a character who was basically a member of the Kree race, and she traveled to Earth to meet the original Captain Marvel of the Kree, the guy, and then wanted to bang him in order to basically jumpstart the Kree's evolution. The reason why is because at one point in their history, the Kree had gotten their hands on something called the Crystal of Ultimate Vision, but because they wanted to use it for nefarious purposes, it basically froze their evolutionary state so they never aged. Marvel fixed that with a story called Operation Galactic Storm, where basically the Kree race was almost totally obliterated, and because of that, their evolution was forced, and so there really isn't a need for Minerva to exist anymore. That's why you see her here and there occasionally, but she never matters because Marvel never changed the motivation. It's like she never knew that Operation Galactic Storm happened, right? I don't know how she didn't know. She was there when it did, but nonetheless, it's one of those weird little things. This matters because the whole situation with this going on with Minerva actually gets the attention of basically Kamala Khan, of Miss Marvel. And she's a great character. I love the character of Miss Marvel. Her basically stepping in and intervening actually leads to her and Spider-Man teaming up, which is cool. But Kamala Khan is one of these characters where she had basically come about as a result of the Terrigen bomb detonating. So prior to the events of what was going on here with Spider-Verse, what you had, it was a story called Infinity, which was part of a larger story that dealt with the incursions. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But Infinity was really its own self-contained story. So you can read that of its own accord and actually not read anything else involving Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, and for the most part be fine. You'll probably have to do a little bit of internet researching to kind of get caught up on some things that don't make sense. But the overall gist here is that Thanos had formed the Cull Obsidian and was basically traveling around the multiverse trying to find his offspring and kill them. That eventually led him to Earth, where he learned his child existed among the Inhumans. He ended up getting in a fight with Black Bolt, and in the conflict, one of the most amazing moments in the story. Dude, there's this amazing moment in Infinity. Dude, I love this moment. It's like one of the best moments ever, where like Thanos is fighting Black Bolt, and he was like, tell me where my son is, and Black Bolt's like, no, right? Like anytime he talks, it's a quasi-sonic scream, so like he basically, just emanates this massive amount of energy, like this huge concussive blast, and like he's like screaming at Thanos and it's not working, and Thanos is like, fine, keep your secrets, carry them with you to the grave, and like smashes his head in the ground. It's just this ridiculously amazing moment. But in any event, basically Black Bolt detonated the Terrigen bomb, which spread Terrigenesis across the world, and then all these people who carry the Inhuman genes and didn't know it suddenly went into a state of Terrigenesis. Quite literally, they were just like kind of encased in these ugly looking cocoons, and then they would just manifest in whatever form it happened to take, right? Very similar to how mutants suddenly just develop powers based on their X gene, usually during like puberty insecurity or high levels of stress, but Kamala Khan is one of those. Now, what made Kamala Khan so cool in her early stories by G. Willow Wilson is one, the family dynamic, right? The fact that she came from a very traditional family, but she actually wanted to do like very American things, which were considered to be very much against what her family stood for. But she was also like really new to the superhero scene. So like meeting heroes for the first time and then basically just fangirling, it was hilarious. I love the original run of Kamala Khan. And so that's why when like Spider-Man shows up, she's like, "You're Spider-Man! Holy cow! I'm gonna team up with Spider-Man. This is amazing!" And then she starts asking him stuff like, "Did you really go on a date with Miss Marvel with like Carol Danvers? Like, what was she like? What kind of music does she dig?" She's like the ultimate Carol Danvers fangirl. But it was a cool little thing. Of course, she really became, kind of stepped into her own and became a more solidified character. But one of the things that Minerva's doing is that because she's trying to like jumpstart Kree physiology, she basically ends up taking this kind of inhuman and then seemingly bonding them with Kree DNA for the purpose of like allowing them to manifest and kind of go forward accordingly. What follows after this isn't really interesting at all. They fight the thing and then they basically win and like the day's saved and you got some cool moments where some stuff happens. In all honesty, it's basically filler to justify the existence of the comic, to basically fill it up with space. One of the things that does happen here is you actually end up seeing Cindy Moon fashioning like an official costume for herself, having one of the more popular costumes that exists in the Spider universe. But basically everything's kind of cool and everything's copacetic and the day's saved and that's basically it. The meat and potatoes of this and the real takeaway from this comes by way of Spider UK. And again, these are the kind of backup features that you saw during these events of Spider-Man that largely dealt with basically the Spider-Verse event kind of leading into the whole thing. And so what ends up happening here is that you basically have a kind of situation where Spider UK almost has this kind of experience that like something's wrong in the multiverse involving the various Spider-Man. And in fact, he's actually using the ability to scan the multiverse to essentially figure all this stuff out. Now, there's a few things we have to explain in terms of why this happens. So Spider UK is part of what's called the Captain Britain Corps, and his name is Billy Braddock. So the Captain Britain Corps is a multiversal team. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with this, if you guys know about it, bear with me here for a second. I feel like we're gonna get a lot of new viewers who have never heard of this before. The Captain Britain Corps is a multiversal superhero team. They're not particularly powerful, but take the Green Lanterns from like the DC Comics universe and make it a multiversal team, and that's basically the Captain Britain Corps. There's officially one Captain Britain for each universe, and what they have is something called the Lighthouse, which is like their base of operations, but it's also an interdimensional teleportation device, and it allows them to enter into what's called the Starlight Citadel. That's basically the base of operations for a woman named Saturnine, who's called the Omniversal Magistrix. Her job is to like monitor the multiverse and make sure things don't pop off. A lot of people do that. The Living Tribunal does that, Alteza, the Custodian of the Multiverse, does that, and Saturnine does that. And then there's even more people who do that as well. But because of what's going on, because of the nature of the Starlight Citadel, and even the nature of the Lighthouse itself, there is technology there that allows members of the Captain Britain Corps to scan the multiverse and to see what's going on. Because of what use would they be as a team if they weren't able to like communicate with each other, different things like that. And so what ends up happening is Billy Braddock actually looks into an alternate reality, which is Earth 1983 in New York City, and basically sees that in that universe that Morlun is there and is actually killing one of the Spider-Men and absorbing their power, right? Taking this guy out. The crazy thing about this is seemingly a universe where things were basically just cool. No one really fought. It was pretty lighthearted. So this guy's overcome pretty easily because evil doesn't really seem to be something that exists. So quite literally, he's encountering something he's never encountered before. And so literally like all these folks are killed at the hands of Morlun, and then that's it. Following that, he actually starts looking through all these different realities that you've got two of the other inheritors that we saw in the last video, the brother and sister, Brix and Bora, who are actually killing one of the spider totems as a cat in this alternate universe. That you actually end up switching over to Deimos in Earth 7831. That guy is consuming actually an entire world full of anthropomorphic heroes, largely consisting of the Knights of Wondergore, which are basically individuals who were created by the High Evolutionary by basically modifying animal DNA, and they kind of spread out into the world and seemingly populated this world with anthropomorphic animals partly, and then also baseline humans. While the inheritors themselves are only supposed to feed on spiders, if a being has superpowers and they are animal in nature, they're part of that animal totem system. So that's the reason why like Morlun fought Black Panther as an example. They can feed on those, but by way of the instruction given to them by their father, they're not supposed to. They're only supposed to feed on spider totems. The other thing about this is you actually have Genix, who's kind of like the scientific arm of the inheritors, who actually realizes that Billy Braddock is spying on them, that this Spider-Man UK is watching them from some other place in the multiverse. And so of course, Billy Braddock is told like, we're gonna get you, that kind of a thing. But following that, he basically takes off and he goes to meet with Roma and Saturnine. Now Roma is the daughter of Merlin, like the Merlin from Arthurian legend, right? Like he's literally the one who founded the Captain Britain Corps, the Starlight Citadel, all that kind of stuff. He's the one that basically spearheaded all those things. Now, while all this is going on with Spider-Verse, you also have the incursions, universes crashing into each other, basically the collapse of the multiverse. That's the first and foremost pressing threat. That's the most important thing, keeping the multiverse from collapsing. But where you end up having like literally Billy Braddock, who shows up here and tells Saturnine all the different Spider-Men and Spider-Women across the multiverse are being killed by the Inheritors, she doesn't care. She's like, that's the least of my concerns. Entire universes are being destroyed. Cosmic entities are vanishing, right? The multiverse is collapsing. The least of my concerns are a bunch of Spider-Man and Spider-Woman being killed by a crazy family. That I have no concern about that. Now, that's kind of the nature of Saturnine. She's just kind of a dick, right? That's just kind of the nature of her. She's pretty crass, pretty rude. There's very much like my way or the highway, that kind of thing. Roma was a far more nurturing hand. And that's why she's the one that listens to the appeal of Billy Braddock when he says like, we have to do something about these. And her response is, look, we can't divert the efforts of the entire Captain Britain Corps to basically help you deal with the spider totems. I can help you out by giving you a device that'll let you basically travel through the multiverse, but that's the extent of it. Kind of the irony of all this, all these guys in the Captain Britain Corps, they get annihilated. When they meet the Beyonders, oh dude, the Beyonders just eradicate these guys. And I think it's really more the map makers than the Beyonders themselves, but it doesn't matter, right? Like the forces of the Beyonders, these guys get crushed. The only member of the Captain Britain Corps who lives is Brian Braddock from the main Marvel Universe. The Captain Britain Corps never had a chance. And in like a last ditch effort, Saturnine opens a portal. She throws Brian Braddock through it, gives him all the information, and then the portal shuts. And that's the end of the Captain Britain Corps, right? They never stood a chance. But ultimately, Spider UK is given this ability to basically travel through the multiverse. And this is a huge asset because while he doesn't necessarily have all the resources of the Captain Britain Corps at his disposal right now, he has a lot of experience with understanding the multiverse. And that in and of itself is a pretty big thing because that will go a long way in basically helping the forces of Spider-Man 2099 and Superior Spider-Man and all those guys in dealing with the Inheritors. Now, at this point, we switch over to our last little tidbit here, which is kind of leads into the official Edge of Spider-Verse story, but we basically end up picking up with Mayday Parker, which is essentially Earth 982. Now, Mayday Parker is a fan favorite. People absolutely love her character. She originally appeared in a What If story back in 1997. The What If story centered around the idea of like Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson having a kid and actually being able to raise that kid. There was a point where Peter Parker in that alternate universe basically lost his leg and he ended up retiring. And then once his daughter Mayday started developing powers, he started training her to become a superhero, which is pretty cool. And that's basically what goes on here, right? It's the return of Mayday Parker after a pretty lengthy absence in Marvel Comics. But the whole thing about this is you've basically got one of the Inheritors, which is actually Deimos, literally attacking Peter Parker of this reality and then attacking Mayday as well as Mary Jane Parker. And that's kind of the crazy thing is because none of these guys really have a chance here, right? The power of the Inheritors, they overcome them all. Now, Mayday was one of those characters where like she was one part fun, but she also had it where it counted. She was the girl you wanted in your corner when things started popping off. She would always try to find a way, right? This girl had like just non-stop optimism. And so despite the fact that it's basically a losing battle, this version of Peter Parker fights Deimos as best he can, but in the end, he knows it's basically just a distraction. His goal is to not actually defeat Deimos. I mean, if he does, he'll certainly be like, yeah, great. I mean, he wants to defeat the guy, but he also knows it's probably not gonna happen. Deimos is just too strong, too powerful, too fast. He's far beyond the powers of just a normal spider person, right? Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, what have you. And so the instruction here is actually for Mayday to basically grab Mary Jane and her younger brother and herself and to get out of there as fast as she possibly can, right? To leave. It's Peter sacrificing his life to save his family. And so ultimately what ends up happening is Mary Jane hands the baby, the younger brother of Mayday, over to Mayday herself and says, get out of here, right? I'm right behind you. Everything's gonna be cool. And then Mary Jane seemingly tries to stay to fight. Now, that was always a testament to the nature of Mary Jane Watson. In the early days of Marvel Comics, and when I say the early days, I mean like Mary Jane as a character, when it was Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy, Mary Jane was always kind of there, but she seemed really shallow. She seemed like there wasn't a whole lot of depth to her. She seemed very self-absorbed. And the idea is that when Gwen Stacy died, there was a moment there in the comics, it was beautifully written, there was a moment there in the comics when Peter lashes out at Mary Jane, and then Mary Jane chooses to stay. And that formed the relationship there, the two of them falling in love. And then it was really like Jerry Conway and those guys guys that followed suit, reworking and crafting Mary Jane Watson into a person that became a lot more responsible, a lot more concerned, a person that genuinely cared about Peter Parker, which she always kind of did, but she was far less self-absorbed. This is kind of like the fruition of that, right? The totality of that. What would that version of Mary Jane Watson look like if her and Peter Parker had gotten married, they had a kid, all that kind of stuff. And so that's why the family dynamic of these characters is so cool. Of course, Mayday basically takes off with half of her mind knowing her mom's gonna stay behind. And that's exactly what happens, right? Both her mom and her dad are basically killed. There is a bit of hope for her that like Peter Parker survives, but what you end up having is the arrival of the forces of like Superior Spider-Man and those guys to rescue Mayday Parker. And when she's like, well, I mean, it's like we can go save my dad, their response is, no, your dad's gone. Like, we arrived here too late. Peter Parker's dead. That's when Deimos comes out and is like, yeah, I absorbed the powers of Peter Parker. He's totally killed. Like, there's no one here to save you now. Either you can stay here and die, or you can flee as fast as you can, but understand, there's nowhere you can go. We will find you no matter where you go in this multiverse. And so that kind of sets in stone this notion or this idea of Mayday Parker to take out the inheritors no matter what it takes, no matter what happens. She wants to come out on top of this. That's a huge motivation for her character going into the future of the story. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Spider-Verse. Specifically, as promised, we are covering Edge of Spider-Verse. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what that is, Edge of Spider-Verse, and we technically already covered part 1, but Edge of Spider-Verse was a 5-part miniseries that basically covered the origins of like different Spider-esque characters from across the multiverse, some of whom ended up joining the various, the great big huge Spider-Man team as part of Spider-Verse, and others who actually were killed by the Inheritors. So it's a really, really cool concept. This one in particular is the origin of Spider-Gwen. And this one's nuts because here's the crazy thing. When this story came out, it's one of those rare instances in this day and age when a character is introduced in comics and immediately explodes in popularity. It was actually the costume that made Spider-Gwen so popular when she first came out, because the costume design was fantastic. But like literally that year at like Comic-Cons everywhere, like you just saw girls running around as like Spider-Gwen. It was nuts how popular she was. But what this does is it initially opens up basically at Midtown High School, right? Midtown being the school that Peter Parker went to. So a lot of similarities that we know of between this alternate reality Spider-Man story and the main Marvel Universe story. But basically, Gwen Stacy plays in a band called the Mary Janes, which my initial idea was like, man, how arrogant could you be that you named a band after yourself? But Van Halen did the same thing, and their band was amazing. The thing about this is that we get this kind of flashback, right? Now, this is her first appearance in comics. And so Jason Latour plays it fast and quick with her origin, in the sense that all we really know is that basically she was bitten by a radioactive spider and that in turn she went on to become a superhero. But unlike the main Marvel Universe, where Captain Stacy, the father of Gwen, was someone that became an ally of Spider-Man, in this instance he's actually an enemy of Spider-Gwen, all the while totally unaware of the fact that his daughter is Spider-Gwen. So that added a really cool dynamic. On top of that, Peter Parker never became Spider-Man. Instead, he's just basically an introverted kid in his school that gets picked on all the time. And so Gwen Stacy is the one saving him, and in a pursuit to become something comparable to her, he actually ended up becoming the Lizard instead. And during some kind of a conflict, which is never explored here in the story, he basically ends up dying. And so following that, what you get is J. Jonah Jameson that puts forward this idea that basically Peter Parker died at the hands of Spider-Gwen, and that he has to be avenged, right? The superheroes are basically being viewed as vigilantes, and they can't be allowed to go around and operate in that capacity, right? So the cool thing about this is that with that little bit out of a way, she kind of gets lost in herself as she's playing in this band, right? Just kind of getting lost and sort of, getting carried away. And of course, she's told by the band, hey, let's just take a break, right? Remember, we have our concert coming up. And so you get basically this kind of big struggle that Spider-Gwen goes through. And this is one of the things that really brought a lot of people on board. Spider-Gwen was hugely popular among girls, which if I'm being honest with you guys, Marvel needed that at the time, right? Marvel didn't have a whole lot of heroes that resonated with the female audience. And so, by and large, there weren't a whole lot of people that women could have a camaraderie with. And so one of the things that a lot of just young people in general struggle with is like the coming of age thing, right? A lot of you guys who are in your teenage years, and those of you guys who remember your teenage years, you remember what it was like, right? You're trying to fit in, you're trying to understand your place in the bigger picture, you're trying to figure out who you are. So you're making friendships, but you're not even sure if the friends you have are going to be your friends for the rest of your life. You want to make sure you maintain those relationships relationships, but you also know you're changing. It's a very, very confusing and difficult time that I think is exacerbated by the nature of social media. But the thing about this is that she's basically struggling with this idea that one part of her feels guilt over the death of Peter Parker, but there's another part of her that's like, I'm not the one who's responsible for this. So while the world is telling her it's your fault Peter died, she knows it's not, but she can never really share her identity with seemingly anybody around her, let alone her father. Her father's a cop, and her father's hunting Spider-Gwen. And so there's no real knowing what would happen if she dumped her identity to her father. Now, there does come a moment when she almost does, when she almost tells her dad who she is, what's going on, and it kind of makes sense, right? Given the relationship between her and her father, and really between most girls and their father, that as time progresses, girls become closer to their dads, and then they become closer to their moms. And so in this instance, her father is the only real parental figure she has. It's the only real person she feels like she can go and talk to anything about. And so if there were any person she could have this conversation with, it would be him. But before she gets the chance, she's actually basically tracked down by a cop who, of course, doesn't necessarily shoot her on the spot, but actually tries to. And that's kind of the extent of how she's viewed here. That in some ways, it was pretty dark, right? He tells her like freeze, put her hands up, all that kind of stuff, the things you normally expect to hear when a cop is like, trying to arrest you essentially. And of course, she's dodging and moving out of the way and so on and so forth. But he fires a few shots at her and tries to kill her. And she actually, ends up basically webbing him up so he can't do anything, and then puts in a call saying shots fired, and a bunch of cops show up, and she actually makes her escape, and these cops continue tracking her down. What this does is it says there's basically no safe place for Spider-Gwen. And this is starkly different from the Spider-Man mythos that we're used to. And that was one of the best things about Edge of Spider-Verse, because this is the tip of the iceberg, right? Wait till we get to the story about the Spider-Man who bites Mary Jane Watson. That gets nuts, right? That story gets crazy. It's like a horror story more so than anything else. What you actually also end up getting here is basically Matt Murdock, who's actually a villain, right? Which is kind of crazy, right? It's one of the cool things about this. And so you basically have him talking to Alexi, who is really this alternate realities version of Rhino from Marvel Comics, is really all he is. But as the two of them are talking, basically he's being set upon Captain Stacy, right? Just a desire to take this guy out, because Captain Stacy's not necessarily a bad cop, right? He's trying to track down Spider-Gwen because in his mind, she's a criminal, a vigilante as far as he's aware. He's doing what he's instructed to do as a member of law enforcement. But more so than that, he takes down big criminals, different things along those lines. So he's as much an issue for Spider-Gwen as he is for like Matt Murdock and any of those guys. And so following this, of course, as you expect, much like if you're familiar with Spider-Man from the main Marvel Universe, this girl can't be on time anywhere. That's kind of the thing about Spider-Man, right? Peter Parker, this guy couldn't be on time if he had like a giant purple clock sitting in front of his face telling him what time it was, right? Like he still couldn't be on time. And so ultimately she's actually late for her own concert with the Mary Janes. Now, there is a little bit of a saving grace here in the sense that like with no drummer there, people are kind of like, this is a little weird seeing a band with no drummer. But then like Alexi busts in with the intention of going after Captain Stacy, right? Spider-Gwen shows up just at that moment and of course throws on her suit and then immediately goes through to try to save her dad. But it's kind of a little bit of a saving grace, right? Before anybody could realize, hey, this girl's missing, outside of the band, like this band sucks, right? If it went on for like 15 minutes, people would be like, yeah, this band sucks. They don't have a drummer. This is weird. Let's go next door and get some drinks. That's basically what it would turn into. But you get this thing where Rhino actually gets the upper hand on her. And a lot of this seems to be because she's still fairly new to this, right? She's still fairly new to being a Spider character and understanding everything that goes along with it, the various villains that are out there. And even with Peter Parker in the main Marvel Universe, it was much the same way. Peter Parker didn't know how to cope with someone like Electro until he fought someone like Electro, right? It's just one of those things. You don't know how to do it until you do. And then you learn how to go forward from there. And so she's able to get the upper hand just by virtue of her enhanced strength and actually overcomes this guy quite readily. Just absolutely pummels this dude and then webs him up, knocks him unconscious and goes to walk away, only to be met by her father, right? For like Captain Stacy to turn around and just be like, you're under arrest. And that's kind of the crazy thing because you get this really, really cool exchange here, right? It's almost this thing where like she approaches it from a pretty interesting philosophical level, right? He says, don't move an inch. And she's like, really? She's like, what's a girl got to do to impress a guy, right? So obviously maintaining that kind of joking thing, she's like, I just want to be loved, and so on and so forth. And then what happens is things get serious, right? You get that kind of Peter Parker-esque joking, which is sort of necessary for any kind of, alternate reality or any main Marvel Universe Spider-Man story. But when Captain Stacy goes to arrest her, he's like, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Peter Parker. You have the right to remain silent. And that's when she chimes in. She's like, Peter's death, it was not my fault, at least not in the way that you think. But Captain Stacy doesn't care, right? He's like, it's not my job to decide that. She's like, sure, you'll just leave it to Jameson's angry mob, right? Some crazy guy who ramped up a bunch of crazy people and they all want to take me out. She's like, or you could leave it to the cop that tried to shoot me in a crowded subway. subway, but whatever the case is. And he's like, whatever it takes, right? However long it takes to do it, like, you'll see justice. I will, like, you will stand before a judge for the crime that you committed. And that's when she unmasks, right? She's like, I'm Spider-Gwen. She's like, here's the thing, Dad, like, you're a good cop. You put on the badge because you knew that if you didn't, somebody who doesn't need to wear a badge would, right? Somebody who would abuse their power would do it. And so you are in effect, not necessarily super powered, but you're a person who does the right thing. And that's what I'm doing, right? I'm putting on this mask. I tried to do the right thing. Peter Parker got himself killed. He became a villain, right? He became a bad guy. You know, whatever the case was, it unfolded in his situation. She's like, I didn't kill Peter Parker. And if I'm going to be like you, and I'm going to be somebody who stands up for small people, like I'm going to be somebody who makes the world a better place, I can't do it from a jail cell, right? I can't do it there. So you have to let me go, right? She's like, this mask is my badge now, right? If I don't define what it means, monsters like that will. And that's true, right? That's one of those things where if you have a cause that you're standing up for, you have to have a face of that cause. Otherwise, you'll become a kind of walking, talking case study where your opposition defines your cause better than you do. That's why I always advocate every movement has to have a leader. Otherwise, you end up having people who do things awry and there's no one there to say they don't stand for what we believe in. And so that's why she has to be out there and doing this kind of thing, because it's not necessarily about her solidifying what it means to be a hero. To a degree it is. It's her solidifying the idea that not everyone out there with powers is a bad guy. Some of us are good guys, and some of us are trying to do good things. And so as a result of that, I have to go out and be one of the good people. And her dad lets her go. Right now, the thing about this is all being watched by Spider-Man UK. And his response is, yes, you'll do quite nicely. They're gonna bring her into their ranks. Now, here's a funny thing. This story, it was nuts, right? Like when this came out, everybody wanted to know everything about Spider-Gwen. They were like, no. You can't give us some story in Edge of Spider-Verse like this and give us nothing else again, right? Because she showed back up in the main Spider-Verse event, but she was so huge that Marvel like had to create a story about her, right? I mean, it sold like gangbusters. And so ever since then, Spider-Gwen's been like a mainstay in Marvel Comics. She's just that popular. And she probably always will be, to be honest. I mean, she's always written just incredibly well. But yeah, that's the origin of Spider-Gwen in Marvel Comics. If I'm being honest with you guys, I would not be surprised if this video does terrible. What's going on, guys? This is Robin. In this video, we're going to cover a story where Spider-Man kills everyone. And this story is amazing. I love this story so much. It is dark. It's like the darkest Spider-Man story ever. Although I imagine Kraven's Last Hunt might really take the cake. For those of you guys who are experienced with Spider-Man reading when we're done with this, let me know which one of the two you think is darker. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with our Spider-Verse coverage up to this point, because I imagine we might gain a little bit of traction based on the popularity of the trailer, which is releasing tonight at 8:30 p.m. at the time that I'm recording this video, the Edge of Spider-Verse event was part of the larger Spider-Verse story, right? Where you had a whole bunch of different Spider-Man from across the multiverse who were teaming up against a group called the Inheritors. Edge of Spider-Verse basically gave us these little stories dealing with different Spider-Men from across the multiverse, some of whom actually survived into the main Spider-Verse event, and some of whom did not for various reasons. This one actually picks up with a kid named Patton Parnell instead of Peter Parker, the traditional name. And right off the bat, right off the bat, Clayton McLeod, the guy who wrote this story, basically shows us that this kid is dark, right? Like he finds an ant, uses a magnifying glass, and basically kills the thing. But one of the things about this is he's not like some, 6-year-old kid who does it out of curiosity or something like that. He actually is showing signs of psychopathy, if not sociopathy, right? Like antisocial personality disorder, a sociopath or a psychopath, right? The idea of harming things that are basically defenseless. That's really the kind of air that he puts off. More so than that though, it doesn't really seem to be done out of malice or cruelty. It really seems to be done more out of curiosity. And that's one of the big differences between Peter and like a traditional psychopath or a traditional sociopath, is that he doesn't really have a desire to harm people for the sake of doing it. It's really more of like a science experiment than anything else. And so what he actually ends up doing, or at least in this time when he's in his room, he's got a pair of binoculars and he's basically spying on a girl named Sarah Jane, who is in effect Mary Jane Watson, right? Just by a different name. And it's one of these things where he actually refers to her as as an experiment of sorts. So right there, you've got a kind of detachment, right? Where he doesn't necessarily see himself as being a human despite living among humans, right? Like being a human himself, that he sees himself as kind of different. Now this will become hugely important once you get to like the traditional mythos as far as Spider-Man goes and all that kind of stuff. But the way that he speaks here is like commencing surveillance experiment stakeout number 16, right? Subject remains unaware of being under observation. Perfect. So he's basically spying on her as she's getting undressed, right? He's like, I must must collect samples from subject's living area for analysis, right? And then at that point, his uncle basically starts shouting at him and telling him, he's got to drive him to school and all that kind of stuff. But once he gets there, of course, again, his interactions with Mary Jane Watson, and we're just going to go ahead and call her that, right? We're going to call him Peter Parker. We're going to call her Mary Jane Watson. We're going to keep it simple here, right? I mean, they are alternate reality characters. They do have their alternate reality names, but they're by all standards of measurement, Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson, right? So we'll just go ahead and call them that. So basically, Mary Jane kind of asked Peter Parker to sit down next to him, right? Now, on the surface, this is not a very big thing, but for those of you guys who come from a background of being like socially awkward or lacking the kind of social skills necessary to talk to girls, this is something that's kind of huge, right? I mean, I used to be a socially awkward guy back in the day, if you can believe it or not. When I say back in the day, I mean like when I first started middle school, right? Like I'd say within like a year or two of middle school, I was awesome. But up until that point, I was kind of socially awkward, right? But the thing about this is that if you come from that kind of background, you understand the struggle of like just striking up a conversation with a person in general, let alone a girl you like, right? The idea behind this is they're basically going to a place called Alcor, right? Which is basically this kind of what you would normally expect with Peter Parker receiving his radioactive spider bite, right? In that particular location. And that's exactly what happens. Now, of course, as you also expect, if you're familiar with the existing Spider-Man mythos, Mary Jane Watson's basically in with Flash Thompson. Now, it didn't historically work this way, but it's one of the things where it's basically the love interest of Peter Parker is dating the school bully, right? And so because of that, one of the things to know, and this is something that I think a lot of young people struggle with, why do girls like bullies? Or why do girls like guys who are jerks? Because they exude confidence, man. Like they are just, they're some of the most confident people you're ever going to find. And one of the things that you will learn over the course of your life is confidence is key, right? Like you don't even have to be confident. You just need to look confident, right? But like confidence will get you where you want to be in this world, right? Believing in yourself. And so one of the things that's kind of given here, and even one of the things that Mary Jane Watson discusses is this idea that this institution, right? Alcor is basically a place where they like experiment on animals. They conduct a lot of heinous research here, right? A lot of terrible, terrible things, all in the pursuit of science. And so one of the crazy things about this is that unlike days past, when Peter was more of the curious one, right? The one who would stray off the beaten path in order to find his own way or to kind of go into that room and feel, to kind of see what's going on. What you actually get here is Mary Jane Watson that leads him into a restricted section. It's one of these things where like her goal is to save animals, right? To save as many animals as they possibly can. And so Peter actually ends up reaching into a container that holds an irradiated arachnid female. And of course it bites him. When that happens, Mary Jane Watson of course has a rabbit. Because of the fact that they enter the room and basically started messing with stuff, it activated the entire alarm system and security shows up. And so while they're kind of being interred there, Mary Jane Watson's parents of course come and pick her up. Peter Parker's parents are dead, right? That's one of the things he says is like his parents are dead and he basically lives with Uncle Ted, who's basically a stand-in for Uncle Ben because seemingly Aunt May's not really part of the picture and we're not really given an explanation as to why his aunt's not there, but we can largely assume that they are basically separated, right? That they basically split up. And we'll get more of an explanation as to why that's the case here in a second. But Mary Jane Watson, having lived next to Peter Parker, is kind of like, look, like he can come home with us, right? I mean, they have to release him to like an adult guardian, but it's like, he can come home with us. It's fine. Everything's going to be cool. And so when he gets back home, that's when his Uncle Ted shows up. And what you end up finding out is that Peter Parker is the way that he is because of the abuse he sustains at the hands of his uncle. So for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with this kind of stuff, the old adage is that sociopaths are made and psychopaths are born. And for the most part, that's kind of old hat. That stuff doesn't really apply anymore. And even the terms sociopath and psychopath are considered antiquated terms that by and large, the notion of a psychopath versus a sociopath just kind of fall under the umbrella of antisocial personality disorder. And a lot of that's because the various attributes of the two cross over in a lot of ways, right? Like a psychopath lacks the ability to feel remorse. A psychopath lacks the ability to feel empathy. A sociopath can feel empathy, and where a psychopath may be a lot more controlled, a lot more manipulative, far more planning in their approach to different situations. Sociopaths will be far more hot-headed, right? They'll be impulsive, different things like that. At the end of the day, both of them can be made, right? There are genetic components to a psychopath, but it's not necessarily that way. That Peter here looks to be a classic case of what we would call a sociopath, right? That he was made this way. And the reason why is because his Uncle Ted is highly abusive, right? That he considers Peter to basically be this kind of goofball, this kind of kid who's always problematic, and even goes as far as to say that he never should have let social services talk him into taking Peter in. And so he actually beats Peter. And while that's happening, because Mary Jane Watson lives across the street, she hears it happening, right? It brings tears to her eyes, but she hears Peter begging as if his uncle just beats him, right, on a daily basis. Now, when that happens, or at least following that, at least the next day anyway, the kind of impulses that Peter begins to experience as a result of the spider bite begin to manifest. Now, this is where things totally change, because in the main Marvel universe, and really most alternate reality stories that involve Peter Parker or some variation of Peter Parker, whether it's Spider-Gwen or somebody like that, the whole process of him becoming Spider-Man usually manifests in the fact that, one, he feels more confident, he feels more energetic, right? Like as if he's just been working out his entire life and is just now feeling the effects of it, as well as the traditional things that you're used to seeing, him crawling on walls, his spider sense, different things along those lines. In this instance, whether it's because of his upbringing or something along those lines, the powers that begin to manifest actually fall in the range of more violent and dark abilities, right? In the sense that like he experiences a kind of hunger. And so as a result of this, he actually ends up grabbing a mouse that was caught in a mousetrap and essentially consumes it. Following that, he goes after a cat. And then in turn, when the cat scratches him and begins to get away, he ends up shooting his webbing by accident, realizing that he has it, ensnares the cat, and then realizes he can make a kind of home for himself, right? In the same way that a spider will fashion a web, Peter begins the same thing here. And so what ends up happening is later on that night, of course, Uncle Ted comes home and things happen exactly as you would expect them to, right? And some of you might have been watching this like, yeah, man, it's about time Uncle Ted got his due, right? So ultimately, when Uncle Ted comes in, of course, the lights are out, the whole thing's done. He's pissed off that Peter doesn't have dinner ready. When he gets into his room, he basically finds all these different just kind of cocoon type things, right? Basically all these animals from around the neighborhood that have basically been ensnared by Peter that he's essentially saving as meals. And that's what spiders do, right? Spiders will catch an object or catch a thing that shows up in their web, or at least activates their web. They'll ensnare it, and then sometimes they'll eat it immediately. Other times they'll store it for later use. But regardless, Peter's just laying in wait, basically attached to his ceiling, and then immediately goes after his Uncle Ted, right? Now, following that, you basically end up picking up with him as he's making his way to school. And of course, you've got all these posters for missing cats and different things along those lines, right? Animals that had vanished. And then Flash Thompson shows up, right? Flash Thompson starts giving him a hard time, having no idea that Peter is basically eating a bird that he had kept away in his locker, which is really kind of weird. But with Flash Thompson giving him a hard time, kind of making fun of him, that sort of a thing, ultimately Peter kind of does exactly what you've seen over the course of the traditional Spider-Man mythos, where he stands up to Flash Thompson with this new vow of confidence. The difference here is that unlike Peter, who usually gets in some kind of a fight with Flash, overpowers him, and then basically demonstrates, I'm not someone to be trifled with, in this instance, he kills Flash Thompson and he eats him, right? Now, you don't actually see it happen. Instead, it's alluded to, right? Flash says, like, you won't be laughing when I wipe that grin off your face with my fist. And then in turn, Peter's like, well, name a time and a place. And Flash says, okay, well then how about during lunch, right? Out in like the locker room. And so it's like, lunch? That sounds perfect, right? And so given what we've seen so far, Peter's basically going to eat Flash Thompson. Now, following that, of course, again, after school, making his way back to his home, he ends up coming across a kid who's putting up a poster looking for his pet. Peter leads him back to his house and then ultimately seems to consume that kid as well. And so all this comes to a head with Mary Jane showing up at his house last night. And the reason why is because Flash Thompson hasn't shown up, right? She doesn't know where he is. He usually always calls, that kind of a thing. And Peter kind of dismisses it insofar as just being like, I mean, what do you ever see in that guy anyway, right? And it's kind of like, the guy was always a jerk. Like, why would you date somebody like him, And so there is almost kind of a romantic moment, right? With this sort of new confidence that Peter has. Again, much like you would normally see in the main Spider-Man mythos, he makes a move on Mary Jane Watson. The difference here is that after kissing her, he immediately bites her. And of course, with that in mind, when she smacks him and just basically knocks away part of the skin on his face, you actually see what he's ended up becoming under his skin, that he is basically a giant human spider. I mean, he's got like 8 eyes and just like these mandibles coming out of his mouth and all kinds of crazy stuff, right? Of course, Mary Jane Watson's terrified for her life, ends up stumbling into his room to find his uncle strapped to the bed. Peter's basically just been feeding on him all this time. And then the kid that he had kidnapped earlier is basically strung upside down, with Peter having the intention to feed on him at a later date, right? I mean, I told you guys, man, this story gets dark, dude. It is dark. Now, the funny thing about this is that in this whole process, as Mary Jane is trying to like get away from Peter, right? He's kind of stalking her a little bit and she's begging for her life. And he's like, look, I wouldn't hurt you. Like, why would I kill you? That's never gonna happen. He's like, today, like, I'm a carrier, right? You're gonna be the mother of my children. And that's when you end up finding out that what he had done with Uncle Ted is he had actually deposited spider eggs in him. And all those spider eggs just come pouring out of him, right? His mouth, his ears, his eyes, the whole 9 yards, just come dumping out of this guy. They immediately immediately go and try to basically swarm Mary Jane. And then of course, that basically leads to the arrival of Morlun. Now, here's the thing about this. This again kind of ties into the nature of Spider-Verse, that Morlun is one of the inheritors. And what these guys are doing is just traveling around the multiverse, killing everybody who is basically some variation of Spider-Man. Doesn't matter who they are or what they are. And that's kind of the irony behind this, is because under normal circumstances, when you look at the edge of Spider-Verse stories, or even the lead up to Spider-Verse, that Morlun was basically a bad guy, right? Killing these Spider-Men who were heroes, who were just trying to do the right thing. In this instance, he's kind of more of a good guy, right? Now, he's a good guy by circumstance. It's not as though he somehow changed his tune and decided to become a hero, killing off all the different evil Spider-Men across the multiverse. It just happens to be this is a universe where Peter Parker ended up becoming some giant twisted version of a human spider and was about to kill Mary Jane, and he showed up and just happened to rescue her, right? The funny thing about this is that when you're talking about somebody like Morlun, and this is something that we've seen consistently, this dude's on a whole different level. This kid, right? I mean, he's only been Spider-Man, or at least been a Spider-Man-esque character for like a couple days or something like that. So quite literally, Morlun tears this kid apart. I mean, he rips his arm off, he tears the mandibles out of his face. I mean, he just wrecks this kid, right? And then in turn just absorbs all the life force from him and basically kills him in the process. And so following that, what you end up doing is picking up with Mary Jane Watson the next day. And so as she's kind of getting ready for school and all that kind of stuff, you basically end up having her looking at this bite that she has from Peter Parker, and then suddenly there's movement, only for a baby spider to crawl out, and suddenly for like all these spiders to come dumping out of this opening, presumably to consume Mary Jane Watson alive. All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob. We are back with Spider-Verse. Now, this is the week of Thanksgiving. So just so you guys know, videos are gonna be pretty scant this week. We're kind of hammering them out on Monday and Tuesday, and then my guys get the rest of the week off. Normally, I would just give them the whole week, but I wanted to kind of upload some of these, or at least record some of these, and we were running a little short on time last week and over the course of the weekend. So you'll have 3 videos. You'll have this one, you'll have a second one on Wednesday, we'll have Beyond Omega Level on Friday, and then that'll be it. And then next week, we'll pick back up with our regular scheduled programming. So what this does here is this picks up with Earth 98-120, yet another alternate reality here in Marvel Comics. And this one specifically focuses on Miguel O'Hara. Now, one of the things about this is that this version of Miguel is actually part of the Avengers of this universe. And we'll explain Miguel here in a little bit, or at least give him a little more detail. But this version of Miguel here, again, as part of the Avengers, is basically experiencing this kind of feeling where somebody's stalking him, right? Where somebody's hunting him. Now, here's one of the big differences between Miguel O'Hara and the other Spider-Man, and this is something that we'll address as things go on with Spider-Verse, is that each time a version of Miguel is killed, he feels it, right? He actually experiences a kind of dizziness or a kind of haziness that impacts him physically whenever that happens. Now, this particular Miguel doesn't really seem to experience that. Instead, you basically have Morlun who shows up on the scene and basically overpowers the Avengers. And when I say overpowers these guys, it's no small thing, right? Like, these are some heavy hitters in Marvel Comics. Well, heavy might be a little over exaggeration here. I mean, you got Captain America and you got Wolverine, that's cool. You do have Genus Vell. This guy is nuts. Okay, assuming this guy has the same power that his main Marvel Universe version does, he's actually a genetically created version of Marvel of the Kree. But this guy got so powerful, he actually recreated the universe, right? This guy's powers is just, it's stupid, right? He was so powerful, Marvel had to kill him off and then basically replace him with Phyla-Vell. Of course, Phyla-Vell was really cool. She ended up becoming the new Quasar in Marvel Comics during the whole Dan Abnett cosmic era. But nonetheless, this guy's a universal force is basically what we're getting at here, right? Morlun overpowers every single one of these guys. Like, he literally drains Genus Vell of his cosmic energy. He attacks Wolverine and Captain America, takes both those guys out, and then in turn kills Miguel O'Hara, siphons his energy off, and then basically bails. Now, when that version of Miguel O'Hara dies, Miguel O'Hara from the main Marvel Universe, that's the one who experiences this whole thing. Every single time that happens, it almost kind of seems like he's losing a piece of himself, right? It's kind of a mental backlash to a degree. Now, while this is happening, of course, he's currently in the present in the main Marvel Universe. It's a whole story arc involving like Tyler Stone and everything from his timeline. Not overly important here. The fact is that he is currently here in the present day. There's some villains that are trying to get away. He, of course, ends up incapacitating them. But the first thing he comes to the realization of is, with all this going on, I need to get a hold of Peter Parker, right? I need to find out what's going on here. And so what he ends up realizing here is that with everything going on, once these criminals are basically sorted out, at this point, it's on the hunt that that caused him to feel this just kind of giant headache of what's going on there. And so what you end up doing is that in this moment when you have Morlun that kills that alternate reality version of Miguel O'Hara, there's actually a kind of portal, which is more of a viewing screen that opens, that allows Miguel O'Hara from Earth 6375 to view everything that's happening. And of course, he's basically realizing that Morlun and the Inheritors are killing all the different versions of himself. Now, for those of you guys who are familiar with Marvel Comics, specifically in the mid-2000s with Exiles issue number 75, you know who this guy Miguel O'Hara is. He was part of the Exiles for a long time. Now, for those of you guys who don't know who the Exiles are, they're probably one of the most underutilized but most interesting superhero teams in all of Marvel Comics. These guys basically travel the multiverse. And so you got some stupidly good stories with the Exiles back in the day. The Exiles stories that I actually enjoyed the most were the ones that were basically post House of M, the World Tour story arc. So you got to see them traveling to like the future Imperfect universe with Maestro Hulk. You got to see all kinds of cool stuff, right? It was awesome to see them travel the most popular alternate realities in Marvel Comics, but they were basically like imagine an Avengers team on a multiversal level. That was basically the Exiles. I'm very, very certain we're gonna see them in the future of the MCU coming out of the events of Doctor Strange 2, assuming the multiverse remains intact. But nonetheless, this guy Miguel O'Hara was part of them. Now, one of the things he says is that while he was there with the Exiles, he did become aware of Morlun and the Inheritors, but they never actually crossed paths. And a lot of that was just because of what we saw when it came to like Spider UK, right? Like the incursions, dealing with all that stuff, and the fact that like Saturnine didn't really care about the fact that Morlun and all the Inheritors were hunting the Spider-Man from across the multiverse, that the multiverse itself was actually failing. While the Exiles were a big thing in the mid-2000s and the multiversal collapse had not actually begun yet, there were a lot of other threats out there the Exiles had to deal with. And so the reality is these different Inheritors traveling around the multiverse and killing Spider-Man wasn't the most important thing to the Exiles. And honestly, they didn't realize how far-reaching it was. It was really more whispers and murmurs, right? Things that people were kind of talking about in these sort of shadowy corners of the multiverse, but nobody really knew that it was as big as it was, that the Inheritors had been killing hundreds, if not thousands of Spider-Man up to that point, and they've just continued on during this time, right? And so as a result of that, with this alternate reality version of Miguel, he realizes that there's so few Miguel O'Haras left in the multiverse that his idea is to basically find as many alternate versions of himself as he can, and then basically unite them. That's an important thing to grasp here. This guy doesn't know Superior Spider-Man is assembling an entire spider army. He's totally unaware of that, and it makes sense, right? If I asked you right now, what's going on in Times Square? Like, what are people doing in Times Square? You couldn't give me an answer because you're not there. You have no idea what's happening out there unless you have an apartment that overlooks Times Square and you're watching this video. Then sure, you could give me an answer. But outside of that, you wouldn't be able to give me an answer. And that's what we're talking about, right? I mean, it's one of the things we've said before. The multiverse is a big place. And so it's very, very easy for all kinds of things to happen out there and for you to have no idea that any of it's actually happening. Now, this also seems to indicate that each one of the Miguels that were killed had never seen or never been greeted by the spider army of Superior Spider-Man. Either that, or if it did happen, it was after this version of Miguel stopped watching. And so regardless, his response, this alternate reality version of Miguel is, we need to go to the Earth 616 universe. We need to go to the main Marvel universe. And when this reality's version of Mary Jane Watson asks him, why are we going there? His response is, because it's the one place that Morlun is scared of, right? It's basically kind of like a safe haven. He's like, Morlun doesn't want to go to the main Marvel universe. He's afraid of being there. He's died there before. And every time he goes there, he seems to die. So he's just terrified of it. The problem is that main universe is not a permanent safe space, because while Morlun is afraid to go there, his other relatives are not. And so it's only a matter of time before they show up in that universe and try to attack that reality's version of Peter Parker. But at the end of the day, we need to go find Miguel O'Hara in the 616 universe, wherever it is that he happens to be. And so what ends up happening here is that following Miguel's story, he begins kind of experiencing, again, one of these just giant headaches. And then following his kind of leaving a big meeting and going onto the rooftop, the portal opens up. And when it does, you're basically met by the arrival of Morlun that caught up with Spider-Man 2099 from Earth 6375. It killed that alternate reality version of Miguel. And when he did, of course, he siphoned off his energy, basically, taking his life force. And then Miguel, again, experiences that massive headache that basically happens whenever an alternate reality version of himself dies. And so, of course, Morlun drops the body. But it's one of the funny things here is that Miguel watches all this happen. And while it seems like Morlun is standing there for hours, in reality, it's only been a couple seconds or so. But he looks terrified. He's afraid to enter the main Marvel universe. Universe. It terrifies him because he's just been killed by Peter Parker every time he's come there. And so he doesn't actually enter. Instead, he just stays. And then eventually the portal closes and he basically walks away. But because of this, because of the fact that main Marvel Universe Miguel, right, 616 Miguel, witnesses the death of his alternate reality counterpart, that he basically realizes we've got to find Peter Parker. Now, having said that, there are a couple things that I do want to address here. First and foremost, this version of Miguel O'Hara, the main Marvel Universe Miguel O'Hara, he is referred to as 616 Miguel. That's actually not accurate. Technically, he comes from Earth 928, which is in the future. Earth 2099 was initially the actual future of the main Marvel Universe until Marvel started abandoning the ideas of guaranteed futures and in turn turned them into alternate realities, just possible futures. And so that's why you see stories like Marvel 2099, you see Days of Future Past, Old Man Logan, they're all referred to as alternate realities because while any one of these universes could actually become the future of Marvel Comics, we wouldn't really know until we got to that point. And creating an absolute guaranteed future started to become a big no-no under Joe Quesada, right? It was one of those things where make it an alternate reality. It's a possible future. That way we're not locked into having to make sure that everything that we publish leads into that future. And so the other thing about this is the reason why Miguel has these headaches is because the alternate reality version of himself from 6375 had basically used exile technology across the multiverse to create a kind of headband that psychically linked every single Miguel O'Hara. Now, it wasn't as though all the Miguels knew of all the other Miguels. Instead, it allowed him to know where all the Miguels were at and what they were doing. But because of the fact that the headband was linked to the multiverse, it linked all the Miguels to him using a psychic connection. And that's why the main Marvel Universe Miguel O'Hara would experience those headaches because he was basically getting visions of when each version of himself died. It's also the reason why when that version of Miguel with the headband died, the headache that Miguel experienced was worse than any of the others. And so again, I felt like that just kind of needed to be stated here. I know it seemed a little confusing at first, and that was one of the things that I didn't initially catch on to when we originally covered Spider-Verse, but I felt like it was something to sort of reiterate here. So what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and happy Thanksgiving a day early. Technically, it's not until tomorrow, but if you're anything like me, you're gonna be filling your bellies full of food, you're gonna get the itis, you're gonna get a good night's sleep, and then you're gonna wake up bright and early on Friday and try to make it to those Black Friday sales. I know I am. I got my credit card paid off and everything. I'm ready to max this thing out. I'm gonna be painfully irresponsible with my financial life on Friday. But we are officially here with the actual main Spider-Verse event. Only took us like a month to get here. So all the lead up is done, right? Basically all the lead up is finished. We're in the main event now, the throes of Spider-Verse. And we pick up with Peter Parker as he is contacted at 6 a.m. by J. Jonah Jameson, who basically sends him over to Armstrong Park. And the reason why is that in Armstrong Park, there's just some guy out there causing all kinds of problems and ripping stuff up, only for us to find out that it's Morlun. Now, here's a crazy thing about this. Right off the bat, Peter doesn't recognize him. He doesn't know who he is. Instead, Morlun just kind of taunts him the same way that he always has and saying like, we've done this on so many Earths across the multiverse, you know, and it's almost one of these things where he's like, where he kind of explains who he is and Peter's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. We're not even on Earth. And then in response, Morlun's like, I don't even know why I bother explaining this when all you guys do is die. And then he in turn just kills Spider-Man, only for us to find out that this is actually Earth 449. This is an alternate reality where humanity had basically colonized the moon and they live on the blue area of the moon. For those of you guys who don't know what that is, the blue area of the moon is the oxygen-rich area of the moon, right? Where you can really have entire bases of operations. The Watchers stayed there, the Inhumans lived there, Apocalypse, the X-Men villain, had a base of operations there for a while. It's been used by a lot of people. It was created by the Kree when they were working on creating the Inhumans on Earth, and it just stayed there ever since. But we end up switching back to what's basically Loom World, right? This is Earth 1. This is the base of operations for the Inheritors. This is where these guys operate out of. And again, they work directly with or really control the Master Weaver. Now remember, the Master Weaver is the guy who basically controls the gateway to alternate dimensions. The way this is depicted and the way that it's done, you have what's essentially called the Web of Life and Destiny. It's a really overly convoluted and complicated method of explaining the idea that the Master Weaver can basically allow people, or at least open a a portal using the web of life and destiny to transport anybody to any universe that's connected to the web of life and destiny, right? So it's literally strands. Like, it looks like a giant web, but each one of these universes is basically represented as a strand as part of this web. So if you were to cut away a universe from this web and remove it, then it would be isolated from the rest of the multiverse. Now, one of the things that you guys are also going to notice over the course of the Spider-Verse event is that the web of life and destiny will actually begin to shrink in size. And the reason why is because, remember, while the whole of Spider-Verse is taking place, the events of Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers are going on. So universes are smashing into each other, they're being destroyed two at a time. It's just the collapse of everything, the end of everything. And it's a really, really cool depiction by Dan Slott in them to actually shrink the web of life and destiny as the entire events of the incursions go on, showing us that the multiverse is getting smaller. Universes are being destroyed. And of course, this leads to Morlun showing up here after basically consuming Spider-Man from Earth 449. And he's actually kind of teased by his brothers and sisters. Now, that's one of the things to know here is the Inheritor family is pretty prideful, and they're also just dicks, but it's also one of these things where they're exceedingly arrogant insofar as they're like, we're at the top of the food chain. And in a lot of ways they are. They really, really are, right? They're arrogant, but they can also back it up, right? Technically they feed, or they can feed on anything that is part of the animal totem, right? So any superhero that represents some aspect of the animal kingdom, like Panther, Spider-Man, anybody out there like that, they can feed on those individuals, but they prefer to feed on spiders. And in fact, they were directed by their father to feed on spiders and seemingly nothing else. So we'll actually get a motivation for that when we're introduced to the father of the Inheritors, because I'm gonna tell you right now, man, that dude is broken. God, he is so OP. It's nuts how cool he was. But the thing about this is his family basically knows he avoids Earth 616, right? He avoids the main Marvel universe, and they kind of tease him about it a little bit. And so at the same time, of course, you end up having Verna, who's basically one of the Inheritors who assembles her hounds. In reality, this is Dan Slott borrowing heavily from the events of Days of Future Past. And I would even go as far as to say that because of the fact that the Inheritors have existed across the multiverse, they probably came across Days of Future Past. For those of you guys who don't know how that whole thing worked, with Days of Future Past, as we've talked about before, it was basically when things popped off, the mutants were considered a credible threat, and basically the Sentinel program was activated, became self-aware, and then conquered North America, and then basically set its sights on trying to conquer the world. But because Sentinels couldn't be everywhere, one of the things that they did is they created what were called hounds, basically mutants tasked with tracking down other mutants. Rachel Summers was one of those, right? So now she's in the main Marvel universe as part of Jonathan Hickman's X-Men run, but when she originally appeared, she was initially a hound. She was used by the Sentinels and even some humans before the total Sentinel takeover to basically hunt other mutants and bring them in. And so that's kind of where this seems to come from. As far as these hounds go, what you have is Silver Sable, you've got Fireheart, and you've basically got Kraven the Hunter. They basically help Verna track down spider totems across the multiverse and then basically help her in her hunt. For some people and even other members of her family, it looks like it's just kind of cheating to a degree, that the nature of like hunting the spider totems should be done is like a solo act, but they've sort of moved beyond this being a sort of rite of testing or a rite of approval, and instead moved into the direction of like, now it's just for fun, right? It's just for sport, just kind of what they do. And so at that point, when Verna goes on her mission to find her spiders, you end up switching over to Peter Parker in the main Marvel universe, right? Of course, again, he's met by the arrival of Silk. We talked about her before. The two of them can't stop banging. There's a reason for that. There's a really, really, really cool reason for that. The hierarchy and the role the spider totems play. For those of you guys who are a little curious or a little confused about the nature of spider totems, that will all become clear as we progress through the story, so don't worry. I'm not going to leave you hanging. Just kind of hang with me for a minute. But it's one of these things where Cindy Moon actually pitches the idea that because she's becoming more capable in terms of her role as a spider, that Peter Parker should like leave New York or even just leave Earth and like go to the moon or go somewhere else, right? It doesn't really matter. I mean, she's half joking here, but she's also half serious, because as long as the two of them operate in the same vicinity, they will be attracted to each other. Their hormones and really their role within the nature of the spider totem hierarchy will bring them together, and they will ultimately end up just ignoring everything and just procreating like rabbits again, right? But what you end up finding out here is that following the events of Spider Island, for those of you guys who remember that, when you had like the, everybody on the island of New York literally turning into a spider, that one of the things that Dr. Octopus had done when he was Superior Spider-Man is he had largely formed his own kind of spider army. What you ended up getting was actually a whole bunch of these criminals who just stole these suits and tech. They pretended to work for Spider Spider-Man and then robbed a bank, which is actually not the most unintelligent thing to do. It's a pretty good plan. Now, of course, Peter Parker and Cindy Moon catch up to them, but while Peter Parker is trying to apprehend these guys, suddenly he's met by Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman, as well as Anya Corazon, and then Miguel O'Hara. Now, Jessica Drew, most of you guys know from Marvel Comics, you guys have heard of her, right? She's Spider-Woman, she's an Avenger, that kind of a thing. Miguel O'Hara, we just talked about in the previous video. Anya Corazon is somebody who's actually worth discussing here. So Anya Corazon's not really an actual spider person, meaning she wasn't really bitten by a radioactive spider per se. She's actually part of a group called the Spider Society, which has existed for a long time. So if the inheritors hunt down spider totems and then kill them and consume their energy, then the Spider Society is the antithesis of that. They actually worship spider totems. And so while they wouldn't necessarily attack anybody out there who is a quote unquote villain, they will fight anybody who is considered to be a threat to anybody who's an actual spider person. Now, the other thing about this is that for the Spider Society to be effective, they had what are called hunters, which were basically their soldiers. And they were individuals who were imbued with what was essentially mysticism that gave them the powers of a spider. And that's where Anya Corazon comes from. Initially, it was believed that she was supposed to be a hunter. That ended up changing later on in Marvel Comics. They actually switched it to a new person instead of her. But for a time, she was pretty cool and pretty popular. The overall gist here is that there's all kinds of members of the spider community here. More so than that, you get Billy Braddock, right? So Spider UK, which we've talked about him, we've covered him. Mayday Parker, we covered her. Spider-Ham is here. Like, it's just this enormous coming together of all these different spider characters. Now, here's the thing to understand. Peter Parker doesn't know what's going on with all the different Spider-Man being hunted across the multiverse. He has no idea that's happening. He doesn't even know that like the entire spider army is being assembled. Remember, Peter Parker's just got his body back from when Dr. Octopus had it as Superior Spider-Man. And so where Dr. Octopus, Superior Spider-Man, was assembling this great big huge spider army, this all happened without Peter Parker being aware of what was going on. He initially thinks it's Mysterio, that Mysterio's messing with his head. He's using some kind of trick or something like that to dupe Spider-Man's spider sense and to basically send all this stuff into disarray and make it look like this kind of thing is going on, which really speaks volumes about the character of Mysterio because he could do it, right? That's just how good he is. Now, of course, this leads to Mayday Parker revealing her identity and basically telling Peter, no, right? Like, we are actually here. It's not some kind of an illusion. You know me, you've met me before, everything's cool. Essentially, we really do have a big thing going on. We need you here, right? And that's when Spider UK is like, you faced the threat before, like, it's Morlun. Like, Morlun is who we have to deal with. Now, where Peter thinks that Morlun is coming back, the response to Spider UK is, no, it's not Morlun who's coming here, it's his brother Deimos. And that's when Peter begins to learn Morlun's got relatives. Remember, up until this point, this moment right here, Peter only thought it was Morlun. He thought that was it, right? Morlun was like just the inheritor, that like Ezekiel Sims, the person who warned Peter Parker about Morlun in the early days of J. Michael Straczynski's run, when all of this really began, if we're being honest with ourselves, that there wasn't really a whole lot of discussion about the extended family of Morlun. It was really just, Morlun is hunting you, Peter. Make sure you stay safe because he'll take your energy and kill you, right? That's basically what he'll do. And so it was just kind of Peter fleeing for his life against Morlun, then eventually fighting him, and then killing him a handful of times. And so this is the first time Peter learns that there's actually a huge inheritor family, and there's more than just Morlun, that there's actually other people there. And so the response is, yes, Peter, like, Morlun's brother is coming here. There is a big inheritor family. We have to go. Like, you have to get to this portal. We need to take off as fast as we possibly can. Now, at that point, you switch over to Wundagore Mountain in Eastern Europe, right? The home of the High Evolutionary, and you pick up with Kane. Now, here's the thing about Kane, right? Kane, Ben Reilly, all these guys. So here's the thing about this. So back in the 1990s, and we've actually got these videos covered here on the channel, and they're part of the Spider-Man playlist if you want to check them out after this video. But what you had was a story called the Clone Saga. Probably one of the most reviled stories among Spider-Man fans, right? It's one of those where it was just, it was only supposed to be like maybe a 12 or 13 issue series, and they ended up expanding it, and it spanned like 3 years, right? It was just, it ballooned up to being unnecessarily large. But the overall gist here is that Kane and Ben Reilly were clones of Peter Parker that were created by the Jackal. And the idea was to basically screw with the head of Peter to even convince him that he himself was a clone. And so the whole gist behind the story was it was Marvel asking us as the reader, which one of these guys is the actual real Peter Parker? Because you didn't know which one it was. You didn't know if it was Ben Reilly, you didn't know if it was Kane, and you didn't know if it was Peter Parker. Again, that's one of the reasons why it wasn't very well received. But Kane is just kind of here as part of Mount Wundagore, basically keeping all the people here protected, and then he's met by Deimos, who basically begins the process of trying to kill him and consume his energy. Now, as he goes in for the kill against Kane, that's when you end up getting Bruce Banner from Earth 7105, who's not a Hulk, but he is a Spider-Man, the Old Man Spider of Earth 4, whose identity is never given to us, and then a few others. You've of course got Gwen Stacy, Spider-Gwen, who's here as well, and that as they're basically trying to protect Kane and then fight off Deimos, you've got Ben Reilly who steps in. Right now, this is the Spider-Man of Earth 94, so it's not the main Marvel Universe version of Peter Parker. He's been recruited here by the other members of the Spider-Man army, so that's why you have a Ben Reilly here. It's not the Ben Reilly, just a Ben Reilly from an alternate reality. But for the most part, during this whole conflict, Bruce Banner from this alternate reality is killed, right? Or at least his back is broken, so they basically leave him for dead. There's nothing they can do. And in reality, it's not really a kind of coldness that leads them to do that. It's because it's just practicality, right? That if they were to stay there and they were to fight Deimos, they would lose more than just one guy. And so ultimately, it's one of those things where it's like, we can't sacrifice the entire team for just one individual, right? Like, it sucks we got to leave him behind, but we do. And so what you end up getting is all these guys going through this portal and then showing up in Central Park in Earth 13. Now, Earth 13 is probably one of the coolest universes that you don't really get a whole lot of exposition about. Instead, this is the story where Peter Parker never lost the Enigma Force. So back in 1989, well, really December of 1989, running into 1990, Marvel had a story called Acts of Vengeance. And this is basically a story where Loki brought together all the different villains, or at least the most popular villains of Marvel Comics, and then switched around who they were going to fight and had them fight against different heroes. And so during this time, what you had was a manifestation of the Enigma Force. Now, the Enigma Force is exactly what you think it is, right? It's a super powerful force of energy, but we don't really know much about it outside of the fact that it basically comes from the microverse, right? Like literally a microscopic universe inside the main Marvel universe. But the overall gist here is that whenever the Enigma Force appears, it's like the Watcher showing up, right? Like, it's a significant thing. During the Acts of Vengeance storyline, the Enigma Force possessed Spider-Man because it was on the hunt for a person that it needed to possess. And it's one of those things where the Enigma Force does that. It'll appear and then it'll bond to a person and then a successive series of people until it finally settles on a compatible host. Peter Parker happened to be one of those. And it was actually a really cool thing. There was one point where he punched the Incredible Hulk like into space. It was amazing. But basically, Earth 13 is a universe where Peter never lost the Enigma Force, where he basically held on to it seemingly even all the way up to this point, right? He's just super powerful. Now, one of the things to know is the Enigma Force has been shown to be capable in different capacities over the years, so it's really inconsistent in terms of its power level. But a lot of what's going on here is just hitting Peter Parker exceedingly hard because it's a lot to happen at one time. Basically, in a matter of what we could probably attribute to being 20 minutes or so, he's met all these alternate reality versions of himself, including an animated version of himself who's a pig, right? It's cool to see Ben Reilly again, an alternate reality version of himself that basically never became or never got rid of the Enigma Force. And then while all that's going on, when he's asked the question like why, why am I here, right? Like, why is this whole big thing being assembled? He's told, because the inheritors are here, right? Like, one of the things he's told by Spider-Man from Earth 13 is that because the Enigma Force is part and parcel to a universe, if he were to leave his universe, that he would basically lose the power of the Enigma Force. He would just become a regular Spider-Man. And that's why Earth 13 is a safe haven, because this guy is a cosmic character. And his argument is, if the inheritors were to show up here to this reality, I would obliterate them. It'd be a fool's errand, right? It'd be a suicide mission. And that's why they use this as a safe place. But he says, this battle that's happening, Peter, this war with like all this stuff, the inheritors, we have you here because you're our secret weapon. You're the greatest of us all, right? You're the only one who's ever faced against Morlun and survived. Not only that, actually killed him a couple times. And then beyond that, there's actually a much bigger role that Peter's going to play as part of this great big huge Spider-Verse event. That's when I say the spider totems will be explained. But what we end up doing here is switching over to an alternate reality. It's labeled as Earth 610. For those of you guys who read the original Spider-Verse event, you guys know it's actually 1610. Why does 1610 matter? Because, ladies and gentlemen, this universe is home to what I consider to be the greatest spider character ever made in the history of Marvel Comics, none other than Miles Morales. Yes, it is. And Miles Morales is about to have a very, very terrible experience because as he is mourning the loss of his mother, Rio Morales, because this takes place right when his mom dies, you've immediately got got the arrival of Verna and all of her hounds that just come pouring in with the intention of killing Miles, killing this reality's version of Jessica Drew, who's basically a clone of Peter Parker, consuming their energies and walking away. She's my cherry pie, cool drink of water, such a sweet surprise, tastes so good, make a grown man cry, sweet cherry pie. Hello everyone! How are you guys doing today? As you guys can tell, I'm in much better spirits. I'm still a little nasally, but I'm in much better spirits. Also, for a couple of reasons. One, because I get to see an early screening of Spider-Man No Way Home this weekend for the press junket, which is going to be cool. So I get to interview the cast. No idea who I'm going to interview yet. And two, I have a theory about Spider-Man No Way Home that I'm going to talk about over at Geek Culture Explained, probably on Wednesday. So here's the thing. Let us continue with our discussion on Spider-Verse, specifically where we picked off with last time when I left you guys on a massive cliffhanger, which was Verna of the Inheritors basically going after Miles Morales, the ultimate Spider-Man. Now, as soon as this happens, you immediately are met by the arrival of Assassin Spider-Man and Spider-Punk, right? Punk Rock Spider-Man. But these guys basically show up and they're able to fight off Verna and her forces pretty quickly. And then of course, they immediately recruit Miles as well as Jessica Drew from the Ultimate Universe. And we'll talk about her here in a second. But one of the funny things about this is that Miles recognizes Superior Spider-Man, and he recognizes him from the events of Cataclysm. Well, technically it was Cataclysm, the Ultimate's last stand, and Miles Morales only saw Superior Spider-Man for like 2 seconds while he was trying to escape the Baxter Building in the main Marvel Universe when they were time displaced to an alternate reality after Wolverine broke time in Age of Ultron. There was a lot that happened in Cataclysm. The important thing is Miles Morales didn't know that was Superior Spider-Man. He thought it was just regular Peter Parker wearing a different costume, albeit a better costume. But the important thing here is that because they're basically on the verge of death, this leads to Miles and Jessica Drew basically going alongside Superior Spider-Man and everybody else. Now, at that point, you switch over to Earth 13. This is something that I want to clarify for everybody because it's something that seemed to throw people off in the last few videos that we did. And this is largely my fault for not making this a little clear. What you have here are basically two teams of Spider-Man that by and large don't seem to be aware of the other. That you've got Superior Spider-Man and his team, and then you've got this team that grabbed Peter Parker and have him in the safe zone for Earth 13. So that's something that I wanted to sort of explain here. Now, the other thing that goes on is, again, we'll kind of explain this as we go forward into the future of the Spider-Verse event. But one of the things that's going on here is that, again, they refer to Peter Parker as basically their chosen one. And this is for a couple different reasons, but the most significant reason is because he's the only Spider-Man across the entirety of the multiverse, seemingly, that's faced off against an inheritor and not only lived, but actually killed them. Remember, Morlun's died a couple times at the hands of Spider-Man. And so because of that, he's kind of like the guy that they're really picking to sort of lead them into the whole thing, because he seems to be the one to actually know how to win. Now, while all that's going on, you of course have Cindy Moon. And again, because of the fact that she's the bride as part of the Spider Totems, again, we'll explain that in future videos, that what happens is she actually kind of pokes around at these different versions of Peter Parker. And the reason why is because, as we discussed again in a previous video, Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe gives off a kind of scent, a sort of pheromone that draws Cindy Moon to him. And so the two of them just can't stop knocking boots. And so Cindy Moon's question is, if she's in close proximity to other Spider-Man, will it have the exact same effect? In the end, it doesn't really seem to be the case, that she does pick up on pheromones and there is some general level of attraction, but Dan Slott doesn't really differentiate between her just kind of being like, I mean, that version of Peter Parker is hot, and her just kind of being like, I need to get with them, right? Because of like the pheromones and all that kind of stuff. The other part of this is that with the team becoming aware of the fact that there is a second team of Spider-Man out there, their goal is to bring them to this universe. Because remember, Earth 13 is home to Cosmic Spider-Man, basically a version of Peter Parker with the power cosmic, the Enigma Force, right? He never lost it in this universe like he did in the main Marvel universe. And one of the things that's been established here is that because this version of Peter Parker has so much power, the Inheritors would be foolish to come here and to basically start a conflict. And so in a lot of ways, they're literally in just like this giant steel vault, right? Where they're basically safe from the Inheritors. The other Spider team, it's like they're hiding out in a hut made of straw, right? I mean, it's only a matter of time before the Inheritors find them. And when they do, they'll overpower all of them, especially if the Inheritors show up in a large number. And so you basically end up seeing the group splitting off into teams. Now, there's a couple things that happen here. One, Cindy Moon is told to stay put just because of the concern being that with her having her pheromones and all that kind of stuff, that it could lead the inheritors to them. And again, that ties into the nature of the totems. But the other part is Peter Parker doesn't want Spider-Gwen to go, because as you guys know, Gwen Stacy died in his universe. And so in a lot of ways, it's kind of Peter Parker just not wanting to relive the death of Gwen Stacy. One of those things where he almost kind of believes in like predestination, that like Gwen Stacy across the multiverse is destined to die. He doesn't really say it that that's the case. You know, we're not really even told that's the case. In all honesty, the continued existence of Gwen Stacy seems to fly in the face of that. But because of the fact that it was a huge ordeal for him, he doesn't want to have to experience that again, let alone put her in jeopardy if he doesn't need to. And so what ends up happening is you basically switch over to the team of Superior Spider-Man when all the other Spider-Men emerge. Now, here's an important thing to understand. As soon as Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe shows up here, he immediately recognizes Superior Spider-Man, but he doesn't say anything, right? So Superior Spider-Man does not know this is Peter Parker, who gets his body back at a future point in time. At this point, Superior Spider-Man is just kind of operating under the idea that he will basically be Spider-Man forever, right? Or until his body gives out and he dies, whatever it is, but he doesn't really have to worry about losing his body again to Peter Parker. More so than that, what ends up happening is that Superior Spider-Man had actually developed a device that basically masked their scent from the inheritors. So the inheritors could show up on this world, and unless they're able to physically locate the individual Spider-Man under the protection of Superior Spider-Man, they would never be found. The problem here is that this device is designed to protect a particular number of people. It only has so much power to it. With all these other Spider-Men showing up here, it overrides the whole thing. That combined with the fact that Cindy Moon ignores her orders and shows up in this universe is basically ringing the dinner bell, right? It's like giant purple letters across the multiverse telling the inheritors, hey, we're all here. And the inheritors just come pouring in, right? I mean, really, it's only Deimos who shows up here, but Deimos shows up and starts attacking everybody. Now, here's a big difference. When it comes to Superior Spider-Man, one of the things that we covered when we initially covered his run, one of the things that was made apparent to us by Dan Slott is he does not mess around, that he is meticulous when it comes to battle strategy. And the reason why is because Dr. Octopus is so incredibly intelligent. And we'd have to believe that when he began to realize that Spider-Man from across the multiverse were being tracked down and killed by the inheritors, it wasn't enough to assemble a team. He also had to have some kind of battle strategy for what they could do when they faced off against the inheritors, because we saw them fight against some of the inheritors and they were overwhelmed pretty quickly. But as always, Dr. Octopus learned from his mistakes and then went forward from there. And so that's why you see him basically barking orders at these different Spider-Men to attack in different ways. And by and large, while they don't necessarily get the upper hand on Deimos, they do exactly what they were supposed to do, which was create an opening whereby Superior Spider-Man could deliver the killing blow. And he succeeds. He kills Deimos, right? He kills one of the inheritors. And that's kind of a funny thing, because right off the bat, the response to that is something's wrong, that this body should have basically broken down. It's Peter Parker who recognizes it, right? In the various conflicts that he's had and in the times when Morlun has died, his body has dissolved. And so that's one of the big questions is, why hasn't the body of Deimos broken down here? Now, of course, the response, and really this is actually something that's noticed by Miguel O'Hara, that there's what's basically a stasis charge. That what had happened is Dr. Octopus had augmented his weaponry in the Superior Spider-Man suit with 2099 technology. And so what this has basically done is it's put the body of Deimos in a kind of stasis. And so what this means is they can take the body and then literally analyze it, study it. They can learn how the physiology of the inheritors work, which is probably one of the best possible things they could have at their disposal, right? They can find a weakness. They can reverse engineer how their powers work and find a way to prevent the inheritors from siphoning off the life force of the Spider-Man themselves. There's any number of ways they can approach this. Now, the other thing about that is that Peter Parker is not a fan of Superior Spider-Man killing Deimos. Now, again, this to a degree is kind of the naive nature of Peter Parker, that if this was just some random criminal out there, sure, I guess an argument could be made. But you're literally talking about a force of beings that are tracking them down, and that unless they're killed or stopped, incapacitated in some way, they will never stop. They will always come after them. And so this is one of those circumstances where the only way to stop them is to kill them. But the other big problem is they realize that the scent of Cindy Moon, of Silk, is basically more potent than any of the other Spider-Men here, or at least that seems to be the case. And so for the most part, they are all kind of grasping at straws. And it's one of the things that Old Man Spider says, right? We don't really know the identity of this guy. We simply really know they refer to him as Old Man. We'll find out who he is here in a minute, but he basically says, like, it doesn't matter what any of you believe, you're fumbling around in the dark, you have no idea what's actually happening, but I need to explain it to you. But in typical comic book fashion, this guy's killed. Not only is he killed, he's killed by Deimos. And so what we end up finding out here is that the inheritors have found a way to clone themselves, that in order to ensure that they won't be killed in any one particular universe, basically learning the lessons of what happened to Morlun, they send what are essentially clone bodies of themselves out into the multiverse in order to track down and kill these various Spider-Men, so that if one of these inheritors are killed, a clone takes their place. So they never have to worry about actually dying off as a race. It's a genius maneuver. It's an incredibly intelligent thing to do. And so with the other inheritors showing up as well, basically totaling in 3, the only thing these Spider-Men can do is run. And so they actually start breaking off into groups. The first group that breaks off is Ben Reilly, one of the clones of Peter Parker from an alternate reality, and Kane, the clone of Peter Parker from the main Marvel universe, along with Jessica Drew, who's a clone of Peter Parker from the Ultimate Universe. They break off to go try to find the clone factory where it is these inheritors are being created. Other members of the Spider-Man team start breaking off as well, right? You've got Jessica Drew, you've got Cindy Moon. They break off and do their thing. They kind of start splitting into factions, right? Spider-Man Noir actually ends up going with them. This was basically Marvel just kind of splitting the team off in order to launch tie-in comics, which we will cover. And in fact, we'll transition to one of those here in a second. But what you actually end up learning here as Peter Parker begins to make his escape, and Miles Morales, of course, goes through and all that kind of stuff, that he's stopped by Old Man Spider, who actually turns out to be Ezekiel from an alternate reality. Now, again, Ezekiel was the one who first introduced Peter Parker in the main Marvel universe to everything involving the inheritors in the first place, that the inheritors existed, they were tracking down Spider-Man, all that kind of stuff, right? All that work that J. Michael Straczynski did that led into the run of Dan Slott and this Spider-Verse event, it all harkens back to the original Ezekiel. This version of Ezekiel is from a reality where Morlun successfully killed that universe's version of Peter Parker. And so he basically donned the Spider-Man costume, or at least some variation of it, in order to carry on the legacy of Peter Parker. But what he says and what he does is kind of give him not really a list of names so much as a list of titles. He says the Scion, the Other, the Bride, they're all that matter. These individuals have to be kept safe. That's something that I want you guys to keep in the back of your head. But of course, again, what this does is it leads to us basically following the clones themselves, right? Following Jessica Drew, following Ben Reilly, and Kane. Now again, Jessica Drew is basically a clone of Peter Parker from an alternate universe from the Ultimate Universe. And in all honesty, she's basically Black Widow by all standards of measurement, right? Like the Ultimate Universe version of that character. And now that I think about it, I feel like that does deserve a little bit of explanation. So the way this worked in the Ultimate Universe is you did have a Natasha Romanoff, you did have a Black Widow. It turned out that in Ultimates 2, issues 10 through 13, that she was actually a traitor, and she ended up basically assisting the Liberators, kind of like this invading group, to topple the United States, which for the most part they were successful in doing, as payback for the United States basically toppling the Soviet Union. Ultimately, she was injured by Iron Man, and then she was killed in Ultimates 2, issue number 13 by Hawkeye. And so really it was more Young Ultimates than anything else, but technically it first happened in All New Ultimates Volume 1. She donned the moniker of Black Widow and then went forward from there. It was a way for Marvel to kind of move her away from being like the clone of Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe to basically having like her own identity and her own character. It was cool for what it was. I didn't really care what moniker she had. I just loved the character in general. But all these guys, or at least the 3 of them, basically show up in this alternate universe here. And once they get in there, what they're expecting, because it seems to be the home world of the inheritors, at least from where they're coming from, what they're expecting is basically this kind of Earth where like it's fire and brimstone and they've conquered everything and all that kind of stuff. But when they get out there, what they find is that it actually looks kind of like a utopia, like a technological utopia. And it's kind of a crazy thing because of course with Kane the Scarlet Spider, he doesn't really need to hide himself per se because he's got a suit that basically makes him invisible. But for Jessica Drew and Ben Reilly, if they go swinging through what is supposed to be the home world of the inheritors, the race of beings that are trying to kill them, they'll do nothing but draw attention to themselves, right? And so right off the bat, they're like, okay, we need to basically hide. And so of course they end up donning some smocks from hospitals, right? So basically hospital garb with their back ends hanging out, which is always the most embarrassing thing ever. But as they get in there, you end up finding out that this world is basically ruled by Genix. Now, Genix is a member of the inheritor race, but he's more of like the scientific member of the inheritor race, right? Like their main science guy. The other thing that's also discovered here is that while they're making their way through this building, they end up seeing seeing all these individuals who are essentially clones, and they're really in like a very docile state, with Genix on a screen talking about how you are elegant, you're a part of a big complex system, different things along those lines. We're not really given a lot of information insofar as how this world functions, at least at the moment. Instead, they end up drawing the attention of one of the science guys who's actually this reality's version of Max Modell, the guy who leads Horizon Labs in the main Marvel universe, and is actually a kind of, well, I wouldn't say father figure, but very much a mentor for Peter Parker. They end up getting his attention, and then in turn, everything starts to pop off, right? They basically web this guy up, their cover's blown, and they take off. Now at that point, because of the fact that they're basically encountering like, you know, security and all that kind of stuff, they have to redon their suits, and the jig is up, right? Like everybody knows that like Spider-Man are here now, and that of course leads to the arrival of Iron Man, which is a crazy thing to see that in this universe, Iron Man exists. And it's one of the things that's very easy to forget when it comes to the Inheritors. They have no desire to kill like Iron Man or like Captain America or any of those guys. They track spider characters. Now, if in some alternate reality, the Avengers get in the way of the Inheritors trying to kill that version of Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, Spider-Girl, whoever, they'll kill the Avengers, right? They'll kill whoever they need to in order to get to their target. And again, that ties into the benefit of clone bodies, that if that Inheritor were killed, their clone would come back with the knowledge of how it was they died and some means to overcome those forces and try again. The response of Iron Man is basically one of immediately attacking them. Now, of course, they get the upper hand on him, they're able to subdue him, and then in turn, it becomes a big interrogation of what Iron Man knows, how this world works, but he's not really dumping a whole lot of information. All he really says is that in this reality, Genix basically runs the world, and that Genix operates out of the Baxter building, which, as most of you guys know, is traditionally the home of the Fantastic Four. The other thing about this, and what's kind of crazy, is the question is asked like, Tony Stark, how did you get like this? And while we're not really given a definitive answer, the explanation that's offered here is that most likely what happened is Tony Stark in this universe was probably killed. And this is a clone of that version of Tony Stark. That in fact, most every citizen on this planet is likely a clone designed to be docile, designed to never resist the control of Genix himself. That Genix isn't really viewed as like a god among these people, but is certainly viewed as a person whose authority is beyond contestation. And so this again basically leads to the clones heading towards the Baxter building. Now this actually leads to a pretty genius maneuver where you actually have them strip Tony Stark of his armor, and then Ben Reilly dons the armor himself and then pretends to lead them in as what are basically prisoners. It's a pretty smart maneuver, right? It's a very intelligent thing to do, because when that happens, basically Jessica Drew breaks free and it's like, oh my God, she's free, somebody stop her, right? And then like while security's dealing with her, you have Ben Reilly in the Iron Man suit basically taking Kane and then leading him to quote unquote the prison cells, which allows Jessica Drew to basically do her thing and buy them as much time as they possibly can. The problem here is that while you would expect Ben Reilly in his Iron Man suit and Kane to be able to sort of move through the building almost at their leisure, so long as it's being treated like like Iron Man escorting a prisoner, and investigate the place, learn more about the planet, where they're at, where the clone factory is that's creating these Inheritor clones so they can destroy it, all that kind of stuff, they're suddenly met by the arrival of Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, who is, quite likely in this universe, one of the most powerful beings on the planet. I would even argue Johnny Storm is probably one of the most powerful beings across the Marvel multiverse, right? That guy, he's just super powerful. Like Johnny Storm in any universe is ridiculously OP. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Amazing Spider-Man. Yes, we are. And this one's cool because we basically get to see Superior Spider-Man versus like Spider-Man. It's like Spider-Man versus Spider-Man. It's cool, man, right? So in the last video, we basically had this instance where Superior Spider-Man, Dr. Octopus, had basically stepped up and said he was the one that was gonna run the show. Because at the end of the day, when it came down to it, the Inheritors being killed was the only way to really stop them. And that he really viewed Peter Parker in a lot of ways as a half measure, that he's not really willing to go to the limit and do what it takes to stop a force that will do everything they can to kill him. And that's the real philosophical difference between the two. And it's one of the cool things, right? We've talked about that before, that when you have heroes like Spider-Man versus Superior Spider-Man, the big dichotomy between the two is that Superior Spider-Man will not kill on a whim, right? It's not as though Superior Spider-Man is going to kill a bank robber. That's not really what we're talking about. We're not going with that level of an extreme. The response of Superior Spider-Man here is that the Inheritors will do everything everything they can to kill us. That's literally what they do. They don't want to take us prisoner and use us as like a source of slave labor. No, they want to like consume our life force, which will leave us dead. The only way to stop them is to find a way to kill them. And the response of Peter Parker is, no, we have to be better than that. Now, if we were talking about Dr. Octopus saying that he wanted to kill like Electro, whose schemes and machinations to a degree may result in a loss of life, but more than anything, they're usually just a kind of general menace to Spider-Man, you can make a credible argument there that I probably wouldn't follow, but you can make a credible argument that like those guys shouldn't be killed. But against a force that will continually do everything it can to destroy you, the only way to defeat it is to kill it. And that's the big difference between those individuals that have what it takes to actually succeed and those who don't, right? Those who are half measures. And Peter Parker is a half measure here. Now, of course, this leads to a fight breaking out between the two. And it's kind of a funny thing because what happens over the course of this conflict is that Dr. Octopus keeps making references to Peter Parker as his past self. And that's when Peter comes to the realization Dr. Octopus doesn't know that Peter gets his body back. He doesn't know that Dr. Octopus loses possession of the body of Peter Parker. He doesn't know that this version of Peter Parker is actually from his future as opposed to his past. And to a degree, Peter actually starts to use that to his advantage. That if Superior Spider-Man knew that this is Peter from his future, he would probably kill him. To be honest with you guys, like he would probably have destroyed him. At this point in his story, it's kind of hard to tell because in the progression of Superior Spider-Man up to this point, he had moved away from being your stereotypical Dr. Octopus villain and basically became a hero. That happened in a lot of different ways from a lot of different things, right? Anna Maria Marconi is a really good example of that, the character that kind of provided a softer edge to Dr. Octopus, although I would argue it took away his ruthlessness, as well as basically learning that Peter Parker was pulling his punches, right? If you guys recall when Superior Spider-Man got into a fight with the Scorpion and literally punched his jaw off of his face and then realized that Peter Parker could have beat them all to death at any point in time and just simply chose not to, like that kind of a thing, right? So kind of learning really the tried and true lesson that was being taught to Peter by Uncle Ben, that with great power must come great responsibility, and basically becoming a good guy. But in this instance, Peter Parker represents an existential threat to the continued existence of Superior Spider-Man. And even if for no other reason than like self-preservation, I could see him killing Peter, or at least interrogating him and trying to find out how it is that Peter got his body back, and then trying to prevent that from happening, and then probably killing Peter at the same time. So regardless, it's a pretty interesting circumstance, pretty cool thing. Now, ultimately, of course, as you would expect, because, you know, Peter Parker is the star of the show, Peter Parker overcomes Dr. Octopus. He's able to overpower him. Now, Dan Slott doesn't make this some kind of throwaway thing where he's like, you know, I'm Peter Parker and I'm powered by hope and goodness, and so I win. The way Peter Parker overcomes Superior Spider-Man is he actually just stops and gives up. And the reason why is because if Dr. Octopus genuinely believes that Peter is his past self, and if Peter Parker were to die, then how would Dr. Octopus come into existence? He would literally destroy himself, right? He would end his reign as Superior Spider-Man by basically killing his younger self. Now, Dan Slott's being a little fast and loose with this because one of the things that Marvel has routinely established over the years is that if you make a change to the timeline, all it's really gonna do is just create a branch timeline. And so all that would really happen here, at least if we go with our general knowledge of Marvel Comics, if Superior Spider-Man killed Peter Parker, then it would just lead to an alternate reality where he never became Superior Spider-Man and Peter Parker had died in an earlier date. Most likely they would just never manifest. They would just never be there, right? You would never see them because both of them would cease to exist by nature of the circumstance. And so literally you would just have Superior Spider-Man standing over the body of Peter Parker, and that would basically be it. But for the sake of the story, it's basically crafted in such a way where Dan Slott's like, okay, yeah, Superior Spider-Man's not gonna kill his younger self because he believes in paradoxes. And so because of that, it gives Peter the upper hand where he basically takes out Dr. Octopus. Now, following that, we switch over to Earth 13989. This reality is not overly significant, but it does deal with Karn. Now remember, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with our discussion about Morlun, about the Inheritors, different things like that, the nature of Karn and the reason why he wears this helmet is that prior to the Master Weaver that currently exists to basically allow the Inheritors to travel throughout the multiverse, there was a previous version of this guy. And that Karn and the Inheritors had basically tracked this guy down and intended to kill him and then basically replace him with an inheritor of their own that would essentially give them free reign across the multiverse to track down Spider-Man wherever they could find them. And so during that initial skirmish with the original Master Weaver, it was revealed that unlike the other inheritors that enjoy the idea of like killing spider totems and virtually any animal totem, but spider totems in particular, Karn didn't. That he was actually a breakaway from his family. He didn't like what it was that they did, and he actually condemned it. But he kept that to himself because he knew if he came out publicly, his family would probably kill him or they would shun him or something along those lines. And so once this became general knowledge, once the original Master Weaver revealed this to the rest of the inheritors, basically a helmet was thrown on the head of Karn, and he's almost playing the role of Sisyphus, right? Like constantly pushing the boulder up, and then once it gets near the top, it comes back down again. That his job is to literally travel the multiverse and just attack as many Spider-Man as he possibly can and kill as many spider totems as he possibly can. But the reality here is that because he's considered such a shameful being among the inheritors, that his father will probably never bring him back. That this will be a fate that he will just be left to endure forever to try to gain his father's respect and just constantly keep along that path. Of course, that will change, but the result of this is that with everything happening, of course, Morlun coming back and so on, that the father of the inheritors, who we haven't really seen much of before, actually addresses the idea of Morlun refusing to go to Earth 616 because he's been killed there twice by Peter Parker. And that's where the father of the inheritors is like, okay, like, you know, it's time to stop being nice, right? It's time to stop like playing with these guys and kind of doing this cat and mouse game and all that kind of stuff. We know where they are. We know they're in their safe universe. Let's just go and get them, right? Let's just go and attack them, which really kind of begs the question, what circumstance would it be that it would just, that he would literally break into a universe or show up in a universe where one of those Spider-Men has the power of like the Enigma Force, right? Where he's basically a cosmic god. How powerful could this guy really be? Or how foolish could they really be, right? It's only ever one or the other. But the result of this is that Peter actually extends an olive branch to Superior Spider-Man, kind of jumping back to those two again. And the result is just seemingly out of respect or what have you, Superior Spider-Man and Peter actually start working together. And despite the fact that they recognize that they're in a universe where this version of Spider-Man never lost the Enigma Force and is absurdly powerful, the most powerful of them all, at the end of the day, it's still a foolish idea to keep them all confined to a singular location. Because if something were to happen and this guy were to be destroyed by just some crazy circumstance, who really knows, then suddenly they would basically be left defenseless. More so than that, if the inheritors decided to just launch an attack, which they would most likely do, and we know they are doing, especially because of the fact that they have clones, meaning they can always find a way to come back, it's only a matter of time before they whittle their forces down. Because where the inheritors can come back by way of clones, once any one of these Spider-Men are dead, they're dead. There's no coming back, and there's no way to replenish your number. So the smart move here by Peter Parker is to say, we need to basically go to different locations. We need to ensure we can maintain communication across the multiverse, but we need to be in different places. We can't all operate out of one singular safe house and basically cross our fingers, hoping it works for the best. The other thing about this is that where he had basically used the cloaking technology of Superior Spider-Man, the question he has for Doc Ock is there a way to reverse engineer this so it can actually detect inheritors? So we can basically see them coming before they get here, right? So if a universe is a house, they don't have to wait for the inheritors to like smash down the door before they know they're there. They can actually see the inheritors coming as they get onto the street, right? Like once they turn onto the block, then it's like, oh my God, the inheritors are coming. And so again, it's one of those things where Doc Ock's like, I'm way ahead of you. Like I already did that. And in fact, I know where their home world is. The problem is we can't go there because if we did, they would probably eradicate us. They would destroy us. And so the result of this is Peter actually concocts a plan. He's like, okay, so one, we don't have every single Spider-Man from across the multiverse. And two, the inheritors, because they're still tracking them, they know where these guys are. So we basically have to race them there, right? We have to grab more Spider-Man. So what he actually does here is he tasks Miles Morales and Spider-Man from the Ultimate Spider-Man cartoon show. Yes, the Ultimate Spider-Man cartoon show, like he's in this comic, which is amazing. He actually tasked them with going out into the multiverse and finding as many Spider-Man as they possibly can. Now that story continues on in Spider-Verse Team Up, and it's an amazing story. Technically it kind of begins here, and we can kind of go into this a little bit. Basically they end up on Earth 67, which is cool. You guys will recognize this one here in a second, but they basically show up on Earth 67. They're kind of making their way around. They realize they're in the 60s. There's like one building that says Daily Bugle, and there's like only one building with a sign on it. And so they're like, okay, okay, well, I mean, I wonder where Peter Parker's gonna be, you know? And we basically find out they're in like the 1960s Spider-Man cartoon universe, which is awesome because that version of Spider-Man is amazing. I loved him in Spider-Verse. He was so awesome. But then you kind of switch back to Earth 13, right? Now, showing up here, this is basically the Inheritors making their move. Now, the ones who show up are basically Solace, Morlun, and Genix. Of course, Morlun, we've talked about extensively. Genix, we've covered already, is basically like the scientific guy of the Inheritors. Solace, we have not covered. He's simply just the father of the Inheritors. Now, this is one of the more disappointing things, and I'm gonna nip this in the bud right off the bat. We never get a true definitive origin of the Inheritors in this story. And that's what was kind of disappointing about it, is like, they're just there. And I remember reading through the entirety of like Spider-Verse, and I was like as it was coming out, and I was like, when do we get like a one-shot origin of the Inheritors, right? Like Dan Slott writing, once upon a time on Earth 1, there was a guy who was a dick, and he was really hungry, and he ate Spider-Man, and then he realized he tasted good, and then started doing it across the multiverse. You know, something along those lines. You know, just some kind of like one-shot origin for his character. But we never really get a one-shot origin for the Inheritors themselves. The closest we get is when they killed the original Master Weaver. But Solace showing up here is one of those things where seemingly, if it was like Genix who just stumbled into this universe, not realizing that it was guarded by like Cosmic Spider-Man, or if it was like Morlun who had done it or something like that, they probably would have retreated. There is a chance they would have attacked this Cosmic Spider-Man and their body probably would have been destroyed. But in the end, like, Solace is fearless. He basically sends in Morlun and Genix and is like, kill as many as you possibly can. If you die, it's fine, we'll resurrect you. Not a great big huge deal, right? We'll literally bring you back with a clone. As far as like Cosmic Spider-Man goes, he basically ends up like showing up. Like, he literally just like establishes this power, right? Just kind of like goes against Solace, tries to attack him, and Solace withstands the full brunt of his attack. Like, literally withstands the power of the Enigma Force. Now, this was Dan Slott, again, kind of playing it fast and loose. If we're being honest with ourselves, the purpose of the Enigma Force, while its power has waxed and waned over the years, it allows an individual to wield enough power to where they can affect the fundamental probabilities and forces of the universe itself. It makes a person absurdly powerful. If you were to use the peak capabilities of the Enigma Force, you'd be one of the most powerful beings in the universe. We're not told if that's really what this version of Spider-Man is capable of. Again, this version of Spider-Man is based off of the Acts of Vengeance storyline where Peter Parker gained the Enigma Force, and this is basically a continuation of that story in an alternate reality where Peter never lost the Enigma Force. The only thing we saw Peter do with that level of power, he punched the Incredible Hulk out of the Earth, and that's it. We didn't see him fight Galactus or anything along those lines. Different people have wielded the Enigma Force in different ways, but this version of Peter seems to be a continuation of the one from Acts of Vengeance. And so while he does have the Enigma Force, and while he is very powerful, it's not really scale here, right? I mean, it's literally like taking a fish and just dropping it in the ocean and then taking a picture. I mean, how big is that fish if there's nothing there for scale? That fish could be 50 feet long. That fish could be 5 inches long. There's no way to know because the ocean has no scale. And so because of that, it's kind of difficult to basically, ask this question, how powerful is Solace really when it comes to what it is that he's capable of doing? Because we don't really have a way to kind of compare these guys. The important thing though is that whatever power Cosmic Spider-Man has is irrelevant. Solace overpowers this guy almost in an instant. Like, literally, he goes to attack him, and the response of Solace is, sure, man, you have the Enigma Force. It's the primal force of creation. That's cool and everything, man, but like, we literally feast on life force. So you are just like a giant buffet. And so he just absorbs the entirety of the Enigma Force into himself, basically absorbs the life essence of this version of Spider-Man, and any hope these guys had for safety is basically gone. Like, at that point, it's panic mode. Like, people are just like, what do we do, man? It's just like, I don't know, man, just run, flee for your lives. It's crazy, right? Now, at that point, you end up, of course, picking up with Mayday Parker, who, of course, had her younger brother, essentially. Morlun finally gets his hands on it, and again, we find out that Benji is the scion that they've been looking for. Now, again, we'll cover that later, as we get further into this. What I actually want to do here is switch over to Spider-Woman. Now, before you guys are kind of like, no, Spider-Woman sucks. No. Here's the thing. Jessica Drew has had some pretty bad stories over the years, right? She's had some garbage stories over the years. This story in Spider-Verse is really cool. Not only that, if you ever doubt how interesting Jessica Drew was, go read Brian Michael Bendis' New Avengers. She was amazing in that story. I loved her in New Avengers, especially everything with like the hand and like Hydra and all that kind of stuff. That was cool. But the important thing here is that, again, in the aftermath of everything that had popped off in in the Earth 2099 universe, if you guys recall, when Deimos had shown up and attacked everybody, and basically people started splitting off, that Silk and Jessica Drew and Spider-Man Noir were one of the three that had taken off. Now, at that point in time, Spider-Man Noir seemed to basically be knocked out. He wasn't really like dead per se, but he's since recovered, and they're essentially on a mission to basically try to stave off as best they can to keep away from the Inheritors and then eventually regroup at a future point in time. What ends up happening here along the way is Jessica Drew gets exceedingly fed up with Silk. Now, the reason behind this is because Cindy Moon is very reckless. It's one of the things to know about her character. She's interesting, but she's reckless. Jessica Drew, on the other hand, has a lot of experience with like stealth, espionage. She was very Black Widow-esque in terms of how what her form and function was in Marvel Comics, especially during the days of Brian Michael Bendis' New Avengers. So she's highly capable. The problem is that basically looking after Cindy Moon is like trying to look after drunk college girls. It's babysitting and incredibly annoying. And so because of that, she's like, okay, this girl is wildly irresponsible. She's literally doing everything she can to keep their profile low. They end up breaking out into a fight, right? Like Cindy Moon basically attacks these guys who were like trying to shake down some old woman trying to rob them. So like now you got Jessica Drew who's got to go in there and try to stave that off. But their continued action, the fact that they've been making moves, making waves, the fact that Cindy Moon is just an easily trackable person leads to the Inheritors tracking them down. Now, of course, this is the brother and sister. They literally show up here like Team Rocket, right? Like blast off at the speed of light because we're Team Rocket and we're kind of dicks. So like it's a little funny to see them appear like that. Now, of course, this leads to Spider-Man Noir trying to intervene. And that's one of the funny things is because in the last, I guess the first half of this video, there was a point where Peter Parker had hit up like Jessica Drew and Cindy Moon to see how things were going. And they were like, Spider-Man Noir's down, right? This is that moment. And this is one of the things that I do want to explain about the nature of Spider-Verse is that because they did have like a bunch of tie-in comics, that like this comic is technically after, at least in terms of reading orders, after the one that we just covered, but it actually takes place at the same time. With Cindy Moon, again, that's why her and Jessica Drew and Spider-Man Noir are basically constantly moving, because as one of the more significant members of the Spider Totem, she's easily trackable, right? It's basically her just kind of leaving a scent behind. It's like you walking around with a bottle of cologne or perfume and just kind of spraying it as you walk and leaving a trail for someone to follow. That's essentially what's happening here. Like Cindy Moon's got body odor, but the important thing here is they basically end up teleporting away and they actually jump back to the universe of Earth 90214. That's the home universe of Spider-Man Noir, which is a huge gamble to take. And the reason why is because while the Inheritors have already been to this universe, and of course Spider-Man Noir's not there anymore, the risk comes in the form of the fact that because the Inheritors have been there, they probably wouldn't come back. But because they have been here, they understand and they know about this universe. So it may be one of those things where they're like, I mean, they took off. What if they went back to their own universes? Let's just double check, right? And then they end up arriving in this universe only to turn around and find, Spider-Man Noir. Now, of course, again, because of the nature of Cindy Moon, their location is pretty much tracked. It's almost guaranteed. But in the middle of that, there's a great big, huge kind of explosion that takes place, which leads them to take off and find out what's going on, only for them to realize that it's Spider-Man, it's Anya, and it's Spider-Gwen. Now, the reason why they're here, and this was part of the secondary plan that Peter Parker had when he was talking to Superior Spider-Man about reverse engineering the cloaking devices to find the locations of the Inheritors, is that yes, they were not in a position to travel to the Inheritor homeworld, but they could possibly get someone in there who could basically operate behind enemy lines, that could essentially sneak around. And in Peter Parker's mindset, the best person for that is Jessica Drew, because of her history as a spy. And so due to that, he basically teleports here with Spider-Gwen and Anya, essentially pulling out Jessica Drew and then replacing her with Anya and Spider-Gwen, who are basically going to keep an eye on Cindy Moon. The problem with this is that if one of the world's best spies and a new Avenger had a hard time keeping Cindy Moon in check, what chance do like Anya and Spider-Gwen have? I mean, they're cool and everything, but they're nowhere near on the same level as Jessica Drew. But at the end of the day, literally Peter Parker's just doing the best he can with what he has. Hence the reason why they want to grab more Spider-Man from across the multiverse, because there are other more capable Spider-Man out there. And so during this whole thing, you basically have this instance where Jessica Drew actually pulls Spider-Gwen and Anya aside and says, look, Cindy Moon's cool. Her heart's in the right place. She's a really, really nice girl. And if we weren't being chased around the multiverse by some guys that wanted to kill us and siphon off our life energies, I would say we could all go get our nails done and talk about our feelings. But the thing here is that she'll get you killed if you let her, because she's reckless. She doesn't really understand the gravity of of what's going on here, and even if she did, she doesn't seem to care. She's too headstrong. And so Cindy Moon actually overhears all of this. And so quite literally, where Anya and Spider-Gwen are supposed to be keeping an eye on Cindy Moon, as Spider-Man and Jessica Drew leave, Cindy Moon's vanished. She literally took off, right? It's like a toddler, right? You know, once you get into like the walking phase, you got to keep your eye on them all the time. Either that or like baby-proof your house, so you just kind of block off a section of your house as you move around, so they just can't leave that general area. You know, it's one of those things where it's like, that's just the nature of Cindy Moon. Now, of course, we end up finding out Cindy Moon has teleported or moved to Earth 981. Now, any of you guys who are familiar with Earth 981, I know you're probably been just looking forward to this because of like the Spider-Verse event. You're like, when are we gonna get to Earth 981? Like, when are we gonna get to that whole story? We're getting there. Please, for the love of God, do not spoil anything. It's an amazing segment, but you essentially have like this giant monster that appears out of nowhere and attacks Cindy Moon, or at least goes after Cindy Moon. Following that, you actually have the brother and sister inheritors who show up here with the intention of tracking Cindy Moon down. But what comes after this is one of the greatest moments in the entirety of Spider-Verse. It's awesome, but we will cover that in the next video. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are here with what's probably the most entertaining story from Spider-Verse, which is Miles Morales and Spider-Man from the Ultimate Spider-Man cartoon show meets Spider-Man from the 1960s cartoon show. And it's amazing. I love this story. It's just so much fun, right? It's just a fun story to read. So as we kind of mentioned in the last video, right, the Miles and we're just gonna call him Ultimate Spider-Man, it's just easier that way. But Miles and Ultimate Spider-Man basically ended up in this universe because they're basically trying to find more Spider-Man. And this, you know, I mean, it's basically what it was, you know, what you saw in the cartoon show, right? Where it's pretty straightforward. There's like only one building with a sign on it, and that sign is Daily Bugle, so they know like exactly where to go to find Spider-Man. But like J. Jonah Jameson, he's hilarious in this, right? So he's like, pay attention, Parker. He's like, we've had reports of 2 Spider-Men swinging around, making spectacles of themselves. And Peter's like, 2 Spider-Men? He's like, do you know what that means, Parker? And he's like, well, I don't know. I mean, criminals have impersonated Spider-Man before. He's like, Balderdash, the web-headed menace finally showed his true colors. He's put together a gang of crooks to terrorize the city. Get me proof. J. Jonah Jameson became Americans in the 21st century. I have a conclusion. Now I need evidence to support it. And it's just like, okay, all right, J. Jonah Jameson. So anyway, you end up picking up with Ultimate Spider-Man and Miles, of course, as they're on the hunt for 60s Spider-Man, and ultimately they find him. But as you guys, if any of you guys ever saw the 1960s Spider-Man cartoon, and if you didn't, it was amazing. Dude, old school Spider-Man was hilarious. But this episode was actually based off a story called To Catch a Spider, right? Which was basically Dr. Noah Body, who essentially unleashes like Electro and like Green Goblin and these guys to take out Spider-Man. But unlike the original show, the original cartoon, this basically takes place in its stead, or at least partly takes place in its stead. So what goes on here, and it's kind of a funny thing, is Miles and Ultimate Spider-Man are talking to like 60 Spider-Man, right? And 60 Spider-Man's like, okay, you imposters can unmask and surrender right now, or I can web you up and we'll do it at the police station. Your choice, chums. Now, Ultimate Spider-Man is hilarious here, right? Because he's like, okay, stay back, Miles, I got this, man. Like, I'm well versed in this kind of talk. So he's like, get hip to this, daddy-o. There's a heavy scene going down, and we ain't got time for a lot of ramalama ding dog, you dig? And 60 Spider-Man's like, the hard way it is, and like, he webs him up. Now at that point, Miles comes in, and Miles is like, no, you got the wrong idea, man. He's like, we're Spider-Man from a different dimension. And then like literally that's what he says, right? He's like, we're Spider-Man from like other dimensions. There's like a giant menace that we have to deal with, and we need help. And like 60 Spider-Man's like, oh, well, why didn't you just say so? That explains everything. It was hilarious because at that point in time, like the way Spider-Man was depicted is he was just so, I don't know, maybe naive or something like that. But it was almost kind of adorable, right? And it was kind of funny. Plus, he would complain a lot. In the 1960s show, he would complain all the time. I mean, I guess technically it was a 1967 show, but like he would complain a lot. He'd be like, I'm hot in my Spider-Man suit, and swinging around is making me even hotter, and these stupid villains are escaping, and now I'm gonna have to beat them to death. Like he would complain all the time. But again, the whole thing ends up kind of playing out where he's like, okay, cool, like I'll go with you guys to go on this great big huge adventure, but I need to take up this thing first, right? This guy, Dr. Noah Body, has basically released the Vulture and Electro and Green Goblin and Scorpion, and I gotta deal with them first. Right now, here's the funny thing. As soon as these guys show up, I mean, it's designed to look like the 60s show, so like they look goofy and they look kind of silly, and whenever Green Goblin was riding around on his goblin glider in like the 60s cartoon, it looked like he was powering it by farts, not even gonna lie. But the whole thing about that is, of course, they're able to overpower them momentarily, but Mr. Noah Body, who's basically invisible, has like this ray gun that basically incapacitates them, and then the villains do what they always did in the show, which was bicker amongst themselves and then ultimately get themselves caught. Now, in that whole thing where this whole kind of situation's going on, like 60 Spider-Man's like, well, the last time I beat him, I used ventriloquism, but I don't know if that'll work this time. And of course, it ends up coming by way of Ultimate Spider-Man, who basically webs up their legs and then essentially takes out Mr. Noah Body, which, you know, allows Miles Morales to, you know, kind of step up and then, you know, use his Venom Blast to electrocute Mr. Noah Body and take him out, and all those guys are defeated and basically the day's saved. And then you get to what's quite possibly one of the more questionable moments of the comic. Which I guess it kind of depends on which direction you're coming from. But basically, once they're all together, it's almost like the old throwback to like the old Justice League, right? Like when they all masked and they all learned their identities. But basically, like Ultimate Spider-Man reveals his identity as Peter Parker, and then Miles Morales reveals his identity, and then like 1960 Spider-Man's like walloping web snappers. I mean, he doesn't say like he's not. It's not like he's like, you're black. Like, it's not anything like that. He's just like surprised he's a high school kid. But like Christos Gage was kind of going with that, right? Kind of like, you know, building up to that little bit of comedy. And Ultimate Spider-Man's like, oh snap, man, tell me that like the 1960s Spider-Man isn't old fashioned in all the bad ways too, you know? But Ultimate, and it's one of those things where Miles was kind of expecting it, right? Miles is kind of like, all right, I'm gonna take off this mask in front of this 1960s white dude. We're gonna see what happens, right? And then, you know, he's like, walloping web snappers. And Miles like, man, don't you say it. And he's like, you're a high school kid. Miles like, awesome, dude. I'm not gonna have to beat the hell out of you. Because I'll be honest, man, I feel like Miles would have, dude. Miles would have beat the tar out of this guy. Like, say what? You know, and would have just lost it on him. It would have been hilarious. Well, he would have totally lost it on him. But nonetheless, the two of them basically end up going forward and bringing in like 1960s Spider-Man as a way to basically combat the Inheritors. But yeah, okay, now this is something else that I also want to point out here. So the way these Spider-Verse team-up stories were done is they were basically A-side stories and B-side stories. You essentially get part one, then you get part two. So if you guys want in the future stories that we do, or the future videos that we do, we can cover both parts. Let me know if you guys want to see both parts in a single video, or if you want to focus on like just each individual part as its own video. Let me know what you guys are interested in seeing. But what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if any of you guys are part of the Discord server, you guys know that actually, as of about 10 minutes ago, I finished interviewing Tom Holland, Zendaya, and Jacob Batalon for Spider-Man No Way Home, and I asked them 2 of the questions that you all had in the Discord server. So the video will hopefully go up tomorrow, and yeah, then hopefully you guys will be able to find out which one of you got your question answered. Having said that, we are picking back up again with Spider-Verse. Now, one of the things we're doing here, this actually kind of opens up initially with Spider-Man 2099. And again, one of the things to remember is the 2099 universe is where that great big huge battle between Deimos and the various Spider-Men unfolded. And so while you did have like Peter Parker and a lot of those guys who all just kind of took off to different realities and so on, Miguel O'Hara from Spider-Man 2099, he never left, right? He's basically been here the whole time, along with Lady Spider and with Six-Armed Spider-Man, who's actually from a universe, which we'll talk about here in a second, which is a really, really cool story because it ties into a video that we've already done. And it actually kind of ties into a character that's going to be in the MCU. So the idea behind this is that we initially pick up with Tyler Stone. Now, Tyler Stone is basically one of the high-ranking members of Alchemax. As those of you guys may have recalled, if you've read Spider-Man 2099, if you didn't, the nature of Alchemax is they're basically like a mega corporation. So think of them as like Amazon in the future is basically what they are, right? They're just a really crony company that's just done some really shady stuff. But Tyler Stone, his relationship with Miguel O'Hara is a little bit complicated. And the reason why is because really in the early days of Spider-Man 2099 back in the mid-1990s, it was really more that Tyler Stone was kind of a dick and that Miguel O'Hara wasn't really a big fan of Alchemax engaging in like human testing with experiments and things like that initially kind of led him to becoming Spider-Man in the first place, or at least having a vendetta vendetta against it. The other part of that, and really the more personal motivation here, is that Tyler Stone seemed to basically be responsible for getting Miguel O'Hara addicted to a drug called Rapture, and then use the ability of Alchemax to supply that drug as a means to basically keep Miguel on a short leash. Now, in Spider-Man 2099, issue number 25, you actually learn a few things. The first is that Tyler Stone is the biological father of Miguel O'Hara, and two, Miguel was never actually addicted to Rapture. So basically, he was manipulated by Tyler Stone. And that's why, over the course of Marvel's publication history, in addition to just the nefarious things that Alchemax does, while Miguel O'Hara has always had a vendetta against Alchemax, he's always had more of a personal vendetta against Tyler Stone. And in fact, there's actually been instances specifically with what was going on right up until this story was being written, where Miguel O'Hara had to actually go back in time, or at least was trapped in the past, but had to essentially ensure that Tyler Stone lived because he was his biological father. If Tyler Stone died before he could father Miguel O'Hara would cease to exist. So literally, he had to save the life of the man he hated in order to preserve his own existence. And so one of the things that goes on here is that with Tyler Stone being head of what is in effect the secret police of Alchemax, that they're basically told like, hey, like Miguel O'Hara just came back from the past and he's here with a few other guys. Now, the funny thing about this is that despite his business savvy, Tyler Stone doesn't seem to be too intelligent when it comes to like technology and things like that. The reason why is because when he asked the question, like he was barely gone for an hour, how did he get back so fast? The question that's given to him is time doesn't work that way. For us, he's been gone for an hour, but it could very well be that he's been stranded wherever he was at for like months or years, right? Where it just took him that long to find a way to get back here. And one of the things that's pointed out here, which is kind of interesting, is they're like, I'm kind of surprised that we didn't end up with a paradox where like he came back before we sent him into the past and then warned himself to basically ensure that we can't trick him into going into the past. And so we basically have this kind of wonky, wild situation, probably like this total breakdown of reality and things along those lines. But, you know, leaving out all the crazy zaniness of it, you basically end up just kind of picking up with the situation where finally Miguel O'Hara makes his presence known to his brother Gabe, as well as introducing Six-Armed Spider-Man and Lady Spider. Now, something that I do want to point out here is that at first glance, you may think this is Doppelganger. For those of you guys who don't know who Doppelganger is, and if you recall our coverage on Infinity War, one of the things that Magus, the future evil version of Adam Warlock, did is he basically created doppelgangers of various characters out there. A doppelganger of Thanos, doppelganger of the Avengers, and a doppelganger of Spider-Man. Due to his popularity, he basically lingered on following the events of Infinity War, but it was basically like this kind of twisted, evil, six-armed version of Peter Parker. The idea here with this version of Peter Parker is that if you guys recall our discussion on really the character explanation of Michael Morbius, is we actually solidified this idea that with his initial introduction, or at least kind of going into his introduction, his first encounter with Spider-Man came by way of Peter's attempt to cure himself of basically being Spider-Man. The result is that it actually led to him developing 6 arms. This is an alternate reality where that was never solved, right? He basically kept 6 arms. So again, kind of an interesting little thing there. But the whole idea behind this is that you end up having, of course, Miguel basically warning Gabe and saying things are kind of popping off and that we've got inheritors chasing after us and all that kind of crazy stuff. And where they're trying to buy their time as best they can and basically stay hidden, that again, because they're spiders and because the inheritors track spiders, Deimos is able to track them down incredibly fast. Now remember, the motivation of Deimos here is twofold. The first is that, of course, they're spiders. So Deimos wants to basically kill them, consume their life energy, and leave them. The second thing is he's trying to recover his body. Remember, the inheritors have cloning technology. They have the ability to basically take their consciousness and download it into a new clone body every single time they're basically killed, no matter what the circumstance is. And so the various spiders being in possession of a body of the inheritors means they can reverse engineer it, and they can find a way to destroy the inheritors and actually keep them from being able to download their consciousness inside of a body. Deimos basically goes after all of them. Now, the funny thing here is that Lady Spider is not an actual spider character, meaning she didn't really get her powers from like a radioactive spider bite, so she's not really tied directly into the spider totems per se. She doesn't have that mystical connection. And so where Deimos can't really siphon her life energy, I mean, I guess he could, right? But it would be like eating a carrot when what he wants is a steak. You know what I mean? Like it just wouldn't really quite satiate him in the way that he needs, that he actually kind of entertains this idea of quote unquote using her for his own ends. Now, we'll actually find out what that means when we pick up with Spider-Woman and the story of Jessica Drew, because not everything is what it seems when it comes to the inheritors, that they have as much contradiction and hypocrisy going on as they do their belief in their righteous cause. But regardless, Gabe buys him a little bit of time when he basically blasts Deimos through like like a wall, you know, using like this just massive gun. And then the fight basically takes out into the city. Now, while all that's going on, Tyler wants to grab Miguel, right? I mean, he basically wants to like incapacitate Spider-Man, remove him from the landscape so we don't have to worry about Spider-Man like stopping Alchemax, like your standard traditional like villains fighting heroes kind of arc, right? And so that's why you see like the secret police who are out here, like these, you know, soldier guys. And of course, Deimos rolls right through these. I mean, at this point, the existence of these guys being here is really more of a nuisance than anything else, but it does provide a helpful scenario for Miguel O'Hara. And the reason why is because for each one of these guys, right, like the public eye, as they're referred to, for each one of these guys, they've got an uplink directly to Tyler Stone, who runs them all. And so whatever they see and hear, Tyler Stone sees and hears as well. And so that's why, where I wouldn't say Tyler Stone adopts the philosophy that like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, it is one of these things where he's like, okay, so this guy Deimos, or whoever this guy is a far more credible threat in the moment here and now. And that Miguel O'Hara and I, at the very least, have some kind of like loose goal, which is to see this guy destroyed. Now, Tyler Stone doesn't really know enough to know about anything that's going on here. And in fact, his desire to appease Miguel O'Hara is really rooted more in the fact that Miguel's pissed, right? He's like, you tricked me, or you sent me back to 2014. Like ordinarily, I would beat the absolute crap out of you. And you know just as well as I do, I could, right? Like this little cat and mouse game we have, like it really is just a game we play. But at the end of the day, like I could kill you where you are. So if you don't want me to do that out of just sheer anger and irritation, understand that you are correct when you surmise the situation and say, I'm not worried about you right now because I've got more important things to worry about. But what I do need from you is to literally activate something for me, right? Like he basically tells him, Alchemax, floor 82, lab C. You know exactly what I mean, have it ready for me. And so where Miguel O'Hara basically leads, you know, Deimos to this particular location, once everything pops off, and in fact, you know, Lady Spider kind of does what she can in the fight between the two, that is really more of Miguel playing possum to a degree, right? I mean, not insofar that like he fakes his own injury or death, but basically luring Deimos to this spot in Alchemax, and then as soon as Deimos gets there, he immediately goes to attack Miguel O'Hara and then just gets electrocuted. And the reason why is because Miguel has him trapped in what's basically a stasis cell. Now, here's an important thing to grasp here, and this is one of the reasons why I always kind of felt like Miguel O'Hara in a lot of ways was a more capable version of Spider-Man, of Peter Parker. It's not necessarily that he's better, but the technology of the time, of course, is more advanced than it is in the main Marvel universe, but Peter Parker was always more of like a comedic character. And so it would usually break down to him just kind of pissing off the villain and then letting the villain basically like defeat themselves by way of their carelessness because they let their anger get the better of them. Miguel was a lot more methodical, and I would say even to a degree, he was a lot darker than Peter Parker was. But I think there was more methodology that went into Miguel O'Hara being Spider-Man than it did with Peter Parker being Spider-Man. And that's one of the reasons why Miguel O'Hara, when he first popped up, really did develop his own fan base. Like people loved Miguel O'Hara back in the day because he was just so starkly different from what you normally saw. But regardless, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Spider-Verse. Now, we basically pick up here with Kane, of course, really you could call him like the evil or darker clone of Peter Parker, as well as Ben Reilly, who's dressed up as Iron Man after Tony Stark was defeated, and then Johnny Storm of the Fantastic Four, who basically serves as the head of security for Genix, right? Of course, Genix basically being the inheritor that occupies this world where all the various clones are created. And so what you get here is this initial realization by Johnny Storm where initially it seemed as though like he realized they were intruders, and instead he doesn't know Iron Man's not Iron Man. Now, a lot of this seems to kind of go directly into the nature of Iron Man himself in terms of how he speaks, and it's one of those things that's been interpreted differently over the years by Marvel Comics, right? Like you go and you read the old Roy Thomas stuff, and the way that Iron Man spoke was very robotic, where you couldn't really differentiate between anybody's voice, whether it was Tony Stark or James Rhodes or anyone, because it was almost a kind of distortion in terms of how the suit communicated or how the voice communicated through the suit. You go into more recent years and it's a pretty purified version of Tony Stark's voice, so you could obviously tell if it was somebody else and not him. And this one kind of seems to indicate that this suit, as it communicates, is very much similar to the old school, you know, Iron Man suits, where basically it was kind of like a distorted robotic voice. But regardless, Johnny Storm does not pick up on the fact that this is not Tony Stark. Instead, it's kind of like, okay, like I don't understand, like why would Genix have somebody brought here when he wasn't supposed to be here? And so over time, the response of Ben Reilly is, if Jennings wanted you out of the loop, you'll have to take it up with him, right? I don't know what his decisions are. I don't know why he does the kind of things he does, but at the end of the day, like, my job is to bring this Spider-Man, to the cells, to take him in, and that's basically it. But one of the things that seems to happen here is there's very close communication between the various members of the security team, if we can call it that. And so Johnny Storm picks up right off the bat, okay, something like this never would have happened under any normal circumstance. This doesn't add up. Something's going on here. And so ultimately, Kane, a little hot-headed as he is, Ben Reilly not really able to talk them out of it, just immediately attacks Johnny Storm. And of course, this also leads to Iron Man or Ben Reilly punching Johnny Storm as hard as he possibly can, which temporarily knocks him out, right? It kind of allows them to go forward and do their thing. But the problem is their cover's blown, right? The jig is up. Guards are coming in from every direction, and it's like, okay, like, this is it, right? There's no way for us to do this. We just got to go do our own thing. So the plan's basically shot, which is kind of what you would expect from the clones, to be honest with you guys. There's never really been an instance when like Ben Reilly or Kane have like engaged in a plan and it's gone the way that it's supposed to. Things usually always end up going sideways with the various schemes they have. And so all, the only real assistance, the only real aid they have comes from Jessica Drew, who's basically using one of the security monitors of the various guards, right? So she's like, I don't know where you guys are, because they don't know where they are. She's like, I don't know where you are. Like, if they don't know where you are, I don't know, because I'm basically listening in on their various broadcasts and so on. She's like, but what you're looking for is basically the cloning facility, right? The main lab facility. And she says the central shaft of the building is tiered lab space and draws the majority of the power. That'd be my first guess. That's where you should start. Now, of course, tiered lab space basically means that like there's level 1, level 2, level 3, and it seems as though the security clearance to get from one level to the next just kind of increases depending on, what all is going on in these various things. And so, of course, they end up basically coming across Max Modell. Now, again, one of the things that we talked about in the previous videos is that Max Modell in the main Marvel universe was very much a mentor for Peter Parker and was the head of Horizon Labs. In this universe, where basically Jennings seems to have conquered everything, he's really nothing more than just kind of a science guy, right? That Jennings' intelligence when it comes to science and technology and so on seems so far beyond everybody here that they could only ever really hope to keep up. Now, a lot of this also seems to be subjugation, that they're just not as capable as Jennings is, and that the fact that Jennings was able to basically conquer this whole world and maintain control over this world, even if him conquering it came by way of help from the other inheritors, seems to indicate he's far and away beyond virtually anybody who could actually stop him. And it makes sense, right? In the various times where we've seen the inheritors face off against like the Avengers or something like that, they crushed those guys pretty well, which was cool, but also kind of disappointing at the same time, because Marvel never really bothered to explain these guys in relation to anybody else, right? So like, how strong is an inheritor in relation to like the Incredible Hulk or something like that? The only thing you really get is like when Peter Parker's punched by Morlun for the first time and he's like, it's like getting hit harder by the Hulk. But like, I would love to have seen Marvel do more with the inheritors by having them face off against more individuals in the Marvel Comics community, because they seemed incredibly powerful. But wishing and wants aside, with everything popping off here, you end up having Miles Warren, who basically approaches Jennings to kind of give him the news of what's happening. Now, this is a very, very telling exchange between the two. And while it's not really something that we get like directly on the nose, like we're not really walked through it, like here's everything that happened, we can largely infer what took place on this world. So Miles Warren, as most of you guys know, or at least some of you guys may know from the main Marvel universe, is the one responsible for basically creating Spider-Man clones, right? So he's the one that created Ben Reilly. He's the one that created Kane. He's the one that really kind of jump-started that initial Clone Saga event back in the 1990s. I mean, technically there was a Clone Saga before that, but the one in the 90s is the one that everybody thinks of when they think of that storyline. But in effect, in Marvel Comics, when it comes to the expertise of cloning, that's the Jackal, right? That's usually Miles Warren who you think of there. And so it would stand to reason in this universe, he played very much the same role. And in fact, Jennings really seems to hit at that he kind of asks him, do you know why it is that I keep you around? And the answer he gives is, I keep you around because you were once the most brilliant mind on the planet. And so what this seems to indicate is that if that really is the case, then Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, maybe Tony Stark in terms of his traditional intelligence, just wasn't really there. But regardless, this world was very similar to the main Marvel universe universe, most likely in a lot of different ways. Whether the Clone Saga took place or not, we don't really know. But Miles Warren seems to have been every bit as capable in creating clones in this universe as he was in the main Marvel universe. And so what most likely happened here is that as the Inheritors were expanding throughout the multiverse, and as there were very little instances where they could be overcome by members of the superhero community, especially given how powerful they became over time, as they essentially absorbed the life energies of different Spider-Men and different Spider-Women, that of course they would likely create their own empires, their own little worlds, kind of universes they could rule to a degree. And so the result of this is that Genix probably showed up on this world, encountered Miles Warren, realized that Miles Warren was that intelligent when it came to cloning technology, and he probably killed the original Miles Warren and then cloned him. And so that's really kind of how this works, that Miles Warren doesn't really seem to be that different from the various clones that exist out there, where he's basically just a brainwashed clone. He doesn't really know his own history. And this really seems to be confirmed by this exchange when Miles answers or really responds to the statement of Genix saying, "You were once one of the most brilliant minds of the planet," when he says, "I don't think so, sir. I think I'd remember some of that." And the response to Genix is, "Well, there's some times that you do. And those days are the best days," right? So occasionally it looks like Miles Warren recalls his own history. Most likely what happens when that takes place is Genix kills him and replaces him with a new brainwashed clone. And that clone is totally unaware of what his role is or any of his history or anything like that. And when he begins to basically realize what his own history is, Genix kills him, replaces him, so on and so forth, and just kind of keeps that pattern going. The other part of this is that Genix kind of adopts this mentality of like, if you want something done, you got to do it yourself. And he even kind of makes a statement like, let them go do their own thing. Like, let them run through there. I'm not too concerned about it, because they'll end up getting to the special projects wing. And when that happens, then I'll talk to them personally. And so that's where you end up picking up with like Black Widow and Kane and all these people who were actually in the main cloning facility itself. And the initial response is, let's blow it up, right? Let's just destroy the whole thing, right? Just obliterate the entire cloning facility. The problem with this is that there's a lot of innocent people in there. And so again, the various spider teams adopting the philosophy, the needs of the few outweigh the needs of the many, they basically decide to spare the lives of innocent people and try to find some other way to destroy this whole facility. Now, of course, it doesn't really seem to go off, or it doesn't seem to work as well as it seemed, because in the middle of all this, Max Modell basically starts making this kind of these references to the fact that he's not the one who's actually running the facility. Instead, he's just a technician, that his job is to basically identify any possible mutations in the code of basically these clones. And that's when it's kind of like, wait a minute, there's something more going on here, right? And that's when he leads them to the special projects. And what we end up finding out here is that one of the things that Genix had been working on is that while the Inheritors travel throughout the multiverse, killing various Spider-Men and Spider-Women, what if they didn't have to, right? What if their ability to absorb the sustenance they need was something like Star Trek, right? Where they literally just kind of summon these things, seemingly out of like a computer-generated system, right? That essentially trying to clone Spider-Men and Spider-Women so they can just feed on them. Now, the funny thing about this is it would actually be a great thing if they did. I mean, sure, it would suck that like they would create these clones and to just turn around and feed on them. But assuming they weren't really sentient, like they didn't really have any memories or anything like that, they didn't know what they were, that they were basically these things that were just unconscious, they weren't really alive per se, then I guess maybe it wouldn't necessarily be a terrible thing. I mean, I don't know. At that point, you start getting into all kinds of different philosophical and moral arguments. But the important thing here is that this would prevent the Inheritors, keep the Inheritors from actually having to travel around the multiverse and kill all kinds of different Spider-Men and Spider-Women. The question that I would pose to you is, do you consider these things to be morally equal? If Genix were to successfully create clones of Spider-Men and Spider-Women that were able to tap into the essence of what it meant to be a spider totem and then feed on those clones while they were unconscious or they didn't really have any sentience, so like they didn't have an identity, they didn't have like a family or a life or anything like that, is that morally the same or different as the Inheritors showing up in some alternate reality where some version of Peter's been Spider-Man for 5 years of his life, and he's got a girlfriend and he goes to school and he's got a life and all that kind of stuff, and they kill him and consume his life energy? Is it morally the same thing? But the thing about this is that Genix has not been able to successfully duplicate what it is that allows the Spider-Man and Spider-Women to tap into the totemic essence of being a Spider-Man and Spider-Woman. In effect, he can create the bodies, he can't create the energy he needs for the Inheritors to siphon to maintain their own existence. And so basically, they're just empty husks and they've just kind of been left here. And that's really what he tells everybody, right? When Kane starts freaking out and he starts getting angry, that's exactly what Genix says, that the entire process of traveling around the multiverse and consuming clones is kind of exhausting. More so than that, like they have to deal with the psychological effects of of dying and coming back. We know that from Morlun, right? Morlun showed up in the main Marvel universe. He was killed by Peter Parker twice. It has a psychological effect on the inheritors. And when I wouldn't say that's enough for me to like feel bad for them, it can certainly screw with their heads and possibly even make them more dangerous than they are right now if they're just, psychotic, right? If they're mentally unstable. And so because of that, he was just trying to create clones and it all basically failed. And so because of that, one, he kills Max Modell because he's just like done, right? I mean, like another disappointment, right? Like this is not something we need to deal with. And then finally, he confronts the two of them and says, the two of you are here. You guys are basically clones. You are the end result of what it is that I've been trying to achieve. Whether the Jackal in your universe knew it or not, he had cloned Peter Parker and at the same time found a way to duplicate the essence of what it means to be a spider totem. I could feast on you right now and take your life energy and sustain myself. But what I want is more of you. So the intention is to defeat them and then start breaking them down, right? Just going through and experimenting on them, dissecting them to find a way to create more of Kane and Ben Reilly. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking back up again with Spider-Man. Well, really with Spider-Verse more than Spider-Man, but we're picking back up here with Spider-Woman, and then, well, things get a little crazy here in a little while. But as you guys know, if you guys recall the last video that we did, that basically Jessica Drew kind of went on this mission at the request of Peter Parker to basically travel to Loom World, right? The home world of the Inheritors, to figure out some way to defeat them, specifically to try to find a way to either end or discover how their cloning process works, or to just straight up find a way to defeat them. And so the result of this is that when she gets here, one of the things she realizes is that with this basically being their home world, their base of operations, that is very much a hodgepodge, right? That they've basically kind of filled this earth with things that they've conquered. And that's why you see a combination of what looks like old technology, so old ships with sails, combined with flying cars, things like that, because they really seem to have built it as kind of a monument to their ability to conquer different realities. Now, a lot of this also may just be based on passing interest, right? Things they're just kind of curious about that they hadn't really experienced before, right? So like you bringing home some kind of a trinket from a trip to Japan or to China or something along those lines, kind of a keepsake, something to remind yourself of the time that you had, the fact that you were there, and so on and so forth. And so what ends up happening is that Jessica Drew, as soon as she's here, where she expects to function in a capacity akin to a spy, where she basically keeps herself disguised, she operates under the radar, as soon as she's discovered, people start celebrating her, right? They start running up on her like, hey, look at this, look at what I got you, look at this thing that I did for you, I found your perfect color, right? Look at these furs and so on and so forth. She's very much viewed as kind of a celebrity among the people who are here. Now, this can work for and against her. It can work for her because of the fact that she doesn't really have to like skulk in the shadows or anything like that. It can work against her because we'll kind of find out a problem with this here in a little bit. But in the midst of all that, she's basically set upon by this guy with like tentacles for hands or something like that, and is basically whisked away, only for us to find out that she was basically brought here by this weird tentacle monster looking thing, which is actually kind of a mutated Atlantean, but she was brought here at the behest of Namor the Submariner. Now, here's a funny thing. Namor was never actually named in this part of the story. We're not explicitly told he was Namor. And in all honesty, it wasn't until Dan Slott was answering fan questions on Twitter that he was like, yeah, that's Namor the Submariner. So we didn't really know when this story initially came out that that was the case. But the thing about this is that Jessica's been brought here because it's part of her role, seemingly, in this world that she lives in, to basically pick over the various discoveries and findings of Namor the Submariner and his crew, right? Her job is to basically pick over all that stuff, kind of get her own choice, and then everything else goes to them, right? So they basically get whatever's left over when it's all said and done. Now, while that's happening and she's on this ship, we pick up with the real Jessica Drew. And the real Jessica Drew is a prick. This woman is absolutely horrible, right? Like there's this little kid and like his mom was working on this little thing for him and he was really excited about it and he almost missed seeing Jessica Drew. He takes it to her and like shows it to her, and as she looks over this thing, like this kid goes to grab her, and because she feels disgusted by the fact that this kid touched her, she basically slaps him and the thing away, and even goes as far as to say, like, when this kid says like, I know I shouldn't have touched you, but my mom spent all this time working on this for you and I was afraid that you wouldn't get it. When he gets slapped away, she was like, I don't even know why I bother bringing guards if everybody on the street's just going to be able to cop a feel on me, right? So it's like, do not let these lower people down here touch me. Do not let that happen. It's pretty crushing. Like it's a pretty terrible thing, right? And so switching back over to, I guess, good Jessica Drew, we can call her good Jess and evil Jess, right? So switching over to good Jess, of course, she's using the ability to pump her pheromones, right? Now, one of the things about Spider-Man, about Jessica Drew, is that initially when she was introduced, Marvel didn't want to create what was in effect a carbon copy of Peter Parker, right? They wanted her to be different, unique, something that wasn't necessarily the exact same as Peter, in the same way that like She-Hulk was like the Incredible Hulk, except she could change at will, things along those lines, and basically keep her personality in check. When it comes to Jessica Drew, she can emit pheromones that are, by all standards of measurement, the chemical version of love potions is really all it is. She can basically get people to do pretty much anything she wants. She doesn't like doing it very often, and she only likes doing it under certain circumstances. Like the character of Jessica Drew as she's been written, she doesn't like doing it in order to like get stuff out of guys, right? So it's not like she's like, yeah, I use my pheromones and got like a free date, right? She's not really that kind of a chick. She normally only uses her pheromones whenever she's on like a spy mission or something like that, so to like overcome guards or something along those lines. But regardless, what ends up happening here is that while good Jess is on this ship with Namor, suddenly evil Jess shows up. And that's when good Jess is like, okay, I gotta get out of here. And she tells Namor, she's like, look, okay, here's what's gonna happen. This evil Jess here is gonna show up, and you're gonna act like it's the first time that you've ever seen me or her or whatever, the first time you've ever seen Jessica Drew. You're gonna treat it that way. And so following that, we switch over to Silk. Now, as you guys recall, Silk, of course, ever the pain in the ass for anybody ever that she's ever met, and just kind of really causes more problems for people than she does anything else, is basically just fleeing from universe to universe because, you know, she felt like people weren't going to be her friend. That's literally what it came down to, right? Like the fact that Jessica Drew was like, Silk will get you killed if you let her, when she was talking to Spider-Gwen and those folks who were supposed to be babysitting her and so on. But basically Silk's like irresponsible and reckless, right? She's the last person you want on your side under any circumstance. But along her basically taking off and hiding, she was basically being chased down by the brother and sister inheritors, right? So literally they've just been chasing her nonstop. The problem with this is that as she continued on, she basically broke her teleporter. And so she did the only thing she could do, which was jump through the portal of the inheritors that had been made, which landed her in Loom World. Now, along the way, while she's there, we actually pick up with Jessica Drew, who oversees her evil self, basically like toying with this guy and saying that like, hey, like, you know, thank you for the wine and all that kind of stuff. And there's a little bit of a joke there, right? In the sense that like Locust is gonna get like 30 lashes for basically stealing wine from the kitchen of the inheritors and bringing it to that Jessica Drew. And she's like, I mean, yeah, but that's fine. I mean, you know, he gets a lifetime of lashes, so it's not like it's gonna make that much of a difference. And at least I get some wine out of it, right? So very much using people for her own ends, right? She doesn't really care about the wants and desires of individual people, that they're by and large just playthings for her own enjoyment. Now, good Jess is watching all this happen and she hates it, right? She's just like, this is ridiculous, right? This is like a terrible version of myself. And so that's when you end up having the brother and sister inheritors who show up after they basically lost track of Cindy Moon when she showed up here in Loom World. Now, of course, one of the other cool things about this is that despite how Jessica Drew treats people, and despite the fact that even though she is this reality's version of a Spider-Woman, or at least seems to be, she seems to have the ability to just come and go as she pleases. She gets a lot more freedom than seemingly anybody else. More so than that, when she's talking to the brother, of course, she basically bows down, she pays her respects, all that kind of stuff. So she's not on the same level as the inheritors in terms of social acceptability, right? She is still very much subservient. And she's basically instructed, one, we're not going to attack you because we know how Morlun hates it whenever we go after his own little toys and so on and so forth. So obviously her and Morlun have a thing going on, but she's also told, if you see a spider totem here, say something. And so when Cindy Moon basically comes racing through and then sees evil Jess, thinking she's good Jessica Drew, and stops to talk to her, evil Jess is like, spider totem, right? That's when good Jess jumps out and knocks out evil Jess, and evil Jess is basically out of the picture at this point. Like, Jessica Drew gives Silk her teleporter device and then takes the body to Name of the Submariner, puts it in like a chest, and is like, take off of this for a couple days and then come back, right? I need her out of the picture for right now. Now, as far as Silk goes, because she had teleported, that drew the attention of the inheritors. The funny thing about this is Silk teleported to Earth 3145. When the inheritors get there, they can't enter. And the reason why is because this universe, or this Earth, is home to what's basically a global thermal nuclear war. And so in effect, it's still highly irradiated. And this radiation is a weakness of the inheritors. And so when the brother and the sister pass through here, they immediately start succumbing to the effects of radiation and they have to pull out. And so what this has done is given Silk kind of a temporary safe space. So leaving Silk and kind of jumping back to Jessica Drew, you're basically met by the arrival of Morlun. Now, one of the funny things about this is that Morlun appearing here is actually a bit of a inconsistency in terms of writing regarding how it was handled. And we'll talk about that here in a second, because the inconsistency is really up more for interpretation than anything else. But when Morlun arrives here and basically Jessica Drew, pretending to be her evil evil self bows down, pays respects, all that kind of stuff. Morlun's like, what are you doing? Like, that's you don't need to bow down to me, right? Like, you and I are a thing, right? We're a couple. And then he goes in and kisses her. Basically, Morlun is banging a spider totem, which is kind of weird. But at that point, we end up basically switching over to Earth 13, right? Now, if you guys recall in the video that we did before, Earth 13 is actually, or at least was, the safe zone for all the different Spider-Men that were there until Solace, the father of the Inheritor, showed up here and killed this reality's version of Cosmic Spider-Man. Without his protection, these guys are all just sitting ducks, right? I mean, it's just easy pickings. Now, again, this kind of takes place before Morlun comes to visit Jessica Drew, and so that's why you see Morlun here, right? Because he hasn't really teleported back. But the thing about this is that he's basically got what's referred to as the Scion. Now, the Scion, again, that's a fairly important thing, but ultimately you end up seeing like all these different Spider-Men that are basically attacked by Solace and so on. When Solace tells Morlun, go back to Loomworld, take the Scion with you, right? So with the baby being taken, right, Benji being taken, basically Mayday Parker, right, the sister of Benji, starts to freak out because her brother's basically been kidnapped, and with her mom and her dad already dead, literally Benji's all that she has left. And then ultimately you end up having the arrival of Spider-Man UK, who's like, we brought reinforcements, right? Like, we have reinforcements here. And so what you end up getting is actually anime Spider-Man, which is amazing. And then you get Gundam Spider-Man. Now, depending on who you talk to, some people will be like, Gundam Spider-Man's like the best version of Spider-Man ever, right? But the important thing here is that anime, or really like mech Spider-Man, is ripped apart pretty quickly by Solace. Literally, this guy shows up in a giant suit of armor and it just starts getting torn apart. And they're like, okay, so we were kind of hoping that guy would be able to help us, but yeah, we're kind of screwed. So like, we need to bail out of here as fast as we possibly can, right? Like, we literally need to run. So what they end up doing is basically punching in just random numbers and just teleporting arbitrarily, only to essentially arrive in what looks like an area where dinosaurs have essentially conquered the world. Now, here's the funny thing about this. While we're not explicitly given like the gritty details of this in this particular story, I would argue this is where seemingly the Savage Land had basically taken over. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, the Savage Land is actually a place in Antarctica, which houses like dinosaurs and all kinds of creatures and life and so on that was thought to be extinct. There's also people who live there, right? Like Kazar lives there, even though nobody cares about Kazar. He lives there, trying to find some measure of relevance in a world of like superheroes. Literally, no one cares about Kazar. The reason why I say it looks like this is where the Savage Land had taken over is because if you look in there, you basically see what looks like a skyscraper. It seems to kind of make sense that like humanity probably lived in this world or existed in this world and like the Savage Land took over. It doesn't really matter. Honestly, you see it for like a few seconds, right? There isn't a whole lot doing there. Instead, Peter Parker basically chimes in with Jessica Drew. Now, of course, this takes place after Jessica Drew finds out that this reality's version of herself is essentially banging Morlun. But she ends up stumbling across what is basically the Master Weaver. Right now, Spider-Man does check in on a few things, right? He checks in on like Miles Morales and Ultimate Spider-Man, the cartoon version, and like they're like, it's exactly what you would expect, right? Where things are basically going awry. It is awesome to see that the Spidey-mobile is back. I'm not even gonna lie to you guys. I really wish they would bring back the Spidey-mobile or bring in the Spidey-mobile in like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because there's just something that sounds amazing about Tom Holland riding around town in a dune buggy painted as a spider. It just sounds cool. Something else to point out here, and I don't know if you guys are aware of this, the Spidey-mobile does talk. It's the Spider-Man version of Cars. Like it does talk, right? It can talk to you, like it can look at you and all kinds of stuff. So it's one of those cool little things. Like, these are all basically Spider-Man, right? Like Cowboy Spider-Man, like these are all basically Spider-Man. Of course, you know, they end up basically teleporting away. And one of the funny things that I do want to point out here is that a joking reference is made to this group being called the Web Warriors. This is actually where this started from. When that comment was made in the comic, oh, it exploded on the forums. I don't know how many of you guys remember that, but Spider-Man fans everywhere were like, Web Warriors, yeah! Like, Web Warriors are amazing. Like, it just kind of blew up in popularity and just kind of been that way for a while. And of course, over in the year 2099, you basically got, you know, Lady Spider, and you got Miguel O'Hara basically dissecting one of the, or at least the body of Deimos as they had captured the clone body anyway. And of course, we'll kind of circle back around to that when we get back into Spider-Man 2099. But the big thing about this is jumping back to Loomworld, right, to Earth 1, where you basically have Jessica Drew conversing with with the Master Weaver. One of the things we learn here is that yes, the Master Weaver is imprisoned by the Inheritors, right? The Master Weaver is serving the Inheritors despite the fact the Master Weaver doesn't necessarily want to. The other thing about this, and this is what made the notion of the Master Weaver so wonky, is the ability to see the future. That what this did is that while it wasn't necessarily like a foolproof thing, right? Like make sure you turn left on that road on Tuesday, right? And you'll get to where you need to be. While it's not necessarily like that, so the Inheritors weren't able to basically meet Spider-Man in every single reality as soon as they teleported there. It was more of kind of like a broad direction in terms of where time was going. Even then, it still kind of flies in the face of Marvel Comics as a whole. And the reason why is because if you go and you look at things like Days of Future Past or any one of those stories that take place in the future, one thing to bear in mind is that while that quote unquote future had been averted, at any point in time, it can become the guaranteed future of Marvel Comics. It's why sometimes they'll go back and reference those stories, right? So Days of Future Past, that reality wasn't necessarily destroyed per se. It is technically an alternate universe out there, but Marvel kind of keeps it on the back burner under this idea that, hey guys, at some future point in time, Senator Robert Kelly and Maury McTaggart and Professor Xavier can all be assassinated, and that can basically lead to Days of Future Past. Although I believe Robert Kelly's dead. He's been gone for a long time. Basically, what the Master Weaver tells Jessica Drew here is that while it is basically forced to work with the Inheritors or work for the Inheritors by opening up portals to different dimensions and different things like that, giving them a kind of general viewpoint on what direction the future is going in and so on and so forth, that it can also work against them. He cannot do it overtly, otherwise they'll kill the Master Weaver and replace him with somebody else. But what it does is it basically pulls little strands. So basically kind of orchestrating and ensuring things play out a different way, right? So like instead of Jessica Drew basically being assigned to Loom World by Peter Parker, that she could have ended up in some alternate reality somewhere, that it basically could have been her and been Riley and Kane that were dealing with the whole clone area. Such as it was, the Master Weaver basically pulled little strings and kind of had things maneuvered in little ways, even if it's only kind of subconsciously manipulating Peter Parker and those guys, so that it would all lead to Jessica Drew being here, presumably because this is the only circumstance where it works. And so what ends up happening is the Master Weaver says like, all this is done, right? All these strings have been pulled, all this manipulation through the timeline has been done for the purpose of getting you here. So I can give you these scrolls, right? These prophecies about the Scion and the Other and the Bride and something else. And that's kind of the funny thing here, is because this is where you basically end up learning about all these little roles and moments and so on and so forth. And so what Jessica Drew actually ends up doing is basically taking these scrolls and teleporting them away to Peter Parker. Now she does this because one, she's not supposed to be in the presence of the Master Weaver, right? That area is off limits to her. And two, she certainly couldn't be in possession of scrolls that basically illustrate what these particular roles play, as well as what the master plan of the Inheritors is, because their job or their goal is not to simply just kill Spider-Man. They actually have a goal. They have a particular task that they're trying to achieve here, a kind of a ceremony that they're looking to attain. And so of course they need these individual spider totems, the Bride, the Scion, the Other, like they need those individual characters to achieve this particular goal. In the end, when they go to Peter of course is contacted by Cindy Moon, right? Where they're looking for a safe space, and Cindy Moon's like, I found a place where the Inheritors can't come to. It's Earth 3145, right? It's this alternate reality where they can't come here. Get here as fast as you possibly can. So of course they all end up teleporting away. Now once they get there, they realize the whole area is irradiated, right? Mayday Parker's pissed off at all of them, right? Because she's just like, because of you guys, my brother's basically been kidnapped. She's working with them, but like her role here will basically stop as soon as her brother is effectively saved. But like at the end of the day, they're like, okay, look, like we're here. Yes, everything's gone to pot. We've literally ended up in one bad situation after another because Peter Parker is clearly more inept than Dr. Octopus was as Spider-Man. He's nowhere near as intelligent or capable or able to plan in the same way, but they're all kind of taking his lead anyway because they hope that he's right, even though he has kind of proven himself to be a bit of an idiot when it comes to being a leader. And so ultimately when they get here, Cindy Moon has basically made these arrows out of webbing, which leads them to their destination, right? Exactly where she had gone to, which was the bunker where all the different spider totems were hidden. And that's where we kind of end up getting this realization, if we hadn't achieved it already, that while Ezekiel Sims, the person who initially told Peter Parker about the Inheritors, about like Morlun and all those guys, where he had built a bunker in the main Marvel universe for Peter Parker, seemingly that had been done across every single universe in the multiverse to keep the Spider-Man safe because the threat of the Inheritors was so significant. And so this reality's version of Spider-Man had basically been hiding out in this bunker. And Cindy Moon stumbled across this reality's version of Spider-Man when she went to that bunker. And so when Peter gets there, he's like, okay, look, this place is going to be a little cramped. It's going to be a little bit crazy, but at the end of the day, like, you know, while it's a little crowded, everything's gonna be cool. And then that's when Cindy Moon is like, okay, well, here's the thing though. I discover the spider person of this universe, and you might want to brace yourself for a shock, Peter Parker. The reason why is because when all the lights and everything get turned on, we end up finding out this reality's version of Spider-Man is Uncle Ben. All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Spider-Verse. And in this instance, we are picking up with the Scarlet Spider story. Now, something that I also told you guys is that we would explain the whole idea behind like the other and all that kind of stuff in this video, which we will do. But what this initially does is it basically picks up with like Ben Reilly and Kane and Jessica Drew from the Ultimate Universe, and these guys facing off against Genix. In all honesty, this story's pretty straightforward, and there's not a whole lot doing here, right? Like Genix is there to stop them from destroying the cloning facility. Their idea is to destroy the cloning facility, and then things just kind of go from there, right? Like you basically got Kane, and that's kind of the funny thing. I always thought of Kane as like an answer to the question, what if the Punisher became Spider-Man? Because while Kane is not necessarily as brutal as like Frank Castle is, he's certainly a lot more brutal than Spider-Man traditionally is. And so as a result of that, one of the things that he really kind of takes on here is this idea that the Inheritors will always hunt them. And where Ben Reilly is kind of like, no, we can't kill them. That's not what we do. The response of Kane is like, we're past the point of like the moral high ground, right? We're past the point of saying like, we don't kill Inheritors because it's the wrong thing to do. Instead, he's just like, this guy has to die. And so what ends up happening here is that he actually starts to lose control of himself. And when he does, he starts basically developing like these appendages and spikes and things like that that come out of his body, and he successfully kills Genix. Now, there's a reason why this happens. And this basically leads us into our discussion about the nature of the spider totems and so on and so forth. So here's the thing to understand when it comes to these totems. The reality in terms of why Marvel created them in the first place, it was initially just designed to explain why Peter Parker could do things that were beyond his normal power set. So originally, Peter Parker was an avatar of the Other. Then what you also have is the Bride, and you have the Scion in terms of the ones that matter here. There are others, but the way this all works is that if we use Juggernaut as an example, right? Cain Marko is an avatar of Sidorak, insofar as Sidorak, the demon entity, had a Crimson Gem, and Cain Marko got his hands on the Crimson Gem, and by possessing it, he is given a portion of the power that belongs to Sidorak. The Great Spider Totems are basically the exact same thing, that you have the multiverse, and then you have the Web of Life and Destiny, which is kind of the Spider-Man version of the multiverse. So think of it like the Spider-Man equivalent of like a Speed Force, essentially, for like the Flash. But the Spider Totems exist on a multiversal scale, and there's only ever one of them. So there's only ever one Other. There's only ever one Bride. There's only ever one Scion, right? That's it. And the way this works is that you basically have like the Great Weaver, the Master Weaver, if you want to call it that. And their job is to, one, ensure that the multiverse is maintained by basically having individual Spider-Men or Spider-Women become hosts for the Great Totems or the Great Avatars. And so in the case of Peter Parker and the idea of the Other, that was initially Marvel's way of explaining how it is he was able to do things that he couldn't normally do. And it went on that way for a little while. But one of the things that we've talked about in the past is that when Joe Quesada became editor-in-chief, he wanted to get rid of what he considered to be all the unnecessary fluff and return the characters back to their basic roots. And the basic root of Peter Parker is he was a kid bitten by a spider that basically gave him powers, and then he went forward as Spider-Man. All the other stuff that like Straczynski and some of those guys did, where they created the spider totems and so on, Quesada thought was unnecessary. And so that's why Peter Parker, who was originally a host of the Other, all that went away in the aftermath of One More Day. That when his whole history was rewritten by Mephisto, one of those things is that instead of him embracing the Other as he had previously done, he cast it aside. And so that entity, that spiritual essence, if we want to call it that, was taken away from Peter by the Great Weaver and given to Cain. And that's why it is that Cain is now the Other in Marvel Comics. In the case of Cindy Moon, she's the Bride. And in the case of Benji, he's the Scion. Now, the question that has to be asked here is, what's the purpose of these guys? What do they do with these particular roles? So if we start with the Scion, as most of you guys know, whenever a person becomes like a Spider-Man or a Spider-Woman, more often than not, it's because they're bitten by a radioactive spider, right? This is kind of the mythos surrounding Spider-Man and has been since the character's introduction. However, there are occasionally instances where a person is born with spider powers, and that's what the Scion represents. Specifically, it's Benji. He's the youngest person in the multiverse to have been born with the abilities of Spider-Man, and so he represents every instance where a person is born with spider powers. Now, the nature of Silk Silk, also called the Bride, is she is the one that's basically the spider wife of Peter Parker, if we can call it that. Not literally, she's not married to Peter Parker. But when you look at the various instances where people have been bitten by a radioactive spider and then went on to become Spider-Man or Spider-Woman, it only ever usually happens once, right? In the case of Miles Morales, it's a little bit different. Miles Morales was bitten by a spider that came from the same experimental stock, but Miles himself was not actually bitten by the same spider that bit Peter Parker. Cindy Moon was bitten by the same spider that bit Peter Parker in the main Marvel Universe. So she represents random chance, right? Happenstance. The random probability that somebody will be in a certain place at a certain time and then be bitten by a radioactive spider that will turn them into Spider-Man. And then in turn, you have the other, which is basically just like the warrior, quote unquote, of the various spider totems, right? The one built for conflict. And so that's why over the course of this whole Spider-Verse event, yes, you have all kinds of different people who have been bitten by radioactive spiders, things like that. But then you have select few, because the circumstances surrounding them becoming Spider-Man and Spider-Woman are very unique among the web of life and destiny. 99.99999% of every single Spider-Man and Spider-Woman that you're ever going to see in the multiverse were just a version of Peter Parker, man or woman, who was bitten by a radioactive spider, and that's it. But Benji was born with his powers. Silk was bitten by a spider, the same spider that bit Peter Parker, and the other is the totem that defends all the others. And so in the end, in facing the fact, or facing this revelation that so long as this cloning facility remains, that it'll just keep going on and on and on and on, with Kane currently knocked out, right? He's out of commission. And then you've got Jessica Drew, who is captured by Genix. Ben Reilly does the only thing he can do, right? He actually ends up just activating an explosive device, really just like a giant bullet, right? I mean, this thing's much, much larger than like a 50 cal, but basically just like throws it into a stack of all these other bullets and just blows up the entirety of the cloning facility, right? He basically ends up killing himself in the process while Jessica Drew gets Kane out of there. And as Kane begins to come to, he realizes that Ben Reilly's now dead, right? Ben Reilly sacrificed his life in order to destroy Genix, and he in turn blames the inheritors for it. And so because of the fact that he, one, recognizes that he's the other, two, he can kill the inheritors, and three, the cloning facility is destroyed, that basically there's no real way for the inheritors to come back. And so once they die, they stay dead. And so basically leaning into the totality of his power as the other, he heads directly to Loom World in order to find a way to destroy the inheritors. Now at that point, we switch over to Loom World itself, right? Back to Earth 1. And you have, of course, these other members of the inheritors who were here, right? You've got Bora and Brix, and you've got Genix, or at least what's left of him, right? The last Genix that there'll ever be. You have like all these people who are here, Deimos and so on, and they all, of course, are just begging for forgiveness because of the fact that they essentially failed Solace, or at least in their mind they failed Solace, because the different members of the totems that they were supposed to capture, the Bride and the other and so on, have all basically managed to escape. But the response to Solace is, we're not worried about that. And the reason why is because remember, with the web of life and destiny, while it's not a necessarily guaranteed future, which is do A, B, and C, and D will happen, it's more of if you do A, B, and C, then like D or E or F will happen or something along those lines. That Solace seems to have this understanding of the fact that in time, because of what they've done so far, specifically the fact that they've captured Benji, they've captured the Scion, that in turn, everybody else will follow suit, right? The nature of Spider-Man is no man left behind. They won't sacrifice people if they don't have to. And so in turn, he knows they will come to them. They'll basically go to the ends of the earth to try to find a way to save Benji. And ultimately, the other and the Bride will inevitably end up on Loom World, even if the others stay behind. And so what we end up doing is transitioning back to Earth 3145, right? Now remember, this is where we discovered that in this reality, Uncle Ben ended up becoming Spider-Man, and it's just been kind of laying in wait here ever since. And what we end up finding out is the origin is not that dissimilar, again, kind of tying into this discussion about like the Scion and so on and so forth, that when Peter had basically gone to the science exhibit, that nobody would go with him. And so Uncle Ben basically took the day off, ended up going with Peter. Uncle Ben was bitten by a radioactive spider, and Peter actually leaned into it, right? He helped him develop all kinds of like technologies and things like that that could help him play this role, and that he basically went forward as a hero. The problem with this is that, as you guys know, just by nature of reading comic books, when you are a hero, you will draw the attention of villains. And that where in the main Marvel universe, the Green Goblin had killed Gwen Stacy, in this universe, the Green Goblin killed Peter Parker and Aunt May. May, which basically left Uncle Ben alone. And so he ultimately abandoned his role as being Spider-Man. Now, this is really important because there was actually a time, like this little panel you see where like Uncle Ben is walking away in like the Spider-Man costumes in a trash can. That was an actual plot moment that happened in the Spider-Man mythos when Peter Parker was going to quit. He ultimately ended up going back to be Spider-Man, but Uncle Ben didn't do that. Instead, Uncle Ben was met by Ezekiel Sims, who basically told him, hey, like there are inheritors running around the multiverse and they are killing Spider-Man and they will find you and kill you unless you come with me and you stay in this bunker. But unlike what you would expect from like Peter Parker of the main Marvel Universe, who would do exactly what he did do, which is turn down the offer and instead go forward as being Spider-Man, confronting whatever threat may face him, because the lives he can save in the interim and the good he can do outweighs the value of his own life, that Uncle Ben leaned into it. And so he decided to stay in the bunker. And where some of you guys may interpret that as me kind of saying that Uncle Ben was a coward, the reality is you would be right. And in fact, that's how he's depicted here by Dan Slott. Now, one thing that I want to point out, when this happened, people were pissed. When it comes to Spider-Man fans, they never want to see Uncle Ben shined in any light other than Uncle Ben was just this great guy who always did noble things and his death was one of the most significant moments in Peter's life. But that's kind of the great thing about this, is that having an Uncle Ben that makes morally questionable decisions, I think is a cool thing, because it takes him off of this pedestal that Spider-Man fans put him on and kind of brings him down to being like, yeah, man, he's a person, like he's a human being. He's not some godly guy who's incapable of making bad decisions and everything he does is great. But like morally questionable decisions, that's an awesome concept. And so what you also end up finding out here is that the world itself being totally destroyed actually happened at the hands of Otto Octavius. Now remember, Superior Spider-Man is listening to this whole thing. And as you guys know, Superior Spider-Man was when Dr. Octopus took over the body of Peter. And so what Superior Spider-Man is basically listening to is this story where an alternate reality version of himself held the world hostage using nuclear weapons, and that when all his demands were being met, something went wrong. And basically the world devolved, or at least was destroyed, by nuclear weapons. Superior Spider-Man is so taken aback by this because in his mind, he could never make such a miscalculation. And it's one of those funny things because he's kind of like, you know, in every universe, no matter what universe it is, I am always this intelligent. When in reality, he was kind of an idiot in this universe and basically led to it all being destroyed. The other part of this is that Peter Parker kind of yanks everybody back and says, okay, look, this is a cool tale and everything, but it's taken us off track, right? Our focus needs to be on what's going on with these spider totems, right? What's going on with what the inheritors want to do. Jessica Drew sacrificed her teleporter to give us these scrolls, and nobody's ever really able to read them. Now, when it comes to Silk, ever the girl who's emo and just feels misunderstood by the world, when like somebody makes some offhanded remark and they're like, so basically Jessica Drew sacrificed our teleporter to give us these useless scrolls that we can't use, then Silk, little miss the world revolves around me, and you know, anytime anybody says anything bad about something that I happen to be involved in, they're directly talking about me. She's like, oh God, I feel so bad, you know, and that kind of thing. And so she basically leaves. One of the things to understand, this story killed people's interest in Silk because all she was the girl who just moped around, and every single circumstance that ever went bad was a reflection of her and the fact that she had somehow failed as a person, right? Like people, I remember reading the forums and people were like, dude, I hate Silk like so much. And so what actually ends up happening is her working alongside Spider-Gwen, they actually teleport away to Loom World directly in order to find a way to get Jessica Drew out of Loom World and back to basically this reality, which is where none of the inheritors can arrive to. But something that I hope you guys are noticing is that now with Cindy Moon going there, on top of Kane going there, all the spider totems are all in the same place. Now, one of the other things to know here is that when it came to Anya Karazin, that remember, she's not truly a Spider Woman per se. She is, but she's not. She got her powers by mystical means. And the Spider Society that worships the nature of spider totems are the ones who basically gave her her powers. But they also worship the totems, which meant they can read these scrolls. And so Anya Karazin knows how to read them because she was taught to. And so where she goes through and reads all this, we're not really given like the ins and outs and the specific details of how all the spider totems work. But what we are told is that if the blood of the bride and the other and the scion is spilled on the web of life and destiny, that it'll basically destroy any of the spider totems from coming into existence. That basically there will be no other, there will be no bride, no scion or anything like that. And that in doing so, the inheritors will never have to concern themselves with the other part of the prophecy, which is that the various Spider-Men and Spider-Women that exist out there, specifically the totems, are destined to end the reign of the inheritors themselves. They're destined to destroy the inheritors. And so that's why the inheritors are doing this, is because while yes, killing various spider totems does grant them like some increased level of power, and they do find satisfaction in absorbing the life energies of various Spider-Man and Spider-Woman out there, their goal is to actually find the bride and the other and the Scion, and then take them, spill their blood on the web of life and destiny, and then destroy the future appearances of any other Spider-Man, as well as actually ending the multiverse. Now, this would be doubly worse because the multiverse is already collapsing, right? Like the incursions were happening at the time this story was taking place. So if anything, the Inheritors would actually speed up the destruction of all existence, which really is one of the things that a lot of people asked when it came to Spider-Verse. I found myself asking that while you did have like the Black Priests and the Ivory Kings and all that kind of stuff, how come the Inheritors never came across the map makers or anything like that, right? If they were being sent to universes where Spider-Man were there, it seemed to maybe kind of make sense because it just meant that like the incursions had not taken place on those worlds yet, or like the Black Priests had not arrived. So I guess it kind of made sense, but still you would have thought somewhere along the line they would have like met a Black Priest or a group of Black Priests or something like that and just like fled for their lives after almost being destroyed. But whatever the case is, when we switch over to Loom World where Kane arrives, and in fact Spider-Man tells him, look man, like do not go to Loom World, and Kane's like, too late bro, I'm already here, right? And he's just like, no, like you're literally destroying the plan that we need to create, like you're doing the worst possible thing. The question that Spider-Man has is, or at least the statement he makes is, okay, look, we basically got Cindy Moon who took off to Loom World, we've got Kane who took off to Loom World, the Scion's already on Loom World, they're in the worst place because they're going to be easy to capture. So he's like, everybody doing everything you're doing, drop it, right? Like no matter what you're doing, what it is that's happening right now, drop what you're doing. We all need to go to Loom World, and either we have to destroy the Inheritors or we have to save the 3 Spider Totems and get them out of there and bring them back here. Now, Miguel O'Hara's initial response is no, like we're in the middle of something, give me like 5 minutes and then we'll head back out there. And then of course you end up having like Miles Morales and all those Spider-Men that they've gathered who are of course answering the call, and so they're responding. And so what you end up getting, or at least doing, is switching back over to Loom World, and you basically end up having the other, right, like Kane, who successfully manages to kill Solace. Now, this was another controversial moment in the story. And when I say controversy in the story, I mean, I use it as a loose term, right? I mean, there's nothing controversial about comic books, right? Like it's comic books. But like the thing about this is that the other actually kills Solace, which was kind of nuts, right? Because again, the other is like the warrior, right? Designed or destined to face off and seemingly destroy any threats that may befall the various spider totems that exist out there. But where Solace, who's seemingly the most powerful of all the Inheritors, is killed by Kane, that in turn, Kane is killed by Morlun. What made this controversial to fans is that it happened so incredibly fast, right? It just happened so quickly. Now, a lot of this was because it was just part and parcel to telling the story. So I would argue anybody who was mad about this was probably looking for a reason to be mad. To me, like I wasn't, it was like, I mean, I guess it makes sense, right? I mean, something had to happen, right? I mean, this, Kane couldn't stay around as Spider-Man forever. In all honesty, this, as much as any other story, was designed to kind of wrap up his plot threads and basically call it a day. But at the end of the day, because of the fact that Solace is now dead, that puts Morlun in charge of all the other Inheritors. And so what you end up getting, of course, is that while Jessica Drew and Cindy Moon and Spider-Gwen are now gathered together after Jessica Drew was rescued by Cindy Moon and Spider-Gwen, that in turn leads to all the Green Goblins being descended onto them by the Inheritors. So of course, now they have to flee for their lives. And this leads into another one of the controversial moments from the story, which was the depiction of Uncle Ben. That when you switch back to this reality and you've got Peter Parker talking to Uncle Ben and saying, look, like, we've got to go. The response of May Parker, right, the Spider-Girl from an alternate universe, Benji's older sister, is like, one person is not going to make a difference. And the response of Uncle Ben is, yeah, you're right. Like, I'm not going to make any real difference here, right? Like, I mean, I possibly could have done something to stop, Dr. Octopus from destroying, my world or whatever it is. But he's like, at the end of the day, like, I'm just one simple guy, right? There's nothing I can do here. There's not much that can be offered to like save this day. But this is where things were really cool with Peter, because suddenly the shoe was on the other foot. In years past, it was always Uncle Ben making these speeches to Peter Parker and saying, with great power must come great responsibility, that you have a duty to things greater than yourself, that you can't simply just kind of fall to the wayside, collapse in on yourself when times get hard, because it's when times get hard that you really find out what you are. And the way that Uncle Ben is depicting himself is that when times get hard, he gives up. He doesn't really like stand up and kind of keep on going the way that he's supposed to. A massive difference between this reality's Uncle Ben and the Uncle Ben that Peter Parker knows. And Peter Parker goes as far as to tell him that, right? Like in my universe, my Uncle Ben never would have done this. He never would have been the guy to just kind of sit down and collapse and give up, roll over and play dead because things just got really, really hard and because he made a few bad choices, right? He's like, I have lost seemingly everything that was important to me, all the things that were significant to me, and where Peter Parker doesn't necessarily seem to be able to rile him up and doesn't seem to be able to kind of get him back. It comes down to Superior Spider-Man, and he's like, "You're pathetic, old man." And just starts screaming at him, right? Like where Peter Parker goes to chime in, the response to Superior Spider-Man is shut up, right? He's like, so you're saying that's it? You're afraid to fail again, right? That's what you have to offer? No. He's like, I've lost more times than I've won, and every time I got back up. That's all that matters. And he's like, when victory is easy, it's cheap. Every fight that's ever been worth fighting has been against adversity, against so-called quote unquote unbeatable forces, some kind of unbeatable foe. But there is no such thing. Every enemy has a weakness. You just have to find it once, right? He's the one that actually rallies Uncle Ben, that gets Uncle Ben off his backside and willing to fight again. He's like, look, the ones who go forward and achieve great things, who do something meaningful, are the ones who stand in the face of everything they've lost and are willing to give just a little bit more in order to get what it is that they really want. And that's what he asks. What is it that you really want here? Do you want to give up, just roll over and play dead? Or do you want to get off your ass and do something, right? Do you want to redeem all these past mistakes and all these past failures that you've made? And that's exactly what happens. Uncle Ben gets up and is like, one more time, and dons the costume, and the whole group goes forward into Loom World with the intention of killing the inheritors. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Spider-Verse. And here's a funny thing. This is going to be a pretty short video relative to the other ones that we've done, because this is basically part of Spider-Man Team Up. So these stories are not super lengthy. In fact, they're like 10 pages each, right? So they're pretty short here. What's funny about this one, though, is this is probably one of the most important moments from all of Spider-Verse. And so I don't really understand why they shuffled it off to a Team Up comic and basically called it a day, right? It's a little weird that they did that. But one of the things that had come out of the scrolls that have been given to the Spider Army by the Master Weaver was the nature of Karn. Now, we've talked about Karn before, that he's one of the inheritors, that Karn himself very much cherished love and beauty, and that unlike the other inheritors, he didn't feed on spiders out of a desire to. And so when his family learned that, they basically put this helmet on his head and then banished him from the inheritor homeworld, destined to essentially spend forever consuming spiders in an effort to earn his place back home. The reality is that was never going to happen. But because of the fact that the spiders have learned this, they see him as a potential ally, because of the fact that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that Karn hates his family and his father most of all. And so the spiders can use that to their advantage as a means to basically rally and bring him on board. And so what we do is we switch over to Earth 3123, this alternate reality where it actually turns out that Peter Parker and Uncle Ben, neither one of them had become Spider-Man. Instead, it was Aunt May, which is cool. You know, there's a few stories, those of you guys who don't know, there's a few stories where awesome stuff happens with Aunt May. Like, you guys remember the Golden Oldie story, right? Where like Aunt May becomes like Golden Oldie. She's a herald of Galactus. It's amazing. It's really cool. She's like babysitting Franklin Richards, and like Galactus shows up out of nowhere, and then she like races off and like chastises him, and then like he turns her into a herald, and then like she goes and finds worlds for him. It's really cool. Like, it's a really, really fun little story. But regardless, this conversation between the two is actually interesting because Aunt May does exactly what you would expect her to do, right? I mean, she's a kindly old woman. She's like a nice old woman that would like fix you cookies and stuff like that. I mean, she'll wallop you upside the head with her purse if you're like, you know, if you're mouthing off or acting up, right? I mean, Aunt May's never afraid to throw hands. But the conversation between the two is such that she's a very gentle person, and it almost kind of begins to turn Karn for like a brief second, but then he snaps back and says, no, right? Destiny cannot be denied. I have to earn my place back at my family. Just one more spider that dies, and then I'll in turn be able to earn my place again, right? I'll be able to be back with the family, kind of earn my right as I've desired it so much. Now, of course, as you would expect, you basically end up having the arrival of all these spiders who show up, right? So you've got Ashley Barton, you've got Spider-Punk, you've got Spider-Man UK, Billy Braddock, you've got Spider-Man India. You have like all these spiders who show up out of nowhere, and a fight breaks out between them and Karn. Now, here's a funny thing about this, that Karn initially goes to attack all of them, right? And we all know for the most part, Karn could probably overpower them, right? And probably even kill them. But right off the bat, they take him by surprise. And the reason why is because he says like, I don't know how you guys, you know, know, how you came here. I don't know how you got this knowledge that, you know, that I was banished from my family and all that kind of stuff. And it doesn't matter. He's like, but like all of you are going to die. And the response of Spider-Man UK is like, you have it wrong. Like, we're not here to fight you, man. We're here to ask you to join us, right? And initially the response of Karn is like, man, you guys must be desperate if you're showing up here asking me to join your ranks. But the funny thing here is that Spider-Man India chimes in and says, I understand obligation to family better than most, but your family betrayed those obligations long ago. They claimed to punish you for your mother's death. But the truth is they sent you away because they feared you because you questioned them. And then Ashley chimes in and says the same kinfolk who said that you could come back and live with them like one big happy family if you killed just enough spiders. And that was how many hundreds of years ago? The walls are closing in. Like, their argument is there's nothing you can do here that will make your family proud. There's nothing you can do to earn your place at their side. That's never gonna happen. That's never, ever, ever gonna happen. Like, there's nothing you can do here. Your family will always have you as a carrot on a stick, right? Just keep going a little bit longer and you'll get it, right? They're literally just leading you on. And so either you can stand aside from that, you can stop that, or you can keep it going. And one of the funny things is they kind of tease this way of saying like, you know, they have like another way for him to continue to survive. And where the answer that Anya Corazon gives is no, we don't. But your family, if you help us beat them, we could use their technology to find alternatives to you traveling around the multiverse and consuming spiders. Then right off the bat, Karn snaps back, right? This little glimmer of hope that he thought he had, he snaps back and says, no, that's never gonna happen. I've got to keep doing my thing, right? In a lot of ways, it's like a video game, right? Where you have to go through like those trust challenges where you have to like convince them into believing you. And if you answer any of the questions wrong, then like, they're like, no, I can't trust you. You know, you guys know what I'm talking about. Like Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic is a really good example of that. Where Karn says it's useless to defy fate, the natural order. Spider-Man UK says, who says there's only one natural order? How many worlds have you been to? I've seen multitudes. They're all beautiful and they're all different. According to the scroll, you wanted to explore their beauty, record it, celebrate it, not bring death and destruction. And then Anya chimes in and says, and as for fate, who knows more about it than the Master Weaver? And who do you think gave us this? And so when the statement's made like the Master Weaver is the reason why we have these scrolls in the first place, it kind of begins to lock things in stone. Because while Karn has been banished from his family for quite some time, the basic functions of the family and the nature of the Master Weaver, that's still known to him. And again, one of the things that we've stated is that while the Master Weaver doesn't tell them walk this way and turn left, you know, or follow this exact path and you will end up where you want to go, he doesn't lead them to their future. The Master Weaver does have knowledge of the future. And so what their response is, the Master Weaver gave us these scrolls, and in giving us these scrolls, gave us this knowledge of you so we could tell you that we have this knowledge, so we could ask you to work with us. That it's all basically fate. That Karn was destined to turn away from his family and to join the Spider Army against the Inheritors. This is a big ally for a variety of reasons. The first is because despite the fact that Karn has been gone for a lengthy amount of time, there's still some very important information he can give the Spider Army to help him defeat his family, their inner workings, how they function, all that kind of stuff. Any information that they don't have, no matter how small, is exceedingly important in this war that they're engaged in. The other part of this is that Karn says, my hunger can be intense. It can be uncontrollable. There are times when I'm going to need to feed. And the response of these guys is, okay, then if that's the case, and this is a big risk that we're taking here, we'll let you feed on us. Not enough to like kill them, right? But enough to basically sustain himself. And that's what happens, right? Karn comes to this realization. He says, all this time, it was a lie. The centuries I suffered, the pain I inflicted, none of it had to happen. My family told one truth. There is no greater wretch than me. And so the response of Spider-Punk is, no one is beyond redemption. It will be a long journey, but that is nothing new to you, is it? Let us help you take the first step. This is an important thing because it feeds into the nature of the Spider Army, the various Spider-Men themselves, right? One of the things we didn't necessarily cover in the previous video, it didn't seem overly important, is that there is a point where Spider-Man India has this bit of a kind of an emotional breakdown where he seems to come to this realization that when he looks at Peter Parker, that all their differing names and even their costumes seem to be alternate variations of Peter Parker himself, that they're all basically copies of Peter Parker. And in a lot of ways, that's true, but that's the common theme that Spider-Man more often than not share. It's one of the things that made Ashley Barton and Superior Spider-Man so unique, is that they were kind of an answer to the question, what happens happens when somebody becomes a Spider-esque character, but then is kind of a villain, and then maybe kind of a hero, but is usually a jerk more often than not. But they aren't straight, true villains. I mean, I guess maybe Ashley Barton is. She kind of became the new Kingpin in Old Man Logan, but outside of her, you know, Superior Spider-Man isn't necessarily a straight villain. He kind of was in the beginning, but he changed his ways as time went on. And that's kind of the nature of what it means when it comes to the Spider-Man mythos, is they're not necessarily naive. I mean, in some ways they are, right? The belief that like everybody can be saved if you just show them happiness and help them understand their hearts are 3 sizes too small. You know, like if you approach it from that perspective, sure, right? That's just good old plain being naive, you know? And so with these different Spider-Man, sure, like in this instance, if this were anybody else, they probably would have pummeled him. But the fact that Karin is someone they need on their side, that they're able to bring in this sort of gentler touch that can kind of rally him in and say, look, we need your help in defeating the family that you hate so much. And so as a result of this, they actually all end up basically grabbing Karin and sharing a bit of their power with him, which kind of allows him to feed and sustain himself to a degree. Not enough that it like kills anybody, but enough that like he's able to kind of keep himself going. And then following that, they exit through the portal and take Karin back to their base of operations. So again, an exceedingly important story in the Spider-Verse event, which was just kind of shuffled off to a side story, and I never completely understood why. But okay, so we are finally here at the conclusion of Spider-Verse. And for some of you guys, the response might kind of be, God, this ending kind of came out of nowhere. It did. And that was really one of the biggest gripes that people had about Spider-Verse when the event originally happened, is the ending felt rushed, right? Like at the time the story, the ending came out, a lot of people were on forums and they were like, God, it feels like Marvel just wrapped it up with a quickness. And they kind of had to, right? That's one of the things about it, is when we covered this event originally and we were talking about everything that was going on at the time, remember, Marvel had the incursions going on, right? The collapse of the multiverse and all that kind of stuff. And the reality is that everything that Marvel was writing was largely contingent on what was going on with Secret Wars, in the sense that it was all basically supposed to end at around the same time, in the sense that what you basically got was you had the last days of various heroes, right? The last days of Loki, the last days of Black Widow, last days of Punisher, different things like that. Spider-Man didn't necessarily get that. He kind of did, but Spider-Verse was really more of the last days of Spider-Man, because for his character, it really went directly into Secret Wars issue number 0, and basically the collapse of the multiverse. And so with all this happening, it was basically this idea that Marvel had to wrap it up fast, and that's exactly what they did. And so in the last video, we basically kind of ended it with the various Spider-Men from across the multiverse descending onto Loomworld, right? The homeworld of the Inheritors, due to a couple different factors. One, they didn't necessarily want to do this. They wanted to kind of keep playing shadow games to a degree, sort of biding their time and trying to organize their strategy a little bit more. But because of the fact that Silk is one of the important spider totems, because she's the bride, because Kane is the other, and because Benji the Scion had basically been taken already, that with Silk and Kane arriving on Loomworld, the hand of the Spider-Man was basically forced. They had to come here to rescue these guys in order to keep the prophecy from coming to fruition, which would basically see the destruction of all the different Spider-Men across the multiverse. And so one of the things that happens with this is that with the death of Solace as the father of the Inheritors, and remember, he's not really the biological father so much as he's like the leader of the group. And so they really base leadership roles on like familial lines, right? So that's why you have like mother, you have father, not really their biological parents so much as this is a ceremonial role they hold. But with the death of Solace, this has really thrown the Inheritors into disarray, Deimos more than others. And the reason why is because the prophecy, as it had been foretold by the Master Weaver, is that Solace would outlive Deimos. But the problem with this is that Deimos outlives Solace. And so what this does is it actually throws into kind of disarray this idea that the prophecies don't really matter because the prophecies were wrong. The prophecies only have as much value as whether or not they unfold. The instant a prophecy does not come to fruition, it's usually discarded as having been a false prophecy, or that conclusion was basically averted, right? That's usually kind of how it's treated here. And so with Deimos, that's the way he responds. The funny thing about this is that with Genix, again, being the scientific arm of the Inheritors and the one that was responsible for creating clone bodies for the Inheritors to occupy, what he does is he actually produces this crystal, which basically has all the knowledge and essentially the essence of Solace. It's basically his consciousness locked away in crystalline form. And what that would do, that intelligence that was kind of backed up in real time seemingly, would be put into a new host body. And that's how the Inheritors would come back, by virtue of being cloned. But because the cloning facility was destroyed, this crystal is all that's left of Solace. Now, one thing that I want you guys to notice here, it's the 11th hour, right? I mean, it's basically basically over with. And so the inheritors are kind of clinging on to this idea that they can somehow come out on top. And so that's where the prophecy kind of comes back when Genix says, no, the prophecy is true. We can believe the Master Weaver because technically Solace has outlived you because his essence is in this crystal. The Master Weaver did not specify how Solace would outlive you, right? What condition he would be in. The Master Weaver simply just said that you would. Now, one thing to keep in mind though, is that the Master Weaver has basically been working against the inheritors in small ways. And so while we're not really given a definitive answer here, this may be one of these instances where the Master Weaver didn't really give them a false prophecy so much as a prophecy that was kind of skirting the lines between true and false, right? But regardless, you end up having Morlun who begins the prophecy itself, right? The process of basically killing these different spider totems. And again, this is where you really got like the actual explanation, but again, it was very, very cryptic. It wasn't really given to us in a clear-cut way. So for example, when he goes and kills the other, basically Cain, the giant spider form that Cain took on, he says, as it was foretold, with this first cut, the blood of the other stains the great web. Across all time and space, its legacy is no more. It shall find no new host. The problem with this is that while, I mean, this portion is straightforward, right? There will never be a person who will imbue the power of the other in the multiverse ever again. It still didn't really give us a definitive role that the other played. It's one of those things where it was only in hindsight between questions that were answered by Dan Slott and future stories that were done that we got an explanation of what the other was actually about. That and the old J. Michael Straczynski stuff. But the point is that there will be no more combative Spider-Man, right? In the sense that like the other is kind of a host for like the fighter of the various spider totems, right? To protect the other spider totems, nobody will ever imbue this again. And so the Master Weaver in turn completes the other half of the statement in saying, the great totem will inhabit no living thing. Its age is over. The spiders can feel it in their blood. The strands of the web pull at them. They are coming for you, Morlun, all of them. And that's exactly what happens. All these Spider-Men all start coming for them from conceivably every direction. They've already arrived on Loomworld. At this point, they haven't quite gotten to the location of where Morlun is at. The other part of this is all they knew is that Cain had taken off to Loomworld. They didn't know what happened to him. But when they arrive on the scene and they discover the fact that Cain is dead, this is when all hell begins to break loose. Because at this point, a lot of it's anger and frustration in the sense that they're tired of losing various Spider-Men. And so to a degree, it is all kind of bubbling to the surface. The problem with this is that there was so much anger and rage just kind of lingering out there, the moment's almost kind of lost, right? Like you get there angry, you get there upset, but it's kind of like, I mean, okay, but like, were you not as angry or upset before, right? Like what was so significant about Cain? The funny thing about this is that we can kind of interpret this in a couple different ways. If you look at the character of Jessica Drew, right? This Black Widow from the Ultimate Universe, she's a clone of Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe. So for her, it's a very personal vendetta to see a clone killed because the death of Cain hits very close to home for her. But for the other Spider-Man, they're just pissed off that another Spider-Man died, like so many others have. But switching back to Morlun, what he does is he transitions to the bride, right, to Silk, and says the spinner at the center of the web, second bitten, the unseen silken thread, pulling at the hand of fate. And where Silk tries to beseech him and say like, you know, what you're saying doesn't make any sense, it's all just a whole bunch of nonsense and so on and so forth, like you're never going to win and that kind of a thing, it basically leads to Morlun cutting the hand of Silk, spilling her blood on the great web and saying, as your blood flows through these skeins, no spider totem shall ever appear by chance. That one was really the more direct of the three, but again, to kind of reiterate here, Silk represents just random circumstance that leads to a person being bitten by a radioactive spider and becoming a Spider-Man or a Spider-Woman. And this is one of the elements of the Spider-Man mythos as it was changed by Straczynski and continued by Dan Slott, that some fans, I wouldn't say a lot, I wouldn't assign a value to it, but that some fans in general didn't really seem to enjoy. That in years past, leading up to the events of Straczynski's run and going into Dan Slott's run, Peter Parker was just a kid who was bitten by a radioactive spider. That depending on how you look at it, he was in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time. But he was basically flying by the seat of his pants trying to figure out how to be a hero, and that was basically it. The introduction of the other, the spider totems, right, the bride, the scion, all that kind of stuff, kind of moved Peter Parker into this realm of being quote-unquote the chosen one, and not everyone was on board with that. But what this did by virtue of introducing that concept was really kind of bring together all these different alternate reality versions of Peter and essentially saying that they are all kind of destined to become Spider-Man, right? Whether it is a female version of Peter Parker or a male version of Peter Parker, that in every single universe there is destined to be a person who is bitten by a radioactive spider and goes on to become that reality's version of Spider-Man. The funny thing thing about this is Silk, in terms of how she was explained regarding the concept of the bride and random chance, is that sometimes that doesn't always happen. That yes, it plays out that way, but not necessarily. That in addition to that reality getting its own version of Peter Parker, sometimes you get a different version of Spider-Man beyond Peter Parker. Now, Marvel doesn't really say it as much, but the notion of like Spider-Gwen, for example, right? She's not an alternate reality version of Peter Parker. She's an alternate reality version of Gwen Stacy, but she was bitten by a radioactive spider nonetheless. How exactly that ties in is not fully made clear. The essence of Silk seems to be more in line with the idea of a spider turning somebody into Spider-Man and then a secondary bite, right? Or just the random happenstance of someone becoming Spider-Man when they're not supposed to be. But regardless, the Master Weaver chimes in and says curses, magic, and unwanted luck. Midwives to all new spiders now scurry, hide, and are seen no more. The web is untangled, its end draws near, right? And then following that, you have Morlun, who makes his way towards the Scion, to Benji, basically the youngest spider in all creation. And he says, with this cut, the act is done. No new totem shall arise. No more spiders will be born. No new age can begin. In effect, with the death of Benji, basically solidifies this prophecy in saying there will never ever be another Spider-Man or Spider-Woman in the multiverse again. That at this point, as long as the inheritors can try to find some way to stay alive, if they kill all the Spider-Men here, then they can just travel through the multiverse and kill the ones they haven't killed yet, and no other Spider-Man will crop back up. And because spiders are the inherent enemy of the inheritors, they basically wipe out their own real competition. And so the inheritors can just inherit the multiverse without anybody really standing in their way. Now, of course, this basically leads to the Spider-Man, really Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe, arriving just in time to yank the knife out of Morlun's hand and keep him from killing Benji. Now, at that point, that's when Deimos steps in and says, do your thing, Morlun, like kill the baby with your hands if you have to, it doesn't really matter. I will hold these guys off. You make sure the prophecy comes to fruition. The funny thing about this is that, of course, you end up having, Superior Spider-Man who goes after Deimos, and then Peter Parker ends up going after Morlun. But one of the things to understand here is that Morlun, in a lot of ways, is both terrified of Peter Parker, but also despises Peter Parker. The reason being because while the family of Morlun didn't really hate him or despise him, there was a lack of respect for him because of the fact that he'd been killed twice by Peter Parker. And in fact, he had avoided the main Marvel Universe because of the fact that he'd been killed twice by Peter Parker. And so there is a bit of a vendetta, right? Like, Peter Parker's the only one who was ever able to defeat me. I will overcome this Spider-Man and then solidify my place as being the strongest person. And so that's why you have this fight that breaks out between these various Spider-Men and Spider-Women, really Peter Parker and Superior Spider-Man against Deimos. And while that takes place, the attention of Uncle Ben is called, right? Where they're like, Uncle Ben, you have to come and help us. And the response of Uncle Ben is, I wish I could stay and help you. This web, it has portals away from here. I have to go. And that's one of the things where Dan Slott kind of plays it fast and loose with indicating here that basically Uncle Ben really is a coward, that he had taken off and he had ran when it came down to crunch time, right? When they really needed him, he had basically abandoned. But in the midst of all that, suddenly Karn arrives. Now remember, this is the reason why we covered that short little one-shot comic yesterday, is because that was the story where Karn had turncoated against the inheritors and joined the Spider family, because in his mind, the inheritors had basically shunned him time and time again. And that's what he says, right? Where Brix and Bora are like, Karn, awesome, you're here, right? Our brother's exile has been put to an end because Solace has been defeated and Morlun's in charge, right? With him on our side, this day is as good as one. And that's when Karn chimes in and says, really? Like on your side, that's weird, because for eons, this family has spurned me, shunned me, brought me nothing but pain. I was never good enough for you before. Why am I good enough for you now? And so he says, I renounce my inheritance. I abandon my role as part of the inheritor family. From this day forth, I fight on the side of the spider totems. And having an inheritor on their side is a massive advantage, because with Karn comes all the benefits of the inheritors, right? Super strength, speed, durability, all that kind of stuff. It's enough for them to basically offer a high level of distraction and overcome these guys. Now, the problem is that Morlun gets the upper hand on Peter Parker momentarily, but that moment he gets is all he really needs. That where he's taunted to a degree by Silk and by Peter Parker in saying like, the web's healing itself, too much time has passed, there's nothing you can do to end this. The response of Morlun is, no, all I have to do is kill this Scion and everything's gonna be over. The problem is that when he basically pulls back the tapestry where the Scion's supposed to be, he's met with Spider-Ham. And this is where the reality of what was going on with Uncle Ben comes into fruition. That we actually ended up learning that while Morlun was distracted with Peter Parker, that Uncle Ben had actually grabbed Benji and left. That's why he took off. off. It wasn't because he was a coward and he was abandoning anybody. It was because he simply wanted to get out of there, right? To get Benji away. So long as Benji was there, whether it was just by some sheer happenstance where some kind of projectile hit him and killed him, or because Morlun went after him and did the deed himself, if Benji were to die, it would all basically come to an end. And so in this fight, as it takes place, you actually end up having just kind of this massive calamity where finally, like, Spider-Man 2099 shows up with basically Leopardon, right? After him and Lady Spider were able to basically restore it and then bring it back using 2099 technology, Superior Spider-Man steps in and kills the Master Weaver. This is a massive problem. And the reason why is because the Master Weaver is the one who kept the web of life and destiny together. He's the one that basically held it and kept it from falling apart. Why does this matter? Because the web of life and destiny, what's really interesting, and this is the best analogy that I could think of, is almost like a voodoo doll for the multiverse, right? If you were to like set the web of life and destiny on fire and you were to completely and totally destroy it, you would wipe out the multiverse with it. If you were to somehow damage or take a singular strand of the web of life and destiny, with each strand representing a universe, if you were to isolate that strand and remove it from the web of life and destiny, that universe is isolated. It cannot be accessed by anybody from the main Marvel universe itself. I mean, possibly with someone like Doctor Strange, but basically all doors to that universe are closed. It exists out there by itself with no conceivable means to reach it unless it's reconnected to the web of life and destiny. Again, this is another one of those instances in Marvel Comics where you have basically an ability to manipulate the multiverse. It's one of the things we've talked about before. Different people can do this in different ways. The Master Weaver basically controls the multiverse or can manipulate the multiverse by manipulating the web of life and destiny. But then you have people like the Molecule Man, Owen Reese, who can just arbitrarily travel to different universes because of the reality warping level of power that he has, the ability to alter reality on a multiversal scale. Doctor Strange can do it by magic. People like the Fantastic Four can use technology to create portals to go to other universes. But with the Master Weaver destroyed, basically killed by Superior Spider-Man, this destroys the ability of the Inheritors to basically complete their prophecy. So at this point, the game's over, right? The jig is up. There's nothing that can be done. This battle's already won. The Inheritors don't have the Scion. The Master Weaver's dead. There's no way for the prophecy to be completed. At this point, for the various Spider-Man and Spider-Women, it's just mop-up duty. And so what you have here is this just kind of giant fight where Morlun just loses it on Peter Parker. And any fear that he had of Peter Parker, any concern he had, completely goes out the window. And where he starts drawing on the energy of Peter, literally sucking his life force out of him, the other Spider-Man and Spider-Woman initially go to intervene. Peter wards them off, activates his teleportation device, and teleports them to Earth 3145, right? This reality that's basically immersed in radiation, the one universe the Inheritors can't go to because the radiation is fatal to them. And so where initially Morlun starts to seemingly succumb to this radiation poisoning, Peter refuses to kill him. And instead he tells him, like, there's a bunker down there, follow the webs, go save your life. Now the response to this might be, well, all they have to do is just find a way out. But the reality is, with the Master Weaver killed, there's no one that would willingly open a portal for the Inheritors so they could escape. So it's really more by circumstance that they're stuck in that reality. Now, one thing to know is that the web of life and destiny is intact, right? The issue with this is that without a Master Weaver, there are portals there. Once they pass through, with no Master Weaver, there's really no way for them to come back. And for the most part, it's one of those things where it's kind of like the day's been saved, everything's kind of winding down and everything's cool. The problem is that in the midst of all that, suddenly all their spider senses start going crazy. And the reason why is because someone is screwing with the web of life and destiny. And that's when they find out it's Superior Spider-Man. Now, here's the funny thing about this. Dr. Octopus, as we mentioned before, had long since figured out that the Peter Parker that's here in Spider-Verse is not the past version of Peter Parker before Dr. Octopus took over his body. It's the future version, which basically told Otto Octavius Peter eventually gets his body back. And so out of a desire to ensure that he stays the Superior Spider-Man and he doesn't have to worry about Peter returning to his own body, he's basically destroying the web of life and destiny. Now again, if this web is completely destroyed, the multiverse will be destroyed along with it. Presumably even their own universe, right? Reality itself will cease to exist. This is one of those instances where it was kind of divisive among fans, but I love the motivation here. And the reason why is because Otto Octavius is largely a man of logic and reason. He very rarely ever gives way to emotional impulse. This is an emotional impulse. His desire to stay Spider-Man is so overwhelming, right? Because he sees himself as being the Superior Spider-Man. In a lot of ways, he was. He was a better Spider-Man than Peter Parker was, but he sees himself as being better. He doesn't want to go back to who he was before. Now, the other part of that is, remember, in Dying Wish, it was basically established that Dr. Octopus's body was essentially dying. If the future comes to fruition and Peter gets his body back, then the assumption here, or the belief by Dr. Octopus, is that he'll basically die because there'll be nowhere for his spirit to go, right? His physical body is dead. There's nowhere for him to go or nothing that he can do. And so while the other Spider-Man and Spider-Woman are sent back to the realities before the web is totally destroyed, what it does is it allows Dan Slott to kind of dwindle things down and basically lead to a fight, kind of a second conflict, and really more of a final conflict between Superior Spider-Man and Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe. Now, you do have like Anya Corazon and a few people there that are basically getting involved, but one of the things that happens, and it's kind of an important thing here, is that as Anya Corazon is reading this knife, this kind of the ceremonial dagger that was used for the sacrifice, that it does have the language of the totems written on it. And one of the things it says is, there shall always be a Master Weaver spinning at the center of the web. Basically, when one Master Weaver dies, because of the fact that it's just fate, is always destined to happen, someone will always take their place. The bigger concern here is how long before that happens. Is it simply just a chain of reactions, and by virtue of impulses or just circumstance, somebody will just become the Master Weaver? Or is it some kind of big ceremonial thing where the energy of the Master Weaver leaves his body and then joins into someone else and they end up becoming the new Master Weaver instead? If anything, it really is the former, right? It's just kind of circumstance that leads to it. That Silk initially believes she's the one that's destined to become the new Master Weaver because the inheritors kept calling her the spinner at the center of the web, and that maybe she's the one who's supposed to do it. But again, as this fight continues on between these guys, Anya reveals the reality of what it means to become the Master Weaver in saying it's a lifetime sentence. That once a person becomes the Master Weaver, the only way to leave that position is to be killed. That once you accept that role, that's your role for all eternity, so long as you're never killed by anybody. And so what actually ends up happening is that Karn essentially steps up and saying, like, I was cast out by my family for centuries, like there's nothing for me here, right? And my goal has always been to explore the multiverse. What better way to do that than to be the Master Weaver and observe it, right? To look into all these different things. But the funny thing is that Silk basically steps up and says, no, like I've decided I'm gonna be the one to do it, right? I'll put on his gear, get in his machine, and when she takes off his helmet, she's kind of like, well, I always kind of assumed the Master Weaver would be somebody that I knew. She says, I've never seen that face before, and Karn says, but I have. And that's when it's basically revealed that the Master Weaver is actually the future version of Karn. In essence, Karn is the one who is destined to become the new Master Weaver. And so by putting his staff, spear, whatever you want to call it, inside the machine, that it basically allows him to take the place of the Master Weaver, or at least to replace his older self, to don the moniker of the Master Weaver, and then to begin repairing the web of life and destiny. At this point, there's nothing really Superior Spider-Man can do. Because of the fact that the web is being repaired, Superior Spider-Man is ultimately teleported back to the main Marvel Universe and basically pops up almost the moment he left. And that's why whenever you go and you read Superior Spider-Man, that you go into one issue, Superior Spider-Man vanishes and then reappears immediately after that. This is how all that happens. The entirety of Spider-Verse takes place between those moments. The other part of this, and this is something that was really, really cool, is that it basically starts tying into the events of the Incursions. That while the Master Weaver is repairing the web of life and destiny, that in turn, the problem here is that for Billy Braddock, he can't go home to his own universe. The reason why is because it's been wiped out. And when the question is asked, no, wait a minute, like what happened to this entire universe? The response to Spider-Man UK is, it's the Incursions, right? Cosmic phenomena that have just been wiping out whole realities. Now again, we know that was like the Beyonders, and really it was Dr. Doom who basically destroyed it all when he ended up opening that box of Molecule Man and detonating them all in front of the Beyonders and killing them, wiping out pretty much all that was left of the multiverse minus 2 universes. This particular instance takes place before the story of Brian Braddock, when he comes back and says like the Captain Britain Corps has been wiped out. This takes place before that. That when Billy Braddock looks on, like his whole universe has been totally destroyed. That the Captain Britain Corps has been investigating it, and that he felt like he should have been there. So the only real destination left for him is to travel to the Starlight Citadel, which is the kind of main base of operations for the Captain Britain Corps. And as we know from the Incursions, that Spider-Man UK will basically end up being killed alongside all the other Captain Britons when Brian Braddock is thrown from the meeting by Saturnine and left to go tell the New Avengers everything that had basically transpired. And so ultimately, this is when we kind of get this actual finality to it, that the inheritors are basically stranded in Earth 3145 with no discernible means of being able to escape. That you do have the body of the other, right, of Kane himself, that's actually just kind of there, only for an arm to emerge and for us to basically realize that Kane is essentially being reborn and he's going to return as the Scarlet Spider. And then of course, Peter Parker returns back to his point in the timeline and everything basically begins to wrap up, right, with him kind of going forward, doing his thing, thing, being the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and so on and so forth. But with that being said, guys, this was Spider-Verse, and I love this story. I absolutely loved the Spider-Verse event. Only took us like 3 weeks to finish the whole thing. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. And for all you guys who are big fans of Spider-Man, I'm sorry. After this, we're taking a break. I love Spider-Verse as much as the next guy, but I need a break from Spider-Man for a little while. But anyway, guys, thank you for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.